Stellar Blade time, baby. Sure is. We're gonna keep moving with this speed run. Get what we need to get. And yeah, I'm ready for it. I hope you guys are. All right, let's go. Let's go. As you can see, we have a little preview of the other games we're going to be getting to. We got Snake Eater loaded up already, baby. Yeah. Jump somewhere out right here. I want to put on a little podcast real quick.
You are on social media. Is 2025 going to be the best year of your life? If you are on social media or if you've been into astrology for any sort of time, you might have seen astrologers talk about like, oh, this year is going to be the best year of your life, or this year is going to be the best year of your life. But as you go throughout that year, you kind of end up seeing the differences, and maybe, you know, it's not the best year of your life. It could be the worst year of your life. And in this video, I want to cover what that difference is and why sometimes someone could claim it's the best year of your life or maybe not, and why 2025 is different. And if you don't know me already, my name is Cam Wyatt. I'm a professional astrologer. I've been doing it for almost a decade. I've seen literally over 2,000 clients, and I like making astrology content for people that like to use the astrology to better their lives. So, with that being said, what makes 2025 different? I want to start off with saying 2025 could possibly be the best year of your life. But that could also have happened in 2024. That could have also happened in 2023. But the reason I claim for 2025, and the reason I think that, excuse me, sorry, I'm still a little sick, that is going to be the case is 2025 offers more change than you'll see probably for the rest of your life in terms of astrology. 2025 has the opportunity to be both better and worse. My thing is with the astrology is that the astrology will tell us about the quality of time, right? In 2020, it was not the best quality of time in terms of what the astrology showed. We had the lockdowns, the pandemic, we had a world in which the way that we operated before completely stopped. And for a lot of people, that was really good. And for a lot of other people, that was really bad. And I find that so interesting in terms of being able to describe astrology. For someone like me, I did not enjoy 2020. But in my client work, I saw so many people that enjoyed it. They loved being in lockdown. They loved being able to like not have to worry about the world and just focus on, you know, what their priorities were. What was interesting about 2020 was that so many things came to an end. And for a lot of people, that was this stuff that they didn't like, the stuff that they didn't enjoy, that finally came to an end where they had an opportunity to see something different and to choose something different. For a lot of people, like a lot of good things came to an end. You get into years like 2021, where now after 2020, if you're not familiar with what the astrology was in 2020, we had a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. If you have been into astrology for any sort of time, a lot of astrologers have talked about this, including me at length. I won't go into it too deeply here, but we had a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And these Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions start 20-year cycles, new 20-year cycles. However, this one was different because it was our first one in air signs, and now we are in a new 200-year cycle of air. So at the end of 2020 and going into 2021 was a bigger change. 2021, from the basis of astrology, was like now getting used to this change, being in a little bit of more of a different environment. And then you get into years like 2022, where 2022, from the astrology perspective, was really rough. We had a lot of squares going on. We had the Saturn-Uranus square. There was just a lot of problems. When you get into the astrology of 2023, this was a little bit more of an adaptability phase, a little bit more of a change in like kind of getting used to the new and being able to adapt with it and grow.
Oh, Mikey.
And 2024
don't
has
stop,
been
baby.
this pivot point where we see some of the problems that have been.
It's a
I feel like I
tale
sound like
old
Kamala
as time
Harris right now.
itself.
You've been unburdened for what has been. But we've seen some of the problems, and now we have to make a pivot and a change. So let's talk about 2025. 2025 can be the best year of your life if you choose to. The reason I think this next year can offer that is because of how much changes. When you look at something like 2024, there wasn't a lot of change going on. It seemed more of 2024 is more of pivots and tension. 2025, we see every single planet move into a new zodiac sign. We don't see that often. Pluto will move into Aquarius, and it'll stay in Aquarius for the next, basically 20 years. We see Neptune ingress into Aries. We haven't seen Neptune move into a new sign since about 2011. We have Uranus moving into Gemini. We haven't seen Uranus move into a new sign since about like 2017, 2018. And then we're going to have Saturn move into Aries, and then we're going to have Jupiter move into Cancer, and then of course Mars, Venus, Mercury, the Sun, Moon, they all move signs every single year. So when you look at 2025 as a whole, everything moves into a new sign. So what does that mean symbolically? That means every single chapter, every single page, if we look at our life as like a book, and let's say we have these continuous different plot lines running, where there's these shorter plot lines, there's these medium plot lines, and there's these longer plot lines. All of these plot lines end and shift into a new story. That's essentially what's happening. So you have an opportunity. Imagine where you're at in your life right now. What are the things that you love about it? What are the things that you hate about it? And do you think if you could look at the future and say, hey, between right now, I'm recording this in August of 2024, between now and August of 2025, if everything shifted, how would you feel? Do you think that could be made for the better? Or do you think that could be made by the worse? I think the key thing here is knowing that this is coming. Knowing that everything is going to shift from here on out. In 2025, the way I look at it is making change is really difficult. Even though it's so funny how the universe, change is the most constant thing in the universe, yet it's like the most difficult thing for us humans to do. I always found that really interesting. And we have so much supportive energy over this next year to make these bigger changes. And the fun part about it is these changes are going to happen no matter what. No matter if you like them or if you don't like them, or if you want them to happen or if you don't want them to happen. So if you knew everything was going to change, would you get in front of the 8 ball? What kind of changes would you want to happen versus are you going to just be victim to change and not being willing to grow and not being willing to adapt and overcome? That's the question. And the thing is, the reason I'm making this video is I did a video on Instagram about how 2024 is not your year, 2025 definitely can be. And I got a lot of comments, and people were saying, hey, this is just what astrologers say every year. And I think that's true. I think 2025 is different, though. I don't think I would have claimed 2024 as your year, maybe for like specific zodiac signs, and I can't think of them right now. I don't think 2020 would have been your year. I don't think 2021. 2021 was pretty decent. 2022, no. 2023 was a lot nicer than 2022. But 2025 has so much energy shifts. And not even just like small day-to-day stuff. I'm talking big cycle stuff. Like what the next 20 years looks like for you. What the next 15 years looks like for you. What the next 8 years looks like for you. And 2025 is the year to really make those changes. If you look at Pluto and Capricorn, Pluto's been in Capricorn since 2008. We're done with that.
We're doing easy mode
after this year.
FYI.
Neptune has been in Pisces since about 2011.
Nice little speed
We're basically
run.
done with that this year.
Speedish
In
run.
2025, Neptune will go into Aries, but it will go back into Pisces. And then it will fully lock into Aries in 2026. The way I look at this next few years is 2025 is the beginning. 2025 is the whole new book. 2026 is when we're locked into that narrative. 2025 is the year to start new things, to try new things, to move on to something else. And 2026 will be the year where you finally lock it in. Like you're not going to go through 2025 getting everything that you want done. You're not going to go through 2025 being like, you know what, I'm just shifting the chapter and here I am. It's a lot of getting the new stuff. It's very similar to moving. You have to first buy the new house. That's what 2025 is. We're buying the new house. And then the rest of 2025, and the reason I'm bringing this up is in 2025, so like I said, Neptune's going to move into Aries, Saturn's going to move into Aries, Uranus is going to move into Gemini, Pluto will move into Capricorn, or Pluto will move into Aquarius, and Jupiter will move into Cancer. But as we go through into the fall of 2025, Uranus is going to go back into Taurus, Neptune will go back into Aries, Saturn will go back, Neptune will go back into Pisces, and Saturn will go back into Pisces as well. When you buy a new house, and you lock it in, you have to go back to the old house to pack everything up to get ready for the move. That's what 2025 is all you're doing is buying a new house, and it's the transition period.
We got some frogs.
And then by the time
in
we
the
get into
chat.
2026, when Neptune and Saturn are locked
mayo
into
in it
Aries,
too.
when Uranus is locked into Gemini, Pluto is locked into Aquarius at this point. And then, of course, Jupiter changes signs every year, so Jupiter will be in Cancer for a while, and then it's going to be Leo. That's what 2025 is. So my question for you is, are you going to look at these past few years, let's say that they were difficult, and let's say you want something new, you want something to change. Are you going to let 2025, are you just going to let it blow you wherever it wants to blow you? That was hard not to think of a dirty version of that. Or are you going to look at this timeline and say, I have things in my life that I want to change? And this is when the weather allows you to make these changes. I don't want you to go into 2025 doing the same thing you have been doing for the past 4 years. There's a part of this, though, that what's fun about astrology is that it's going to happen anyway. These changes are going to happen anyway. And do you want to be, again, in front of the 8-ball or behind the 8-ball? Are you just going to let the universe push you wherever it wants to? And are you going to be victim to that?
Are you all right?
Or are you going to, look at this and say, you know what? I have these changes I want to make. I might be scared to make these changes. They're uncomfortable. But I know I have to. So rather than, denying or resisting, you can surrender. When we, astrology is all about the quality of time. And there's going to be good times and bad times. Like, that's the thing about talking about it's like, oh, is this going to be a good year or a bad year? Well, there's always good times and there's always bad times constantly. What astrology is really good at, though, is showing you, hey, where are the bad things and where are the good things? And for some people, what might be really, really good might be really, really bad for someone else, depending on their chart. So I don't even like saying, oh, 2025 is going to be good. But the reason I say that is there's so much opportunity for change.
I think I saw another road near the entrance we came.
Like, it's not just like, oh, you're going to go through this year and it'll be kind of good, it'll be kind of bad, but it's the same old, same old. There's so much opportunity for change. When you have opportunity for change, if you are 18, 19, 20 years old, the best thing you could ever do is leave your hometown. I'm so grateful for that every single day I'm alive, is that I got out of my hometown and I just took a risk. And when I made those changes, I ate shit for a long time. When I first moved to Vegas, I struggled with keeping a job. I had all types of jobs. At one point in the middle of the summer of the Vegas heat, I was knocking on doors selling Kirby vacuums. I even sold Obama phones for a week. It was brutal. It sucked. I was, donating plasma to make it, literally just to feed myself. And I hated it. But man, that change in my life, those experiences, those opportunities that I had were awesome. I look back so fondly at those times, even though in the moment it was horrible. I look back so fondly, and I'm so glad I made those changes. And the reason I bring up this story is we have so much change coming up. And there are going to be bad times. In fact, we could actually sit here and say it's all going to be bad. But would you rather have a new bad or the same bad? Would you rather have a completely different timeline?
What's up, dude?
Or
How
a
you
timeline,
doing?
again, that you have some sort of choice and control of, or a timeline that you didn't have a choice or control of because you stayed where you're at? There's going to be bad times and good times in every single year. And the astrology
Dude, that
is not
level
about
8
saying, oh,
last night was
2025 is
brutal.
gonna
We
be
did a
good, or
level 10
2024
afterwards,
is
and it
gonna
was
be good.
3,000 times easier.
It's about
Tough to
saying the
get through
quality
here
of that
unless we
time.
restore power
And for
with the fusion
specific
cell.
zodiac signs, for specific
we'll have
rising
more
signs,
luck
for
getting
specific
down.
birth charts, depending on your, you know,
Where
your
the-
annual perfections or your
where
zodiac
the
releasing,
hell
they're
is
either
this
going to be
thing?
better or worse. And so the reason I'm making this video is, again, a lot of people are going to say, oh, 2025 is going to be the best year of your life. Well, any year can be the best year of your life. But the reason I think 2025 has a better opportunity is that there's a lot of change available to you. A lot of change available to you. Do you want to be at the same place that you're at right now? Or do you want to move on? And if you move on, guess what? It's going to suck. When you grow, you get growing pains. But you're tapping into the potential that you have. And that's the most important thing, is you're not missing out on that untapped potential. And so I don't want you to say, oh, 2025 is going to be a bad year for me. It's something that really frustrates me, because the whole point of astrology is getting more of a detailed analysis of the quality of time, year by year, month by month, week by week, day by day, hour by hour.
Got a day off work, huh?
And so I think
I gotta
2025
work
has
on
a
getting
bigger
this
opportunity
flat,
to
or
be
else I'd
the best
join
year
ya.
of your life because of how much change is going to
I
happen.
gotta get the Gooner badge, dude.
And think about it. Do you want things, no matter what, the way that your life is
Mikey,
right now is not
you'll
how
be
it's gonna
diving
in
with
your-
us soon enough.
No matter what. And that's just
I
kind of
know
true
it.
no matter what.
I know it, Mikey.
But the astrology shows such bigger changes. I mean, our lives aren't the same as when they were in 2020. I don't know anyone that's living the same life as they were in 2020. And it's so crazy living in, you know, I talk to my mom all the time about changes, and it's just like, you know, when you grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, things change so much more slowly versus now. It's just big change, big change, big change. And we get a lot of that next year. And for a lot of people, this is going to be rough. But I think the other part of astrology is, just like anything in life, you might look at what you're going through right now as tough, as shitty,
You know, that
as horrible.
Saying about the
But as you get older and as time goes on, you might look back at these memories more fondly. Give me any sort of time in your life that was really shitty at that moment, but you look back, you're like, that wasn't that bad. That was actually kind of fun. You know, we're really good at romanticizing the past.
This is a guide
And
for
so-
all the collectibles.
The reason I'm making this video is we're going to be talking a lot about how big 2025 is and how big the next decade is. And my job, and the thing I like doing with astrology, is helping you guys navigate this and use it to your advantage. Rather than being victims of circumstance, we can look at this and say, hey, I know everything's going to change. I need to be open-minded to that and maybe think about and have calculus around what options I have or how that can look. And especially and more specifically to like what you can do about it. Because if you know, like for example, let's say you're going to play, let's say you're a kid and you're going to play a sport and you know Hell Week is going to happen. If you did not know Hell Week was going to happen, you're going to be like, holy shit, this is horrible. But if you're like, hey, Hell Week's going to happen, it's going to suck for 2 weeks, but then, you know, we're done after that.
I think I encountered
It's
a bug.
easier to anticipate. It's easier to work with when you already have that anticipation, when you already know that that's what's going to happen. And so I want you to think about what things can change in your life. Look at your chart. And again, this is going to be stuff that I talk about in my yearly rising sign
All right,
horoscopes.
will do, man.
Over on my memberships, we're going to be going over game plans on how to do all of this. Depending on when you're watching this, my new website may or may not be launched yet, but I'm going to be doing game plans to help people navigate this throughout the year. So if you want to support the channel, go over to that. But again, depending on when you're watching this, I don't know if that's going to be available yet. So if not subscribed, make sure you stay up to date with that. But 2025 is nothing but change. I look at that as an opportunity to make it the best year. I remember when I moved to Vegas, like I said, it was really, really hard. It really, really sucked. But it was honestly one of the coolest things I ever fucking did. And it's the thing that allowed me to... I wouldn't be where I'm at right now if I didn't make that decision when I was 18 years old. When I didn't have fucking anything. It was just kind of like me and my sister decided to move because it was cheaper and fuck it, why not? And, you know, I'm assuming it's easier to make that kind of decision when you're 18 years old. But 2025 is going to be bad too.
For now,
It's going to be hard.
16 demo seemed to
Change is
make some
hard.
smoked sausage Japanese
Especially
curry.
too
Ooh-wee.
when you're anticipating
Sounds
things
good.
staying the same and then they don't,
go
and
back
you
to
have to
that box.
completely
Sounds
throw
really
away your
good,
plans.
Mikey.
That's
Give me
also
some.
pretty
I
cool.
want some of that.
And you have to be on your feet. You have to be adaptable. And so I don't want you to go through this next year thinking everything's going to be the same. It's just going to be the same shit, different day. We're going to go into a huge change in 2025. It's like you've been at your house right now for a decade and you're finally locking in buying a new house next year. You could feel the change coming. You haven't fully moved in yet. But you buy the house, you get excited, you maybe spend that first night in that house completely empty just out of excitement. And then you go back to your old house and you're like, and you feel softer about it. You know, when you move and you hate your place and then you move, but as you're moving out, you're like, man, I'm gonna miss this place. It's an ending, it's an ending of a
25-hour
chapter.
drive.
And there's something spiritual about moving, about like packing things up.
Are
It's
you
like
driving back
ceremonious
to
around
San Diego?
closing something
Mikey?
out in your life. In 2025, so much of the first half of 2025 is introduction to everything new, and the second half is you got to go back to that old house and pack everything up because you're not coming back.
You make some for
And I don't think you want to go
Oh, you're talking about me
But I think you can
getting
look-
that curry.
at that time in your life
Looks like another fusion cell.
in a
Yeah.
positive way. Because
Because
unfortunately, I don't even say unfortunately. I think the cool thing about a life is that it's always changing.
I might make a good drive
Change
for
is the
some
only
good
constant in
sausage,
the
Mikey.
universe.
No homo.
And what I love about 2025 is the change is so big that it's going to be hard to keep up with. But it's exciting. It's adventurous. It's a new frontier. And you get to, again, it's kind of like exploring a new ocean. It's still an ocean. But the waves, the weather, the tide, the sea creatures might all be different. So as we start closing out 2024, I want you to really reflect on what this past 15, 16 years have been, what these past 12, 15 years have been, what these past 8 years have been, and know that this was one chapter. And it was awesome. Even though it sucked. It sucked, it was shitty, but it was awesome. And I don't think you would want to have it anymore. And we get to close out this chapter, and we get to start something new. And you get to decide what that new looks like. Because again, no matter what changes happen, whether you think you're going to stay at the same place, what you're doing right now, you're not. And you can either be, again, in front of the 8-ball and start preparing and start thinking of ways that you would want to have the change happen if you had some sort of control, or you could sit and just wait for things to happen. But I think 2025 has such big potential and opportunity to be one of the best years of your life. And maybe in the middle of 2025, you don't think that way. But maybe in 2028, 2029, you look back and you go, that 2025 was that year that I made these changes.
I've had years like that
2025 was
before.
that year I saw the difference. 2025 was that year I decided to take a risk and to challenge myself and to just trust the process. I really enjoy talking about transiting astrology and helping you guys navigate this. And the reason I'm making this video is I cannot, this is the way I'm going about 2025. I'm not thinking, oh, it's just going to be whatever. And a lot of other astrologers are talking about it too. And there's something so cool about being able to see the future and just saying, hey, the quality of the time, we're in a completely different chapter next year.
I can already play Elden Ring. Might start.
I think it's
Black
easy to look at maybe
Ooh.
2024, 2023, 2022. A lot of
Climax,
similarities.
it was
Of course,
saying
things
that,
change as things go on.
He would give.
But by this
Wukong
time
an
next year,
8,
we're going to be in a very, very different story.
at best.
And I think it's really exciting to look forward to. And I think you need to understand that that option of massive change is available to you. And that change can be for the best if you decide to use it. And you don't be scared of the unknown. You face that fear of the unknown. And you take it with stride. Because you only have one life.
Restoration complete.
And this is it.
But the road
Something I think a lot about is, this is my life right now.
Signal is leading to the
This is what I get to reflect on when I'm
Let's
home.
find a way up.
These are the decisions and the
Wait,
things I decide to
you're
focus
really
on
going there?
that dictate the quality and the experience that I have
Oh,
on this
there's a
earth
little
the
nice
one
little
time that
thing
I
for
get
you
this
guys.
opportunity.
Oh my
As
gosh,
far as
look
I
at
know.
that view.
Again, maybe I reincarnate into something, but I don't know about that. So all I have is what I
Are you
have.
sure about this? One wrong
And I
step
would
it's
rather
over.
be aware
I'm
of
fine.
that and know that the clock is ticking and that there's things that I want, there's things in my
Whatever
heart
you do, don't look down.
that I want to push for, and that I can't be afraid to listen to what my heart says, and that I have to do it anyway, because otherwise I die miserable. That's really where all of my stuff from astrology comes from. I have a lot of burning desire in my heart, and even though it's scary, I have to listen to it, otherwise I die miserable. And that's the last thing I want. So really think about where you're at. Don't be afraid over these next few months to really reflect where you're at and where things are going, because it's as soon as we start the clock, 2025, as soon as we flip that calendar, it's go time. I love and appreciate you guys. I'll be seeing you next time.
Let's get back into that Hereditary video. We start off with Liza P.
The trauma and illness and bereavement within the family unit. Following the family's return, we get a glimpse of Annie's career. We get this full screen of her exhibition flyer, but just before that, in the hallway, we get to see two of her display pieces. And while the movie never shows us them extremely close up, they are phenomenal pieces of art, especially the quicksand model, which was designed to show the passage of time, according to Asta and Newman. We see three houses of different eras from the bottom up: colonial, then Victorian, then modern. And we can see that the previous houses are buried underneath. It's a creepy model, and it sums up perfectly this idea of those who've preceded us still being with us, still haunting us in a way as we build our lives on top of their influence. It's a metaphor for hereditary passing, essentially. Generations of a family demonstrated in the most eerie way possible. And it speaks to Annie's feelings that she can't escape her past and the things her mother has done to her. It's also a trinity of houses, a trinity of generations, and that's going to be extremely important later on. And while I don't subscribe to the idea, it's a good piece of evidence, perhaps the only evidence, that this condition within the bloodline preceded Ellen. As I said, this model goes back to the colonial era, the Victorian era, which is more suggestive of Ellen's parents than Ellen herself. The other model is given pride of place right in front of the door, but is even less clear to the viewer in what it's representing. Unless you're looking very closely, this will probably just look like an everyday dollhouse. It's actually a house designed to feel like it's trapping the residents within, which should give you some idea as to how Annie feels about her home. And this won't be an explicit motif in the film, it's building on the subtextual mental illness and disquiet Annie has about her life. That Annie is literally and metaphorically representative of a woman who feels trapped in her life and that was pressured to start a family. We see bars, chains, steel plates, even vault doors, according to the diorama's creator, covering all the exits and trapping the owners inside. Another thing of note about the model coming from Ari Aster's Reddit AMA is the deliberate obscuring of the attic window where Ellen's body will be placed and Charlie's room in reference to their positioning amongst the darker supernatural elements. You can actually see this in action near the end when the dollhouse becomes illuminated. Now this isn't a perfect stand-in for their house, but I presume from what Ari Aster is saying here that he kind of saw it as being representative in some way. As for the miniature flyer, most of it we already covered during the opening shot, but there is one image that is new in the top left. This was almost certainly Ellen's living room.
Are you serious?
Or
Did
parlor,
you guys see
where
that?
she met with the cult, essentially. The walls are yellowy gold, and the armchairs and sofa are blue, just as we saw in the photo of Ellen at the funeral. The armchairs are all pointed towards the sofa, suggesting the group's focus towards Queen Ellen. The name of Annie's exhibit, Small World, is usually used to react to a slight coincidence or finding a connection where one might not expect. But here it's verging on simulacra and simulation territory. If you don't know what I mean by that, please don't worry. It's a very complex way of discussing relatively simple ideas that generally university lecturers loathe teaching because of this unnecessary complexity. It was a core influence for the postmodernist movement and more crucially The Matrix, which I think demonstrates its concepts quite fluently. Another great example though is a prison. A prison convinces us we are free, we're not locked up like criminals, but through the prison, what it symbolizes, we come to understand we aren't free. We can't do what we want because of laws, because of the prison's very existence. And from that, we realize we exist in a larger prison, that it's been true all along, just not in the way we first assumed. The prison is a signifier of our wider imprisonment. So to put it simply here, Annie controls a small world of miniatures. But through that, we come to understand that to Paimon and the cult, Annie lives in a small, controllable world, that she has no control whatsoever. She is completely unaware of the cult's machinations until it's too late. And that shows us that this initial thing we felt about the dollhouses being these small, controllable spaces with unaware participants is true, just in a deeper and darker way than we first thought. A truth tied to the lie through which we see the truth. It's building this feeling of the family's lives not being their own, of them being dolls on a set, unable to see the bigger picture, and subtextually layering the realities we're aware of during the film. And this is confirmed right after, where we get several shots of Annie wearing her monocular. This is very similar to Peter's covered telescope. While Peter may be entirely unaware and oblivious to events, Annie is watching. She is focused. She just has an extremely narrow view, tunnel vision that eventually leads to the damning of her and her family. She's in a small world, unable to see the bigger picture, convinced she has some measure of what's going on. And as we see her grip on reality falter, her ability to control and produce her small world falls off as she realizes she's not in control. There's one more thing of note regarding the flyer, and that's Annie's decision to use her maiden name for her work. Now, firstly, this made me think of maiden, mother, and crone, which is another descriptor of the three states of womanhood seen in the triple goddess, or pagan trinity, that we're going to look at in detail later. I'm not sure if this is intentional, but it's certainly apt given that it's a keen focus of the film. But beyond that, I think it's clearly demonstrating, really the whole exhibit is demonstrating, that Annie is stuck in the trauma of her past, trapped and unable to escape her mother's shadow. Even the scene behind the laptop is lit with gold. Annie's mother's presence is everywhere in her life, and soon her presence is about to literally be in the workshop. Now, I've already mentioned Annie using these dioramas as a method to at least showcase, but hopefully process her trauma. Later, when we see Annie creating the diorama of Charlie's death, she'll claim this is generating an objective view. And we can certainly say that even prior to the events of the film, she is doing this and considers it to be normal. But really, here is the first time the audience is seeing that, as she's creating a scene very clearly reminiscent to her mother dying at hospital. It's not made 100% clear that this is Ellen, although it absolutely is. And it's worth noting the tightrope the film is walking, as viewers become unsure as to whether this was a request that feels uncomfortable and untimely for Annie to have to complete, or whether this is something she's decided to create. How the film presents Annie through the first and second act is probably the most intelligent character work I've ever seen on screen. I don't know anyone who heard Annie chanting in that room on the first viewing and thought she was anything other than batshit insane, and that's because the film lets you think you're uncovering the mystery, in this being all Annie's mental illness, and in doing that it's got you unknowingly exploring the subtextual themes the film is focused on, the things the supernatural devices are a stand-in for. It's genius, and I really don't use that word lightly. Media usually has two speeds in delivering subtext. Either it's completely out there and up for interpretation like The Lighthouse, or it's something like 1899 or The Purge that's going to beat you around the head with it, shouting, "Look how clever we are." Ari Aster presents a legitimate third way to getting your audience to become aware of your subtext here, and it's nothing short of genius. Like with a lot of this movie though, I'm not even sure it's something you could replicate. Following our proper introduction to Annie's miniatures, we see Steve making the rounds and checking on the family, for the most part being presented distance and dismissive answers. We see Annie let out a sigh as she enters the conversation, whereas Steve greets her with a warm smile. He acts interested and clearly demonstrates care for her and her work, interest and care that she does not demonstrate back. The conversation is left without her reply, and we even see her getting frustrated with the conversation continuing through her raising of the monocular and her finally fully acknowledging Steve. While it's definitely ignoring him out of frustration and distance in this case, it's worth pointing out that nearly every time we see Annie painting her miniatures, it's a fine line between professional focus and full-on vacant fugue-like state like we see during her sleepwalk, which again suggests that she's in her trauma, so to speak, while working on it. We also see her grow increasingly irate as this state is repeatedly included upon, and she becomes less and less able to work and subsequently escape from and process what is going on through this displacement activity. After that, Steve goes to check on Peter, and we do see a more loving relationship here, possibly the healthiest bond in the whole family. But even still, Peter does have problems communicating. He is Annie's son and victim to the Lee bloodline, and subsequently grappled with his own troubles. Just like Annie, he isn't feeling any kind of genuine sadness to have lost his grandma. Now, we know Grandma loves Charlie because Charlie is Paimon, but she may have also kept a distance from Peter, knowing he was going to be entirely displaced from Paimon's full ascension. It's equally possible that he was privy to more of Ellen's behaviour than Charlie, and just like Annie, feels a sense of relief with her passing. Steve seems to understand entirely, likely feeling the exact same way, although he's far more tactful about it than Annie. Steve tells Peter he loves him, and we see Peter clearly struggling and unwilling to say it back. And while that is very normal for a teenage boy, it also finalises for the audience that Steve is the voice of reason and compassion here, and perhaps the only functional member of the family that's at least attempting to openly communicate. In parallel to this, we then see Annie go to check on Charlie, and on the one hand, this is maybe the most emotionally connected, good parenting we see from Annie. On the other, it's at times passive-aggressive, absentee, and she fails to reassure or connect with her child. On a side note, and I probably won't stop mentioning this throughout, look at Toni Collette's range in this scene alone. Not even nominated for an Oscar. Annie immediately picks up Charlie's sketchbook to see a picture of the deceased Ellen. In comparison to her drawings of everyone else, where they look as bad as possible, Ellen looks relatively peaceful and normal. We can assume Char Paimon had a better relationship with Queen Ellen than the rest of the family, and she certainly does seem the most upset. And that's confirmed by Annie telling Charlie she was Ellen's favourite, and that even when she was a baby, Annie wouldn't feed her because Ellen insisted on it. Now, we know why this favouritism exists from Ellen, but the feeding aspect is an essential part of getting Paimon into Charlie's body. This process of possession at birth occurred through the feeding process, something we'll actually see photographic evidence of. There's again clear doublespeak with everything Annie is saying here, and while a first-time viewer may see this as a failed effort to reassure Charlie, it's actually thinly veiled resentment towards her mother and Charlie's closeness, and her distance from both of them. She never got the love from her mother that Charlie did. Charlie responds with the quite worrying statement, "She wanted me to be a boy," which we know means she wanted Paimon to inhabit a male form and be able to achieve full power. Annie clearly takes in the weirdness of this statement, but rather than addressing it or questioning it, she circumvents it entirely by saying she used to be a tomboy when she was growing up, and that she hated dolls and dresses and pink. And this could just be a change of subject, and again, an effort to reassure Charlie, but in doublespeak, I think we're seeing the same thing in Annie that Charlie is feeling now. Ellen made her feel less than because she needed a male host. In Annie's case, her suicidal brother. And so Annie acted male in an effort to win her mother's affection. The mention of hating dolls is also significant, given Annie's choice of career that could be in a way seen as doll making. Charlie asks Annie, "Who's going to take care of me?" And Toni Collette beautifully just lets an edge of crazy into her performance. Clearly again ostracized by her own child and feeling more than quietly annoyed that Charlie saw Ellen as her primary caregiver. What she's missing, of course, is that Charlie knows there's something more going on, that Ellen has likely hinted about these plans to her, and again this idea of Paimon's confused mental state, not really being able to process what's going on or what he is supposed to do. He feels isolated, lonely and confused, and Ellen was the only link he had to being able to understand. It's also an extremely normal reaction for a child to be having following a bereavement. This is likely Charlie's first encounter with it, and again, all of this clever subtext is woven underneath a very realistic expression of grief. From this point in the conversation, Charlie shuts down completely, and Annie gives us the extremely strange information that Charlie hasn't ever cried. And despite seeming like she's being caring here, really she's using the opportunity to see if her child will be normal, will break free from this distance and numbness and connect emotionally. And maybe Annie only does have Charlie's best interests at heart here, but for me, when she says that might feel like a relief, she's talking about for herself as much as for Charlie, and it's clear that Charlie's otherness bothers her a great deal. As Annie leans in to kiss Charlie, she notices the word Satan written on the wall. A lot of people have taken umbrage with Annie and Steve not reprimanding their child for drawing on the walls or inquiring what this wording might mean. I think it's worth pointing out that from one look at Charlie's bedroom, we can see she's won the battle on clutter and weirdness in her room, and her parents have been doing everything possible to encourage this one thing she's interested in. It's also worth noting that just as we're seeing here when Annie notices it, Charlie will shut down when challenged. It's clear her parents know this and don't push her too hard. Beyond that, Annie not mentioning the demonic vandalism can be seen as one of many examples of Annie ignoring or being blind to the clues that are right in front of her. As for what Satany means, it's time to go full occult mode here. Now, if you do a quick Google search of this, you're going to be told it's a word of power used for raising spirits of the dead, and it also bears phonetic resemblance to the word Satan. So in the context of the film, this is a word Pyman remembered and may be using to call Ellen's spirit forth, perhaps not with full knowledge of why, or just because he misses her. I think most people associate the raising of the dead to erroneously mean the raising of Pyman from the underworld, but that doesn't make any sense, he's already here. And when we combine this with the lip oiling and Ellen's apparition right after, it seems pretty clear this is directed towards her. Interestingly, the part of the spell this invocation is always used in is actually banishing the spirit at the end. That is to say, Satany is a word used in necromancy, but it is a word used to banish demons and spirits at the end of the ritual, not summon them. So maybe this isn't part of the ritual to free Ellen's spirit and call her forth within the land of the dead. Maybe this is Pyman's childish effort to banish himself from the body he hates using a word he remembers. And this is somewhat corroborated later by Joan yelling these words at Peter in an effort to somehow weaken his soul's grip on his body, to banish him so Pyman can enter. But if you try to go deeper than that, in terms of where the word has actually come from, it becomes a bit muddled. And in that mess of sources, I think the main articles you'll find online have missed entirely where and why this word is relevant. In fact, I have to go as far as to call out signalhorizon.com, who were the first out with their article regarding the meaning of these occult scribblings you see in the film. Every other article, even major film theory websites like Bloody Disgusting, will give credit to signalhorizon.com for finding this, and from what I can tell, that journalist wasn't just mistaken, they were outright phoning it in. Perhaps they weren't expecting anyone to follow up on it, they certainly weren't expecting to become the top result if you googled the term 5 years later, but for pretty much the entire time since the film's release, the explanation of this word, despite having kind of the correct answer, has just been garbage and lies in terms of its origin. So here's the quote from the article that seemingly everyone has relied upon until now. Firstly, they say it's a surname, which is true, it is a surname, but that has absolutely no relevance to anything. They then identify it as a word of power involved in necromancy, which is predominantly true, but far too vague to work for me as an explanation. They also make mention of a site called spellsofmagic.com, which looks exactly like you'd expect it to. They say the site lists it, but I'm pretty sure they're talking about this user post, which is copy-pasted at various points around the web. You can also find it on angelfire.com, the next place the article mentions. Now, because the journalist in question hasn't realized or doesn't care that Angelfire is just a very old internet hosting service, this is entirely unhelpful. But through googling the terms, I was able to locate this post on Angelfire with the exact same ritual for necromancy. You can actually view this in a few places around the web, and all of them seem to erroneously list a certain grimoire known as the Grimorium Verum, ironically meaning the true grimoire. And that's the conclusion Signal Horizon's article comes to, that it's a word of power originating in the Grimorium Verum, which, if you'll excuse my language, is complete bollocks. Let's start with that grimoire itself. Like most grimoires and magical texts, it claimed a lineage or tradition stemming from King Solomon. Now, this particular grimoire is interesting because at its time of publication, it was undeniably fraudulent, citing itself as being produced in 1517, a full 3 centuries early, supposedly by a man named Ali Bek the Egyptian of Memphis. Memphis, of course, being the historical home for mystery schools, and subsequently a location that will provide a degree of legitimacy to the grimoire. This was also a lie, as the book probably originated in Rome, but not every scholar at the time was aware of that, and in certain versions of the Lesser Key of Solomon, the text where we get a lot of our lore regarding Pyman, this grimoire was actually included. Now, it has been removed in modern versions because it's a proven fraud, but it's worth pointing out that for a brief moment, this grimoire did have a degree of legitimacy. I have read this grimoire cover to cover. There's not a single mention of Satany, and only minor mentions of necromancy. It certainly didn't include the necromancy ritual that seemed to be pasted everywhere online, crediting this very grimoire. So naturally, I had to ask the question, if no one actually knows where it came from, where did it come from? And while I was researching, I found a PDF that did include the word Satany, and a far more detailed explainer of the same ritual of necromancy I've been seeing everywhere. The book in question is Mastering Witchcraft, a practical guide for witches, warlocks and covens by Mr. Paul Hewson. Now, some of you may be aware, but there was an explosion in popularity of occultism during the 1970s. In the UK where I live, it was largely expressed as Satanism, and while there is still a whole satanic movement, we can say that witchcraft predominantly became the trend that lasted. And a large portion of that popularity has to be put down to this book. It was extremely influential and truly did become a handbook for budding witches and warlocks in the 1970s. I cannot say for certain, but I'm 95% positive this is where Ari Aster took inspiration from. And I say that
The
because
exit's
I
on
didn't
that
stop
side.
there. I wanted to find the origins of the word to be able to find the real meaning. So I know with certainty that when the word appears prior to this, chronologically, in other publications, it's going to be spelled Satani, not Satoni, as we see in the film. For that reason, I'm pretty sure it's this exact book, or digital repostings of it, that Ari Aster took inspiration from. But as I said, knowing that doesn't tell us much about its actual meaning, and if this is an old word of power, then where did Paul Hewson get it from? Or the whole ritual for necromancy for that matter. Why did he spell it differently? Well, to answer the second question first, it's very similar to a lot of these words of power that use similar constructions, like Dagony, for example. It may just have been a typo. I think it's more likely, though, that Satoni sounded less on the nose than Satani to a 1970s audience hyper concerned with Satan. As for where he got it from, I was entirely stumped. And I mean like really stumped, to be brutally honest with you. I knew that Paul Hewson's book had a bibliography that for some reason was excluded from digital versions. Without someone who had an original copy, I was pretty much out of luck. It was clear what I needed, and what I needed was a waller. And quite frankly, I went looking for copper and found gold in this regard. Enter u/Michael Cornell, who not only had a copy of the book to hand, but had a terrifying and impressive library of knowledge on the occult. He was able to confirm for me that Paul Hewson had not included any kind of citation for his ritual of necromancy, nor did his bibliography make reference to the Grimorium Verum, so we were able to rule that out entirely. With that fully debunked, the challenge became, then where did all of this come from? And Mikkel was able to find another, essentially, handbook on witchcraft and spellcasting from the turn of the 20th century, that being A.E. Waite's The Book of Ceremonial Magic.
You guys see
written
what
in
I see with that
1913.
number?
A.E. Waite is a relatively well-known figure, a British poet and scholarly mystic that was a member of the Golden Dawn and the Freemasons, who garnered a good amount of fame from his work with tarot cards. Now here is the part of the spell we're concerned with from Paul Hewson's book and the many online posts. I'm not going to read it out loud because obviously I don't want any dead relatives popping up to say hello. And here is essentially the same invocation from A.E. Waite's text from the final chapter concerning infernal necromancy. Now, there are a lot more things we had to fact check. It's a 2-page ritual and the details are often slightly different between authors, but here we found an exact match and finally we were getting somewhere. Now, Waite's Book of Ceremonial Magic is essentially a mishmash of different older grimoires brought together in one text. And at the bottom of the chapter concerning infernal necromancy, there was a citation which I'm going to put up on the screen. This gives us not only likely the earliest mention of this spell, the spell that's used throughout the movie and the spell that we get these words from, but also a better explanation as to what the word is. Not simply a word of power, but a barbarous word. The original grimoire in question is the Verus Jesuitarum Libellus, or the true magical work of the Jesuits. And this particular grimoire, likely written in 18th or 19th century Berlin, was translated into English a few decades later, and the person in charge of that translation was A.E. Waite, the same guy who would go on to write the Book of Ceremonial Magic. It's also worth pointing out that following his possession of the grimoire, it was gifted to the Cleveland Public Library, and most of the information
What
we
does
could
this
find
number
on it
look
was from an
like?
archive page on their website. And within the
In
grimoire,
terms
we
of
see
spelling,
the exact
10,
same invocation we've seen everywhere else, almost certainly in
7,
its earliest
which could
form.
be,
So now we know everything
standing
we need to
for
know
an
about its
I.
etymology. What can we say for certain? Well, it's not just a word of power.
2,
That's a broad, all-encompassing term. It is, as I mentioned, a
R.
barbarous word, which were words of power popular in European magic that were names, pronouns of demons and lesser demons that still evoke
Yes,
them,
yes,
even if
indeed.
the original meaning of the
Yes,
name had been lost.
indeed.
And that's mostly accurate. If I say to you, Furstigon or Seagon, chances are they won't mean anything to you. But Satan has really stuck around. In fact, it's become one of the many names simply rolled in to mean the devil. In occult history, Lucifer, Beelzebub, Astaroth, Satany, these are all different beings, but today we've kind of streamlined it. So truthfully, as obvious as that may have been from the start, it's the name of a demon and it's used pretty much solely in spells involving necromancy. So to quickly sum that all up, no, this word did not originate in the Grimorium Verum, as every article online seems to think. It was first published in the Verus Jesuitarum Libellus, brought to wider attention by A. Waite's Book of Ceremonial Magic, and modernized in Paul Hewson's Mastering Witchcraft. And if it seems like all of this is splitting hairs to you, I do apologize, but when we look at the definition everyone has been following, there's almost no part of it that's accurate. So I just want to thank u/Michael Cornell again for all of his help, and hopefully we've been able to bust that myth wide open as well. To go back to Charlie's room and Annie failing to connect for a moment, I just want to draw your attention to this shot. As Annie gets up to leave, we see the camera focus on Charlie's desk to give us a better view of what's going on. Here we see the theme of dolls continue in the extremely worrying clutter filling Charlie's room. In this case, it seems more like she's trying to construct symbolic representations of Paimon, or perhaps the cult. This is clear from the focus on crowned figures, which is a key part of Paimon's aesthetic. It's more follower worship and idolatry than doll houses and art shows, and is absolutely connected with the satanic magic at work in the film. So again, we have another example of a hereditary practice at work. Annie makes dolls, daughter makes dolls. I think we could safely presume that dead grandma made dolls. She certainly made doormats, but from Annie suggesting she hated dolls, we know they were at least somewhat pushed on her in her youth. So grandma was very clearly aware of the relationship between dolls and satanic forces, but Annie isn't. The meaning may have been lost, but the tradition hasn't, due to the hereditary passing. The film is saturated with it. In fact, Charlie has just drawn a picture of Ellen. Annie has just finished painting Ellen. In the next scene, we'll have the exact same mirroring with Annie's bedroom. There's clearly a relationship at work between the real world and these representations. In Annie's case, processing the past, and in Paimon's case, orchestrating the future. Both are acting out subconscious thought, but one is based in trauma and the other desire. There's also an upside down glass on the desk, and with what looks to be cobwebs inside, the presumption being that Charlie has trapped a spider in there. And this idea of a trapped insect is, to me, at least a clear metaphor for how the potentially insectoid Paimon is feeling at this moment, trapped and confused and wanting to escape. So it's not a big reach to say Char Paimon has trapped it there in a weird form of kinship. They see something in it they recognize in themselves, which again could be quite humanizing until you realize Char Paimon just wants the insect to suffer as they are doing. In terms of narrative progression, what happens in the next scene is perhaps the most crucial in the entire film, because it's here where Annie is jump-started into supernatural belief. We see Annie enter her workshop to close things up for the night, and when she does, she notices a box of her mother's belongings. It's unclear throughout the scene exactly what Annie is reacting to. This could be a spontaneous decision to look through a box that's always been there. It could be that certain things have moved position or been introduced while she was out of the room. What we can say for sure is that the layout of the dioramas in the room has switched in the short amount of time since we last saw Annie in the workshop. She may have just tidied up before finishing work, but I think if you watch her expressions throughout this scene, there's certainly an inkling that some of these things may have been moved or altered. She briefly flicks through a photo album, seeing childhood photos of Peter and Charlie before seemingly getting upset with it. She then moves to a yellow gold covered book, which, as we know, is an indicator of Ellen and the cult. It's titled Notes on Spiritualism, and is clearly designed to draw Annie's attention as it has a note for her sticking out from under the cover. Really, this is the bait designed to draw Annie into investigating the supernatural, something necessary for the cult's plan to succeed. They need her and Peter worn down and open to these ideas, not just so that the next stages of their plan will come to fruition, but also so they're mentally weak enough to be possessed by Paimon. Looking at the note itself, something about it is extremely wrong to both Annie and the audience. Not just the eerie foreshadowing, but more the overly loving tone. This is entirely separate from everything we've come to understand about Ellen, who by all means was a cold and private woman that played favourites and mentally tortured her loved ones. And obviously we can pull out some pretty clear hints here, like "Forgive me, all the things I could not tell you" is clearly Ellen's lamentation that she hasn't been able to share her plan with her daughter. "Please don't hate me and try not to despair your losses" is clearly in reference to what Annie is about to lose to the cult. First her daughter and her sanity, then her husband and her own life, and finally her son. And lastly, our sacrifice will pale next to the rewards, which is in reference to the riches and knowledge the cult will gain from Paimon and the family's rewards in the afterlife now Ellen is his queen. And all that's pretty straightforward, but what I really want to draw your attention to is how staggeringly loving and out of character Ellen is acting here, because that's the deeper takeaway. I truly believe that this is the real Ellen, which is to say, how Ellen really felt about Annie. She was just, above all else, keenly motivated to accomplish her goals, at the grand sacrifice of everything else. She knew she was right, at least in the sense that what she believed was real, and she would stop at nothing to get that eternal privilege for her family, even if it meant lying to them, manipulating and torturing them for years, and ultimately orchestrating a situation that would lead to all of their deaths. By the time Ellen's plan is done, there isn't a single member of the Lee or Graham family left alive. And as misguided as that was, all the abuse and strained relationships it led to across 3 generations, perhaps the most haunting part of all of it was that Ellen deeply loved her family, and yet was so motivated to see the plan through, she kept it all far down. This could be a lie, it could be a manipulation of the cult, they told sicker lies during the film, but I honestly believe here is maybe the only time that Ellen has ever spoken to Annie in a way that she really felt. When she says "please don't hate me," it's an admission of her fears that Annie won't appreciate the bigger picture once she finally sees it. She wants them to have a future together, and as effed up as that may be, it's a recurring theme throughout the movie that will only really demonstrate our full emotional care for our loved ones when we lose them. Annie acts entirely distant from Charlie for the majority of their time together, until the extreme outburst of grief at her death and burial, and the second half of the movie where she becomes obsessed with summoning her dead spirit. Annie acts as though Steve is a millstone in most of their interactions, but his bursting into flame and subsequent death is what pushes Annie over the edge, finally rendering her weak enough for Pyman to possess. It's not terribly dwelt upon, but this is another realistic hallmark of grief that the film is very concerned with. It's honestly maybe the closest thing it has to a positive message. Don't leave it too late to tell people what they mean to you. And with that, Annie puts the book back and we get to my favourite shot in the entire movie, and I think it's my favourite shot because it's just so impactful for how cheap it must have been to film. Again, it's one of those things where it's very overdone. Light switches in horror movies are essentially a jump scare trigger, but here once again it's done so elegantly, so minimalistically, that it makes you wonder how no one ever did this before. And when you look at it, it's actually a reverse jump scare, with the jump cut happening as the ghost disappears rather than appears. When we do cut to Ellen, she's standing there calmly, wavering slightly, staring happily at Annie, right in front of those blueprint-style plans. If we view it in context of the note we just read, it's difficult not to see it as a loving visitation. But given what we know about the plans surrounding Annie, chances are it is designed to terrify her and push her more towards belief in the occult. I do not think for Ellen that's mutually exclusive with loving Annie though, so I still see Ellen's smile as a loving one here, despite everything. And then Annie flicks the light on and Ellen disappears in the same frame. The camera doesn't need to move, you just have Ellen standing there in one shot, have her move out of shot, and then keep shooting. Stitch the scenes together in that frame, and there you go. It's terrifying, beautiful, and perfectly executed, while never risking the realist aesthetic of the film, and likely never costing an extra dime. I mentioned Rosemary's Baby earlier as being an obvious visual influence on the film, and I think here, and at several other points during the film, we'll see visual allusion to another one of my all-time favourite horror films, Don't Look Now. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but if you have lost someone close to you, you may recognise this strange level of hallucination. It's reasonably common to see faces in the dark or recognise the deceased on faces of strangers, as your traumatised mind airbags itself into the loss. And I think Annie's softly croaked out call of mom here is exactly in line with this. Exactly in line with the feeling of losing grip on your sanity during extreme grief. Exactly in line with this eerie feeling that someone we've lost is somehow present with us. It feels silly almost to acknowledge it out loud, insane even, and I think I recognise some of that in Toni Collette's performance here. She may be scared, but at this point she feels more ridiculous about her own traumatised perception than anything else. We then see Annie notice the diorama of her mother trying to involve herself in the breastfeeding of Charlie. As we'll come to find out, this process was essential in installing and maintaining Pyman within Charlie's body. But beyond the literal explanation of the supernatural, we can again see this as being representative of a dysfunctional family unit. An overbearing mother and her daughter who has subsequently felt as though her life was not her own. It's unclear from Annie's reaction whether this diorama has been turned around for her to notice, or if she has a sudden discomfort with it after seeing the ghostly apparition of her mother. And you'll notice that this diorama is Annie and Steve's current bedroom, so we again have this mirroring between the dioramas and reality as we move from this shot to Annie and Steve in the same room. There is one key difference, which is the colour of the lamps, which change from a Pyman blue to an Ellen gold. On the surface, this is just a cute moment between the two as Annie decides not to bother Steve with what's just happened. But the real takeaway into this very brief glimpse at the supposedly loving side of their relationship should be the alcohol and pills they're self-medicating with, and Annie's ultimate decision to keep her experiences private from Steve, something that will prove essential in their undoing. Next up, we see Charlie and Peter in their respective classrooms. They attend West High School. I have seen a few people getting this wrong and calling it Northwest High School, and it's likely because Northwest is so leaned on everywhere else. And it is actually a real school, actually the oldest public high school in the state of Utah. And it's not just used in name, this is where they filmed also, and this choice of school is significant as Pyman is referred to in the film and in existing law as the King of the Northwest. And this film goes to some crazy lengths to sneak references in there to it, this being the first and maybe most blatant. And yes, I do think this association with Pyman means there's a very good chance that the school is under the influence of the cult. This association with the Northwest comes from the Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonium, or False Monarchy of Demons, by Dutch occultist Johann Weyer. Written in 1577, this is one of the earliest grimoires to include Paimon as we now recognise him, that being a demonic entity tied to the Christian mythos rather than the earlier Jim figure. It makes mention that when summoning Paimon, the sorcerer must look towards the northwest because there is his house. In later grimoires, however, he would be simply referred to as the King in the West, and there would be some degree of back and forth over whether it was better to look north or west or northwest when invocating him, with west being slightly more common. So while northwest has stuck around and is what Joan refers to Paimon as in the film, the name West should be viewed as being essentially synonymous here. Both West and Northwest are referential to Paimon. And we can say that for certain because when Annie is chanting the summon ritual later on, she will use the phrase Rex Occidentalis, which is Latin for King of the West. So even within the lore of the film, they're acknowledging this fluency between the actual direction. So first up is Charlie's classroom, which as I mentioned earlier is a special needs class. We see that much like Annie, the teacher has likely learned that Charlie requires a gentle touch or she'll just shut down entirely, and that seems like good advice because even this relatively passive intrusion is enough to incur a bird killing itself against the classroom window. Now, a question I had when watching this is, does Paimon physically will this bird into suicide so that she can continue with her plan, or is this bird somehow just attracted to the evil and kills itself without meaning to? In the script it's left deliberately vague, but we do see the acknowledgement that Charlie is unfazed by this interruption, which is perhaps our best clue that she had prior knowledge it was about to happen. I think ultimately that's what I side with. Maybe not necessarily that Charlie just understands she can psychically control birds, but that she was willing for something to distract the teacher's attention away from her. And through this grand supernatural power that Paimon holds, that's manifested in a way where it got her precisely what she wanted, a bird carcass to play with. And of course we see Charlie focus down on the scissors, getting ready for the next step of her plan almost immediately. So maybe not too much of a mystery, but a little bit open to your interpretation of just how conscious Paimon is of all this. But this does begin the larger question of what's the deal with Charlie and birds? We see multiple references to this, from her use of the decapitated bird head for a doll, several different bird and bird-like figures in her room, to the bird cages we see in the treehouse, or birdhouse as I've actually heard it referenced to. So first and foremost, like with the flies and insectoid images called to mind, I think it's fair to say that Paimon feels a certain degree of kinship with the bird, likely even more so. And as I mentioned, I think this could have something to do with his real demonic image as he exists in hell. Alex Wolff's performance as Paimon is distinctly bird-like, and just as with insects there are several birds that do make clicking noises. But perhaps the best evidence for this comes from Ari Aster, who only one time, as far as I can tell during his Reddit AMA, referred to the click as a cluck. And insects do not cluck, but birds sure do. So with a reasonable degree of certainty, I'm going to say that within the context of the movie, we can see Paimon in the underworld as a bird-like figure surrounded by flies and pestilence. Remember, he only takes a human form as a mode of possession. We see a good amount of evidence for this kinship with bird forms, most notably in this bird Charlie decapitates and uses in the central piece of her diorama of Paimon worship. Ari Aster has confirmed this functions as a metaphor for the cult and Paimon's rose for the family and the ending scene in general, where we see Charlie's head mounted on an effigy in the exact same way. So we know that Paimon has chosen the bird to represent themselves. Aster describes Charlie's bird head diorama as being not too far away from what we get from the ending scene, where Paimon is being worshipped by the cult. Even the beak-like bandages Peter gets towards the end, an injury that Paimon goes out of his way to inflict on Peter, can be seen as an effort to make him look more bird-like. Let's come back to that ending in a moment, but first we need to look at what specific birds are used during the film, as birds almost always are used on screen for their applied meaning. We have the pigeon that flies into the window, the dove chocolate that Charlie is so fond of, and then the whippoorwill, which featured more heavily in the original script, where they were intended to be shown roosting during the funeral. We actually see the whippoorwill on screen right at the end, sat in the birdcage, hanging from the roof of the treehouse. I think it's a whippoorwill. It's not particularly easy to make out, and my knowledge of birds isn't existent, but the script says it's a whippoorwill, and I'm not aware of any reason to doubt it. So firstly, pigeons and doves, in biblical terms, are both related to sacrifice, both seen as animals worthy of being accepted as offerings to God. And what's interesting here is we kind of have a stand-in for a stand-in. If you remember earlier, I mentioned Ari Aster describing the family as a sacrificial lamb, and the way they're being sacrificed. And in biblical terms, if you didn't have a lamb, that's when you might sacrifice a dove. And if you didn't have a lamb or a dove, that's when you might sacrifice a pigeon. And whippoorwills, like almost every black furred or feathered animal, is thought to signify impending death. which honestly is pretty cut and dry whichever way you look at it. 5 people have died just bringing Paimon into the world in this form. I highly doubt the deaths are going to stop there. Not only that, but when we see the whippoorwill at the end, it's trapped in a birdcage, symbolizing Paimon, this embodiment of death, trapped in the improper vessel of Charlie, preventing him from reaching his true and terrible potential. As I've mentioned, the film makes a habit out of taking tired tropes and making them feel fresh and new. And perhaps one of the most overdone metaphors in literature is the birdcage, specifically in relation to a girl or woman trapped by society, the patriarchy, and so on. The bird is the woman, the cage is her imprisonment under her husband or in her stately home, etc. But not here. Here we see an inversion of that. The cage is the girl, the empty vessel of Charlie, and the whippoorwill, the sign of impending death, is Paimon, trapped within. There are some more widespread meanings to these birds that are worth mentioning. I'm sure most of you would relate doves with peace, but also perhaps purity and innocence. And pigeons are known to symbolize prosperity, fertility, and transformation, all things that Queen Ellen was hyper concerned with. She's been promised riches to the conjurer, she meddles and involves herself directly in Annie's reproduction, and she's keenly interested in transforming members of her bloodline into vessels for Paimon. And Charlie, the original Charlie, the Charlie that was sacrificed, can be seen as our pure, innocent dove that had never had the chance to sin. So if you're looking to attribute this trinity of birds to accompanying characters, we can do so pretty simply. The whippoorwill represents Paimon, a caged embodiment of death. The dove, that's not even really seen on screen, is the original Charlie that was displaced. And the pigeon represents Ellen, providing Paimon with the spiritual resistance she requires, like flying pigeons into windows at opportune moments or ghostly apparitions in the attic. Shortly after, we see Charlie on her way to decapitate the pigeon. Decapitation, of course, is something we know Paimon has a real fondness of. At that point, we see this creepy cult lady doing her best to encourage Charlie, and I've seen some people suggest she may have sent the bird at the window, and I guess if that's your headcanon it could be true, but she'd either have to have a very accurate throw or a whole lot of pigeons. To me, she's just there to up the creep factor and provide this feeling that the cult are watching the family even when they think they're entirely alone and unobserved. Next, we get to see Peter's classroom, where they're discussing Women of Trachis, an ancient Greek tragedy written by Sophocles, focusing on Deianira, the wife of Heracles. As is relatively apparent from what's discussed, it's concerned primarily with the binding of the characters to their fate, the idea that their destiny has been predetermined by their decisions long ago. The ultimate tragedy being that the events had always been inescapable. And that, of course, is why it's given such clear attention by the film. This is exactly the same for the Graham family. They are bound to their fate, bound to the path that Ellen has put them on, entirely unaware that their fate is closing in on. It's a clear parallel between the two stories. Bridget, the girl in front of Peter that he's entirely infatuated with, describes Heracles' fatal flaw as arrogance, saying that he literally fails to see the signs handed to him literally throughout the entire play. And as she says that, the camera focuses on Peter, giving us clear indication that he's oblivious to the signs around him too. In fact, as the teacher is informing us that Heracles was undone due to his fatal flaw, we see Peter engrossed on Bridget's butt, and it's his pursuit of Bridget that ultimately leads to Charlie's death and the subsequent tragedies that follow. And while this blindness to what's coming is emphasized in Peter's case, it is true of the entire family, with Ari Aster saying outright, this is absolutely inevitable. The family has absolutely zero agency. But this is hereditary, and we also have to consider that the filmmakers are having fun with the audience too. The signs as to what's happening are littered throughout the movie. There's even a couple in this scene that we're about to look at. So again, we see this layering where we know the family are pawns in the larger game, but through these meta tricks the film is playing, we start to feel as though we are too. It's also worth noting that this scene is a nod to John Carpenter's Halloween, where we see a similar high school class discussing similar
Did you ever
themes of
watch
fate
it, Mikey?
and predestined tragedy.
Movie
The film poses a question
literally
directly
made
to
me
the
sick to my
audience.
stomach
Does
when
the
I watched
tragedy
it.
being predetermined make it more or less
Because
tragic? And while it invites
there
you
was
to draw your
something
own
very
conclusions on
real
that,
about
the film
it.
almost certainly comes down on the side of it being
My
more tragic.
experience
And it's
with
difficult
the,
to not pair that with the hereditary theme of things
with,
being passed from generation
particular
to generation.
entities.
It all seems like a pretty clear metaphor for predestined or genetically predetermined factors like mental illness and so on, as well as negative inherited behaviors
Have you
that
seen
we've
it,
discussed previously.
Mikey?
Essentially, the tragedy of things we cannot avoid, the vast majority
Alright.
of which stem from hereditary factors. All of this is obscured from the audience, so as not to be too on the nose. We have Peter staring at Bridget's butt, we have his friend asking if he wants to smoke weed later, the class clown derailing the lesson, and this being bookended by Charlie's pigeon surgery. It all works together to put this relatively on-the-nose foreshadowing regarding predestiny into the background and away from the audience's attention. Now, a big question people have here is regarding who is and isn't a cult member. For most of the extras in the scene, we can't really say for certain because we just don't see enough of them. But the characters that see continued involvement in the film, namely Brendan, Bridget, and Mr. Davies,
Yeah, I could only watch it
absolutely are
once,
involved
and
in the cult.
it stuck with
Truthfully,
me.
I think the original version of the film, as it existed in the script, had non-cult side
Moral
characters.
of the story,
But the film
do
as
not
it
fuck
exists
with
today,
demons.
I think every side character, every background extra, could be a cult member. And I don't think there are any speaking characters that we can say are definitely innocent. Brendan and Bridget don't just share similar names, they also have this slightly Aryan, slightly Midwich Cuckoos, Children of the Corn vibe that we see from other cult members. I'm not saying there's anything necessarily racial or even uniform about the cult members, I just think the film plays with similar aesthetics to suggest continuity and people working together behind the scenes. As to how we know they're involved with the cult, in Brendan's case, it's because he's seemingly the guy getting Peter to smoke weed, and we know with reasonable certainty Peter's weed is somehow mixed or laced with Dittany of Crete, the herb Ellen and the cult use to better facilitate possession. In Bridget's case, the links are a little more hidden. First and foremost, Peter's attraction to her is the reason he dismisses Charlie. It's another pivotal moment that needs to happen for the cult's plan to be successful. The room she takes Peter in at the party has kids watching a decapitation clip on their laptop. We see her wearing a bracelet that's a
sibling
similar
hang out the
style
car.
jewelry,
Yeah, that's a good
worn by
idea.
a woman. We see at Annie's
That
meeting,
is
who's
a-
known
that
to
is a
be cult
stellar
member.
idea.
We also see her wearing the red of the cult and the turquoise blue of Hyman. But all of that is somewhat flimsy. Luckily, firm proof is found in this shot of Bridget's Facebook page. I've seen some people suggest that these two photos are both somewhat reminiscent of Hyman's sigil, and I think this image of a dog wearing what looks to be a little crown is definitely reminiscent of the crowned Hyman and his crowned camel, and the crowned bird head we see. The second photo also looks a little bit like Charlie on the movie poster, also perhaps like a child staring in a terrarium or a fish tank, which we'll come to later. But the most clear evidence comes in this hidden reveal of her second name, Malpi, which is Latin for siren, the mythical creatures that guise themselves as beautiful women and lord sailors in with their hypnotic song. This is fitting too, given the focus on Greek mythology in their classes and this somewhat Grecian aesthetic to her jewellery. The meaning is clear, she's the cult siren sent to lure Peter in with her beauty and give him tunnel vision while they scheme around him. And lastly, we have Mr. Davies, the teacher. There's only really one solid bit of evidence for his cult involvement, although there is an outside chance he's one of the naked figures at the end. It comes much later on when Peter is essentially being led by the light blue energy through the school. We see the energy hone in on his classroom door, and through the window Mr. Davies, in a red sweatshirt, red being a colour suggesting cult involvement, beckons Peter inside right in the centre of the light. So it doesn't outright confirm it like Bridget's name, but given how subtle the film can be, I think this should be taken as a pretty obvious sign. Following the sequence at the school, we get this shot of Annie's laptop that shows us her recent experience with Ellen has had the desired effect, and her mind is opening to the idea of the supernatural, weakening her mental state and allowing for events to unfold, up to and including her becoming possessed herself. Upon leaving her workshop, she sees the door to her mother's old room open, and on walking in to investigate it, she notices a large triangle marked into the floor. We know from the script that it's pointed towards the northwest. Annie is clearly a bit creeped out, but sees the unlocked door as the problem, rather than the triangle. Again, we see this idea of Annie being blind to the machinations of the cult, signs that have been around her entire life. We see triangles used at multiple points by the cult in their invocation rituals. This is almost certainly the one Ellen used to summon Paimon into Charlie. Triangles are extremely popular in occult rituals and esotericism in general, going as far back as stars and other celestial objects as far as their first appearances in mystic rites and texts. In the necromancy spell we mentioned earlier, for example, a triangle is used specifically to house an image of the person you intend to summon, and we see that exactly later when this spell is used on Peter. Annie inquires about the open door with Steve, and we see he has no idea about it either. We'll never actually get confirmation, but it seems almost certain that this is the cult members doing this, attempting to further drive Annie's belief and investigation of the supernatural. And as they go to make sure it's secure, we see Steve get the call from the cemetery telling him Ellen's grave has been vandalized, which is again the work of the cult. While that will be crucial to the ritual later on, what's important in this scene is both Annie and Steve's decision to lie to the other. Steve does not want to concern Annie with such morbid news so soon after the funeral, and Annie seemingly doesn't want to share her vulnerability in attending grief counselling with Steve, which is odd given Steve's a psychiatrist and hints towards this distance that exists between the family. He's more than qualified to listen to her, but for whatever reason she's decided she'd be more comfortable sharing it in front of strangers. Neither of them are lying maliciously, but it's the first real crack the film presents between them. And this distance, Annie's lying to Steve about where she's going, him keeping her out of the loop about the grave, it's essential to their later arcs. Annie will dive too deeply into into powers she doesn't understand, leaving it too late to convince Steve of the supernatural, and Steve will eventually come to suspect Annie of stealing Ellen's body herself and placing it in the attic. Their fates are bound by the decisions they've made, and the decisions, this encroaching negativity, is all due to the hereditary influence of Ellen and the manipulative actions of the cult. The last character we really get to know is Annie. By this point we know there's something very weird going on with Charlie, we know Peter is a somewhat troubled teenage boy motivated by blondes and buds, and Steve is a stoic and patient paternal figure, somewhat disconnected from his family, though not through lack of trying. Perhaps too passive and not authoritarian. We've even seen two very different sides to Ellen, the side we see Annie and Steve make reference to, and the side we see from a more caring Ellen in the know. But Annie has been someone the film has closed off from us. It's difficult to get a read on her at this point. This is of course intentional, as the first two acts toy with the audience, refusing to tell us plainly that Annie has gone insane or she's right about the supernatural occurrences. But here for the first time, the film really lets us meet her on an emotional level. The building Annie arrives at for her meeting has a red painted front. We see a similar choice of colour on the grief recovery group sign, all indicators that the cult is involved here. And as I mentioned, we see group members here that we know for certain are part of the cult, as well as Joan of course, who is perhaps the cult's de facto leader, now Ellen has been sacrificed. There's also a chance that the leader of the grief recovery group is a cult member we see on screen, but again it's not particularly clear who's kneeling at the end, as we can't see all the faces. I think we can say though, in all likelihood, probably everyone here is a cult member, and this whole group exists solely for Annie's benefit. Annie's speech here is extremely telling, but a lot of it we've already covered, so I'm going to throw the whole thing up on the screen and just very quickly go through the important points or stuff we might have missed. Firstly, the DID she mentions Ellen having. As I touched on earlier, this is very open to interpretation. It could be that on top of all the other goings on that she did actually develop DID. Personally, I think it's much more likely that this is either some element of being driven insane or somehow sharing a mind with Pyman, or she explained her plans or beliefs to a doctor as a form of end-of-life admission and they interpreted it as DID and dementia. Annie mentions her father dying from starvation when she was a baby after suffering from psychotic depression, and again I already touched on that, that's where we get the keep out room. This is resultant from the cult and Ellen's meddling. Either he saw what they were up to and locked himself away, and that reaction was subsequently put down to psychotic depression, or much like we see with the Graham family, he may have been purposefully driven to a mentally unstable place to suit the needs of the cult, i.e. get him out of the way so Ellen could be fully betrothed to Pyman. She also mentions her brother's schizophrenia and that he killed himself ultimately because his mother was trying to put people inside of him. This obviously is Ellen's initial attempt to insert Pyman into a human vessel. From there she goes on a bit of a ramble about Ellen's later years, and it's here that we get the information that she was kept away from Peter in his youth and that she was able to get her hooks in Charlie. After that, things get even more abstract. She softly criticizes her family and ends with this feeling she can't explain, a feeling of being blamed. And what she's grasping at but can't say is this hidden narrative of the cult and Ellen's plans that have shadowed her entire life. This feeling that she can't explain of her life somehow not being hers, and ultimately the resentment she felt from her mother initially in not being born a boy, and later in keeping her firstborn boy away from her mother. And that's all pretty concrete, but it's important to remember that beyond what's actually going on in the film, all the supernatural truth behind what Annie is describing here, that subtextually we are using this as a vehicle to discuss mental illness, trauma and abuse within the family unit. That we're constantly dancing a knife edge between the supernatural sacrifice and the image of a woman who's felt controlled and demanded upon her entire life, never getting the love she deserved from her parents, now struggling to forge emotional connections with the family she was never sure she wanted. And with that out of the way, that's all the foundational work we need to do. So let's take a breath and get ready for the horror. This is part 2, The Descent. After the meeting, we see Peter in his room taking hits from the bong like his name's Be Real, and there's a couple of important Easter eggs here. Firstly, we have a cult member watching Peter outside of his window and clearly getting alarmed that they can be seen as we hear their breathing tense up slightly. From here, the film is going to keep peppering background cultists anywhere it can get away with. We also have possible black specks in Peter's weed, which are very possibly Dittany of Crete. And lastly, we have Brendan inviting him to the party and telling him to bring a certain part of his body, which isn't much of an Easter egg, but really what's happening here is the cult is telling him to think with his sexuality and blindly pursue Bridget. over in Charlie's room, and she's working on her diorama and again snacking on chocolate. There's no hidden meaning behind Charlie's sweet tooth. Ari Aster confirmed it's just a vehicle for the audience not questioning Charlie's fondness for cake during the party scene. As this scene closes, we see a key clue in the shot of Charlie's baby photograph. We see Ellen feeding her, and in the bottle is an obscured black herb. This is Dittany of Crete, which we later see in Ellen's box of packed up belongings, in Steve's weed, and on Annie's lips at Joan's house. It's used to facilitate possession, and here in this photograph we see the evidence that it's how Ellen installed and perhaps at first maintained Pyman within Charlie's body. But the main question arising from this scene is the blue light shimmering around Charlie, something that becomes increasingly more prevalent through the course of the film. We're going to look at what it is and what it represents exactly in a little bit, but for now we need to ask who or what is controlling it. And we have a few options. It could be some result of the cult's magic, it could be Pyman, or it could be some other element of the supernatural, a guiding hand that we're never really introduced to. And honestly, it's not really going to change much, whatever your reading is of that, but for what it's worth, the light is turquoise blue, which we know is seemingly related to Pyman. This wisp is quite far away from anything we see in the cult's rituals, and most importantly we know that Peter is ultimately possessed by Pyman, and we see this light, this wisp, enter his body. So in terms of which answer is most likely, given the information provided to us, it's almost certainly Pyman. Now a big question then becomes how. If we assume this blue light is Pyman, then how can it simultaneously be interior and exterior to Charlie, who at this moment has Pyman inside her? For all intents and purposes, she is Pyman. Well, when we see these sort of pulses like Charlie does here, I imagine them as a kind of subconscious sonar guiding the possessed mind towards where it needs to be. Later when we see Peter's possession, we'll see a far more distinct wisp-like light, which I think is more clearly the soul or spiritual embodiment of Pyman. But I don't think it's as black and white as that. Later, Peter will see these pulses prior to being fully possessed, so clearly this is some sort of signal Pyman can just give off so long as the person is spiritually vulnerable enough to see it. And it does suggest, not prove, but suggest, that although all of Charlie is Pyman, maybe all of Pyman isn't in Charlie. We know that he has another form, a non-human form, residing in Hell, in the city of Pandemonium. So maybe while all of Charlie, and later all of Peter, is consumed and controlled by Pyman, maybe exterior to that, Pyman is also still aware and affecting things from the spiritual plane or from within Hell itself. And the more I think about it, the more I like it as an answer, because ultimately this feels like something that's exterior to Charlie. It does feel like she's being led somewhere by something. And truthfully, there is no other named supernatural force in the film beyond Pyman for it to be. He is referred to as the 8th King of Hell, so we know there's at least 7 others. Maybe one of them could be helping him out. But truthfully, I think it's far more likely that this is just some unknown extension of Pyman's abilities, despite, let's say, a certain percentage of his psyche being occupied elsewhere within Charlie. We're going to pick this back up in a moment and go through what this light shimmer actually means, why this particular effect was chosen, and why it's relevant to the movie. But for now, I think we can say that this is possible because Pyman still exists in some way outside of Charlie, as a force in the spiritual realm and as his true form back in Hell. This would be Pyman's spiritual or in-between manifestation, and we'll look into exactly what that is shortly. We get a bit more of a glimpse into the state of Annie's career as we see her dodging emails from the exhibit owners regarding the status of her work. Really, this collapse we see of her career is just a marker of her declining mental state that the audience can keep track of. But on a meta level, we see this relationship between the reality of the film and the dioramas continuing. As she loses grip on the larger dollhouse, her family, the unwitting dolls of Pyman and the cult, so too does she lose grip on the smaller worlds she creates and supposedly controls. This is driven home here as we see her working on a diorama that seems to be an art exhibit of dioramas, a small world within a small world. We've been encouraged to view the events we're seeing as levels within levels, that the reality of the film, really our reality, is akin to a diorama, a dollhouse for some far grander beings. Now, perhaps this is Annie just being meta, and it was always intended as part of the exhibit, to have a miniature version of the exhibit. But earlier we see Steve asking her what she's working on, and she seems to indicate the hospice and the preschool are her major remaining projects. I think there's a good chance that in an effort to combat her mounting anxiety and failure to produce for the exhibition, she's using her only outlet for creating dioramas to create a diorama of her film. We see her face much more serious issues in this moment later on, and there is something beautifully self-obstructive about creating the exhibit she's already struggling to create in miniature that seems to define Annie to a T. While we're on the subject of Annie's miniatures, we should also touch on this scene from a few minutes later, where we see a diorama, again of Ellen, in Annie's bedroom, this time watching from the door while Annie runs to Steve. Now firstly, we again see Annie react to this diorama almost as if she's shocked by it, and again we don't really have any context for what she's reacting to exactly. But I think it's clear this diorama hasn't just been put here or messed with by cult members. I think what we're seeing this time from Annie is a newly discovered revulsion. We've seen her blindly ignore signs like the note from her mother or the triangle carved into the floor, just like she's been ignoring signs her entire life. But here she's starting to recognize her mother's behavior for what it truly is. She's starting to recognize the signs of sickness and realize how she's been abused. Another big takeaway here is how the shot is positioned to make Annie seem like some giant being looking in on the house. This is a clear allusion to the larger or more spiritually powerful being looking in on the house, the family, their playthings, as the miniature dolls are Annie's. It's the same reason why we have these shots I'd liken someone staring in at a terrarium of someone on the outside looking in. It's also why we see these tilt-shift exterior shots of the Graham household looking like its own miniature dollhouse. Now, as to what's happening in this diorama specifically, we have two options. Either Ellen is sleepwalking and has stumbled into the room, which could be the case, and we do need to prep the audience for Annie's sleepwalking. Or, on the other hand, that Ellen is involving herself to a very creepy level in Annie and Steve's reproduction, potentially up to watching them have sex. We know Ellen was hyper concerned with this, and it fits perfectly with this idea of a mother pressuring her daughter to reproduce. I think in my headcanon it's both, that she was absolutely watching them to make sure they were trying to have another baby, and that maybe when Annie noticed her stood there, they passed it off as part of her worsening condition. Back to Peter doing his best to interrupt Annie's work by asking to use the car, and Annie can barely take her eyes off the Matryoshka miniature exhibit in front of her. This entire exchange is defined by Annie insisting on reflecting Peter's teenage tone, really being a good deal more immature than him by the end of it. It's certainly knowing on Annie's behalf she's using the opportunity of him wanting something to give him a bit of his own medicine. But at the same time, it's another marker for this breakdown of communication within the family. They're both deliberately standoffish here, and you really get the feeling for 100 arguments they've already had in how they're being extremely careful in how they pick their language. And truthfully, this edge of uneasiness is slightly forced on the scene. It feels a great deal more hostile than it is or should be, and this is almost certainly because it's trying to hide from the audience how horrendously unlikely it is that Peter would just take his sister to a party where he's planning on getting high, drunk, laid, and then driving home. So this unspoken chess match is employed here so that we, just like Peter, are trapped in this decision to take Charlie to the party. And there's a scene in between here in the car, but this cut to Peter's face as he's driving there with Charlie's clicks in the background was, for me at least, a much needed laugh break. Probably the only moment you get to chuckle throughout the whole film, and it's only there as a moment of easement before all the terror starts happening. As I've explained, for me the cluck is an aspect, a tick of Pyman's speaking apparatus in his true form. There is a reading though some people provide here where this is something the contained Charlie, the displaced original Charlie, can do when she's trying to call out, essentially. And that is a terrifying thought. I think a lot of people ascribe to it online that the cluck is somehow the original Charlie trying to warn the family, which would make the increased clucking here supposedly make a lot of sense given what's about to happen to her. But this just isn't the case for two pretty strong reasons. Firstly, Ari Aster has said outright this isn't the case. The original Charlie was displaced at birth, and we don't see any elements of her struggling to break free, nor would such a thing be possible. The only time we do ever hear from the original Charlie is when Annie's mouth opens a direct line. The second reason is that if this was the original Charlie, somehow still trapped in the body, I think getting the demon that's been controlling you for the last 13 years to top itself with a lamppost would be a pretty good deal. Certainly not something you'd be trying to warn your family about. I think the increased clucking here truly is to first and foremost drive up the tension, and secondly have the audience side with Peter, or at least understand the decisions he's about to make in leaving her alone. Before all that though, we first see Charlie in the field, having been led there via Pyman sense. She sees an old woman sat in front of a fire that looks a great deal like Ellen. In fact, there's really no one else in the film this could be, as we have an extremely limited cast list. It could be a cult member deliberately messing with Charlie, but really to what end? I think this almost is certainly Ghost Ellen doing some sort of ritual or blessing for Pyman. Maybe just as a way of reassuring Charlie that everything is going to be okay, and that life continues in the afterlife. It also seems like Annie should be in direct line of sight to be able to see the fire, so again, I lean towards this being some kind of apparition only Charlie has seen. If you're paying very close attention, you'll see the first thing she does upon being spotted by Annie is sneak the pigeon head away inside her sleeves. And Annie's recognition to Charlie being outside is relatively brutal. She asks her, "Are you some kind of idiot?" Which, given the context of Charlie being in special needs education, is extremely cutting. She's also manhandling her and again reacts quite childishly in the face of her difficult children. It makes sense Charlie would miss her grandma, but Annie can't help but take it personally, and again just resorts to manhandling her. And this is just more of the tightrope the film walks between providing you the breadcrumbs of the supernatural and convincing you that Annie is the real villain, and that ultimately this is a product of her deteriorating mental state. Next up we have the party, and really up until this point the film has shown a lot of restraint, but from here it goes off the rails very quickly. It starts with this shot of Pyman's sigil carved into the telegraph pole, foreshadowing to the audience the tragedy that's about to occur, but more crucially through whatever form of magic, marking this as the location and method of Charlie's death. And I want to point out that as mad as it may sound after everything we've just discussed and everything that's led up to here, but this is really the first major clue the audience have that something is going on around the family. Truthfully, I think this is the point where I said, hold on a minute, on my first viewing. All of this analysis may seem really obvious when we have the answers, but on first viewing this film is extremely well guarded. And right here it's deciding to show you its hand ever so slightly. Right away the party scene feels different to the rest of the movie. It's loud and bright, there's actual music playing as opposed to just ominous horns. The camera seems to have more energy, no longer moored to a fixed position, and everywhere you'll see lashings of the red we associate with the cult, including ominous red glows designed to allude to the satanic sacrifice at work here. We're building up anxiety and taking away the audience's thinking space so that they don't have time to see what's coming. Now, I've attended my fair share of house parties, and when I first saw this scene, I presumed the girls were enthusiastically chopping up mushrooms or truffles because teenagers do not get this excited for baking when alcohol is available. But as we know, this is a counter full of nuts, a truly unreasonable amount of nuts. But if we look at the two girls preparing it, they are wearing red and turquoise, the colours we associate with the cult and Pyman respectively, and we know it's the cult's plan to have Charlie die here. So ultimately I don't think there's any doubt that these two girls are cult members, and indeed in the original script we actually see one of them directly offering Charlie the cake. And that tracks with what we see from the other cult members, this kind of enthusiastic, almost giddy way they approach the family's deaths. When Peter returns to school following the loss of his sister, not one person will console him or ask him how he is doing. Again, we see laughter and everyone in a great mood. Now, on the subtextual level, I think this is supposed to reflect how life moves on around us and how the world doesn't share in our grief. But in terms of an in-canon explanation, I think it's because none of them view it as a tragedy. We can presume they're brainwashed by their parents and have been told this sacrifice is a good and joyous thing that's going to greatly improve their future. And that giddiness comes across in this nutshell. It's a little too excited. And if we play it side by side with this scene from later on, we'll see them going at the exact same rhythm. This isn't coincidental, it was actually edited side by side in one of the theatrical trailers, so clearly they were very aware of the movie. And given that when Annie is violently headbutting the ceiling she's possessed by Pyman, it's another good bit of evidence for this being the work of the cult. I'm not saying these cult members are directly possessed by Pyman at this point, but under the influence of him, gleeful with his presence. I think that's quite likely.
How does that happen?
It's also worth mentioning that they cut the cake with the same knife they cut the nuts with and hand it pretty much straight to Charlie, so it's almost a certainty that this is part of the plan, as there really couldn't be a more dangerous way of doing this as far as nut damages go. Now, I don't think it's necessarily purposeful here, but we do see the knife and chopping board reflecting and glowing with the light of the room, and at various stages of the cult's plan, we'll see this light, just like we saw as it directed Charlie, highlighting Pyman's supernatural involvement behind the scenes. Again, I think it's quite a low chance it's happening here, but I have seen people suggest it, and while it may seem unlikely right now, as we move through and see more evidence, I think it'll seem likelier and likely. We see Peter try to engage in flirting with Bridget, who, as I think I mentioned, is wearing both red and turquoise. Stood literally between their conversation, we see another blonde-haired extra, keeping very close watch of Peter. Again, we can't say for sure, but he certainly fits the profile of a cult member. And as Peter and Bridget head to the back room to smoke a bowl, we meet two more teenagers that are almost certainly part of the cult too, as they're watching an old black and white clip of beheading by guillotine. Now, as is clear from the events of the film, the cult is extremely fond of beheading. We're going to look at exactly why that is later on, but for now let's just say these kids' enthusiasm is not for black and white cinema, and this is really all we need to signal them as cult members. We see potentially maybe some black Didney of Crete mixed in with Peter's green. This is a popular one people like to point out, but truthfully it could just be a burnt bit of plant material left in the pipe. Whatever the case, we know Peter has been spiked with Dittany of Crete via his weed in this exact manner, so it's really just splitting hairs as to if he does here in this scene or not. Judging by the look on this guy's face though, I'd say he's relatively eager to see Pete blaze up. Bridget seems unhappy about how Charlie has drawn her, and this is actually played for laughs, but ultimately if we're trying to understand Bridget's mental state, she likely feels a bit nonplussed that a weird kid her parents and all their friends are obsessed with is drawing mocking images of her. If this is their icon, some supernatural deity everyone around you is worshipping, then seeing them draw you in a manner you deem as retarded may tick you off enough that you try to bring it up and find an explanation. And that might seem like reaching to some, but when we stop to consider the background narrative here, that is essentially what's happening. And from there we know what happens next. Charlie comes in with the allergic reaction to the nuts, and Peter springs into action. There is one key piece of dialogue here, however, which is Charlie telling Peter that she thinks her throat is getting bigger. As Peter is carrying Charlie out of the house, we see several people potentially observing this. We can't say for certain, as they're just background extras, but it certainly seems on brand for the cult to be observing their plan is unfolding correctly. And it's easy to miss because the scene is so gripping, but listen to the demented rising sound, very similar to the clopping hooves and skittering insect sounds of Pyman's approach during the opening scene. It's that cloven or camel hoof sound at double speed, way more frenetic as the scene builds towards this shattering moment where everything stops. And when it's paired with the devilish glow of the tail lights moving away from the screen, it really calls to mind some Mothman-esque demon chittering through the night. We'll see this glow from the tail lights used behind Peter too to signal this encroaching shadow of satanic power circling around the planet. Now, despite being perhaps the most famous scene in the movie, there isn't a whole lot going on here besides amazing performances by Alex Wolff and Billy Shapiro. It's tense, it's toe-curling, and it's tragic. This isn't the only time the film trusts Alex Wolff's face to carry a huge moment all on its own, and I think he pulls it off every time. I've seen a few people be quite critical of his acting abilities, but I think he's absolutely phenomenal. There are a couple of key questions raised in this scene that do need answering though. Firstly, how is it possible that the cult can plan Charlie's elaborate death with Agent 47 levels of premonition and accuracy? And that's a fair point. Certainly how it's played in the film makes it seem at first like a freak accident, but as we know, it's anything but. The answer comes through Pyman's law, both in the film and in occultism in general. In the film we see Annie leafing through one of Ellen's books that has information on Pyman, and we do get glimpses that he's able to offer hidden secret knowledge, among many other cut-up details. And all of this page, from what I can tell, is different passages from existing texts and grimoires regarding Pyman, from E.A. Patton's Works of Darkness to Aleister Crowley's version of The Lesser Key of Solomon. And all of them agree on this ability Pyman has to bestow hidden or secret knowledge. Really any knowledge the Conjurer asks of him, be it of the earth, of the winds, he can tell you. This began as essentially him teaching a very advanced knowledge of science, described as the earth, the winds and the waters, but in later grimoires would be made more fantastical with the assertion that he would truthfully respond to any question asked of him, which ultimately becomes him having the answers to all hidden things. Now he has other powers. Generally this knowledge comes with riches too, something we also see alluded to in Hereditary, and a few other weird and wonderful eccentricities that aren't always agreed upon. But in practicality, this function of Pyman to know all and bestow knowledge has led to his longevity. It's the reason he's quite a well-known lord of the underworld, because people that have actually practiced magic have generally been seeking answers and forbidden knowledge, and he is absolutely the one to provide them that, within demonic law. But answers to the mysteries of life don't really help you plan the perfect murder. Luckily, we do see Pyman use some pretty specific abilities during the film that can help us provide us with answers here. Those answers can be found in Abremelin, or the Book of Abremelin, or the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abremelin the Mage, a set of manuscripts first dated to the early 1600s, but claiming to have been written several centuries earlier, as so often is the case with occult texts. Despite obvious questions about its authenticity, the text is still undeniably one of our earliest sources on this pseudo-Christian occult interpretation of Pyman. And in it we see a much more varied explanation of Pyman's power set, most of which matches up to what we see in the film. We've got flight, acquiring and dismissing servant spirits, making spirits appear, creating visions, making all kinds of things, and most crucially, knowledge of past and future events. That is ultimately how they are able to plan Charlie's death so perfectly. The presence of Pyman's sigil indicates his magic is at work here, so we can imagine he's broadly orchestrating events. The roadkill that makes Peter swerve is likely placed there by the cult after receiving some kind of indication from Pyman. Really, everything that is happening to the family is pre-orchestrated, predetermined. This is just a linchpin moment in that plan, where it becomes obvious for a moment that that is what's happening. The other major question people usually have here is there any truth or real-world influence relating to Charlie's accident? And Ari Aster has remained tight-lipped on this. There's never been any confirmation that it was, but it does bear remarkable similarities to a tragic accident that took place in 2004. Two friends in their early 20s, John Hutcherson and Francis Boehm, were making their way home after a boozy night out partying. Hutcherson was behind the wheel, and Boehm, suffering from the bumps and whines of the road, was vomiting out of the passenger window. According to later testimony, the intoxicated Hutcherson had swerved to avoid an oncoming car, decapitating Boehm as he grazed a telephone pole at the side of the road. From there, he drove a further 12 miles to his home, falling asleep in bed in blood-stained clothing, while the headless body of his friend sat in the passenger seat of the car, only being discovered by a neighbour in the morning. When authorities questioned Hutcherson, he seemed to still be suffering from the effects of the night before, unable to remember what had happened clearly due to alcohol, and unable to process it due to shock. And we see something very familiar following the accident in the film, where Charlie's body is only discovered upon Annie leaving in the morning, and Peter is still laying in bed, unable to process what's just happened. Now again, no link has ever been confirmed between the movie and this incident, but I think most people would agree that it's extremely similar to what we see in Hereditary. And one thing we can say for certain is that this image of a decapitated Charlie was Ari Aster's first mental concept image for the film. So there is the possibility that this really was his starting inspiration. There's a couple more visual Easter eggs here. We have the image of Charlie's severed head, which I absolutely can't show you, but is crawling with ants. Again, we have that theme of death and decay and pestilence and insects eating away at the dead that's followed Pyman from the opening shot. And far more subtle than that, as we see Annie fall to her knees in horror upon finding out about Charlie, you'll see she takes this very low, almost downward dog-like position that we'll also see her dead body in right at the end of the film in the treehouse. I probably can't show you that either, but the meaning is pretty straightforward. If she's kneeling at the end out of a post-possession reverence, she's seen the eternal truth and now bows to Pyman, then here she's been brought to her knees. She's been forced to submit by the malicious actions of the cult. They need her mentally weak and suggestive, not just so she'll act as they want her to, but also to better facilitate possession when the time comes. And really, this face-to-the-floor submissive position is a signal that it's worked and the plan's a go. This montage of scenes following the accident is accompanied by Toni Collette's animal-like howls of grief for which she was not even nominated for an Oscar, and it's only really when we get to the funeral that we see them match up with what we're seeing on screen. It's a phenomenally low-tech device for quickly presenting the audience with this idea of sustained grief over a period of time that we're seeing condensed. The idea that Annie has been in this perpetual and unchanging period of complete shock from accident to funeral. And as the turquoise coffin gets lowered into the ground, the camera keeps it central in frame, moving down below into the earth, reminding us not only of the practicalities of death, but also the idea of hell lurking below. Now, cards on the table, I hate this device where the camera moves across set boundaries, breaking the fourth wall essentially. There isn't a cross-section of graveyard cut away within the reality of the movie, and so normally this would really offend me visually. A prime offender is the movie Green Room, where the camera just moves across the top of the set, showing us the room partitions. I think Fargo did it. It was quite a popular technique 5 years ago, so I'm sure there's hundreds of examples available. And anytime I see anything close to this on screen, it just makes me want to tune out. And here in Hereditary will perhaps be the worst example of it, but as with everything Hereditary does, it's the exception that proves the rule. This is actually perhaps the clearest signal we get to the events of the film being some dollhouse or terrarium-like exhibit for a higher level of supernatural being, and the lens of the film, the frame, however you want to describe it, being at least at times the point of view of whatever that being is, presumably Pyman, that's watching. I think a terrarium is the best example for trying to understand it visually, and here we're seeing from the edge of the glass. It's not meant to be literally that, the characters aren't in a physical glass dome, but the cross-section, the downward moving camera, it's all meant to allude to a terrarium or some other dollhouse-like structure in which the family are just playthings, just exhibits. Immediately following the burial, we see this strange warped reflection in the gold glass of the Graham's reception room. We have a similar thing happening to the workshop where it's using the muffled voices to allude to this sort of in-between space of living and dead. And we're actually seeing from the point of view of this figure, which is absolutely Peter, but we see him look up suddenly and it's relatively obscured by the noise of the room, but we do hear him make a definite click, or clucking noise rather. So while it's Peter's outline, maybe in these brief moments of extreme grief, Paimon manages to force his way inside of Peter momentarily. I think we may have a hint of it happening as we're seeing Annie break down in the bedroom too. Now, following the wake, we get a chopped up selection of silent scenes demonstrating the family's grief. A couple of things of note here. Firstly, that this is designed to represent the blinkered and hazy mind following severe trauma. And secondly, that all the family members are isolated from one another, rather than consoling and confiding in one another as you might expect a healthier family to do at a time of trauma. Annie even goes out of her way to make sure she is apart from the family, clearly blaming Peter for what happened. This is of course ultimately what the cult wants, seeking to cause division and mentally weakening them to the point of complete erosion of the family unit. And really that's the whole point of this montage, to create distance between Annie and her family, particularly Annie and Peter, culminating in this moment where she's hiding in the car and sees him mentally preparing himself to enter the house. Clearly should be able to see and understand his discomfort and would want to care for him and fix the situation. But instead she ignores him and drives off, signaling this full breakdown of their relationship. There's a couple of other things worth picking up on during this montage. We have more satanic graffiti, this time in the form of Zazas, and while it's unclear on screen, I think in this scenario we're supposed to assume that it's a bit too well hidden for Steve to see it, but if he did see it, he almost certainly just puts it down to his wife's deteriorating mental state, something that at this point he's afraid to address directly. As to what Zazas means, it comes from the Kabbalistic mantra Zazas Zazas Nata Satana Zazas Zazas Nata Satan Zazas Zazas Nata Sat. As to what Zazas means, it comes from the Kabbalistic mantra Zazas Zazas Nata Satanada Zazas. The Hebrew word Zaza the Kabbalah is using here means bursting with light, but when it appears in the Bible the word means belonging to all. In the Kabbalah this mantra belongs to Koronazon, a demonic entity, and the phrase is sometimes referred to as the sacred key of Koronazon. It's generally related to calling forth this demonic entity, as all the writing on the walls is in some way, and as with much of the Kabbalah, it was really brought back into popularity through the work of renowned occultist Aleister Crowley. I don't want to get too bogged down in Crowley lore, but one thing you should know is that he wasn't just into magic as we traditionally know it. He was pioneering his own brand of specifically sex magic, something he would later brand with the different spelling of M-A-G-I-C-K, to provide it more historical legitimacy and separate it from perceptions of things like stage magic. Now, one thing that's great about creating your own school of magic is that you get to make up all the rules. So it's telling then that Crowley decided as part of his initiation, as part of his rites of ascension, his leveling up into this new school of magic, that he needed to take a ritualistic gay sex holiday to Northern Africa. He was accompanied by his friend, another occultist, and they set off to Algiers to have increasingly weird sex in various places Crowley deemed magically important, and do as much research into the demonic as they possibly could. As the story goes, one night they journeyed out into the desert and performed a ritual to summon what they described as the demonic inhabitant of the abyss. Upon summoning the demon, it uttered the phrase Zazas Zazas Nata Sanada Zazas, followed by a further quote that I'll put up on screen. As it turned out, the demon in question was Koronazon. What follows in the story is a pretty terrifying battle between the demon and Crowley's friend/manservant, and ultimately the two men describing themselves as being forever changed by the experience. It's often used now as a phrase to call the demon forth, but in every original use I could find, it seems to be something this specific demon says once it has been called forth. The phrase Zaza is also a popular prompt on Ouija boards, first originating as a way of checking if you had an active demon or ghost, with Z and A being at opposing ends of the board. Although it's unclear if this was at first influenced by Crowley's Zazas, as Ouija boards were soaring into popularity at roughly the same time. As the montage continues, we see Steve discovering Charlie's drawings, and again we get this foreshadowing of the crowned pigeon, the crown or some form of crown-like object being another element we see congruently in almost every depiction of Paimon. We also see Annie in the treehouse using this bright red, ominous-looking space heater. If you remember right back to the beginning, I mentioned this is alluding to this space being a metaphorical stand-in for hell, specifically the city of Pandemonium, and this is just visual allusion to that. If you listen closely in Peter's room as he sees the red light turn on, you can hear Paimon's flylight buzzing again. And following that, we get a quick but crucial scene of Peter and his friends getting high under the bleachers, and Peter seemingly having a very bad reaction. And we know this is due to the dittany of Crete he's getting spiked with, and Brendan's reaction to this is extremely telling. It's a little bit disguised amidst the foliage, but he reassures Peter that it's just weed, which signals him as the person providing it to Peter, and is a pretty odd thing to say if that's really what it is. There would be no reason to doubt the legitimacy of what it is or point that out. If you're wondering why they can smoke it and not worry about the effects it's having on Peter, this is very likely because, unlike Peter, Paimon isn't currently trying to get inside them. Now, as Peter's having this anxiety attack / coughing fit of sorts, we hear him say, "I think my throat is getting bigger," directly mirroring what Charlie said during her allergic reaction. And if you were to make that link upon first viewing, firstly, well done, but secondly, you would likely assume Peter is having an anxiety attack and hypochondriacally imagining Charlie's symptoms. You probably wouldn't guess that Paimon is using this moment to try and cram himself down Peter's throat like he's goddamned Harvey Weinstein, but that's exactly what's happening. Now, Charlie was actually having an allergic reaction, but we can assume, given Peter's repeating of it here, that some part of her throat getting bigger was Paimon's soul trying to force its way out. And here when Peter says it, it's trying to force its way in. And if you think I've just gone full-blown lunatic, there is a visual confirmation of this in the form of a blue lens flare that literally appears over Peter as this is happening. As I've already touched on, and will explain to you in about 7 minutes, that is absolutely indicative of Paimon's presence here. We also hear Peter talking in quite a childlike, pleading tone and asking for his hand to be held. We'll hear him do this voice later on during the seance and when Annie is banging her head against the attic door and he's pleading with her to stop. We see in these moments exactly what Peter is lacking, the loving attention of a mother that shows care for him. And that all brings us up to Joan and her meeting with Annie in the car park. Joan is perhaps the sneakiest character I've ever seen on screen. Everything she does is an attempt to misdirect both Annie and the audience, and she's very good at it. And I think the reason she's such a successful tool for the movie's deception is that, like Annie, like Peter, the audience are being starved of any kind of emotional connectivity, or warmth, or nurture, and we accept Joan and don't see her as a threat because of that. She's extremely touchy and sensitive and so connected with her feelings that it stands in bold contrast to the extremely cold and distant environment we've been in up until now. I also think that's what makes her switch into an enemy so horrifying. It's the one person we've been relying on to provide any kind of caring influence. By the time we've realised everything isn't right, she's already screaming occult commands at Peter from across the street. Hereditary isn't a horror film that relies on jump scares. It has a lot of these mental lurch moments where what you thought is completely flipped, kind of psychological jump scares. So the whole time she's on screen, the film is essentially doing its best to show you all the hints it can get away with while leaving you completely in the dark. Just like the beheading clip at the party, the film is playing with the audience and it does it very well. So let's look at this scene in detail and unpack exactly what's going on. Firstly, we see Annie make the decision to not enter the grief support group, presumably a trap that has been laid for her. Thinking on her feet, Joan sees Annie failing to take the cult's bait and, in her own words, chases her down. She's dressed in the same red we see other cult members, our other key colour blue, and as with so much of the cult's aesthetic, we see these geometric patterns on her clothing, alluding to signs and symbols related to esotericism. Even the car she's in front of shares this same red of the cult, and pays special attention to her body language the whole time she's around Annie. She grabs at her, repositions her, holds her in place, does whatever she can do to keep Annie focused where she wants her to be. Now this is sometimes done to prevent Annie from seeing things that will cause her to figure out the trick being played, but for the most part this seems to be some affectation, some occult Jedi mind trick designed to make Annie believe her. Really, we're watching her put Annie under her spell, and to a lesser extent she's putting us under that same spell. And that's very interesting because both critics and the director have pointed out that the whole film functions like a ritual or spell on the audience, and here we get to see a very clear microcosm of that. Now, in this scene, because there's the barrier of the car door, it's not quite as obvious, but watch how much Joan is grabbing onto that car door, touching at Annie through the window. She's like a pickup artist trying to establish physical contact, trying to accelerate Annie's process of trusting her, and keeping her focused on the magical misdirection coming from her mouth. I also think there's something very dramatic and reverent to her body language, something that old witchy ladies, old church-going aunties have, and while it does work as good surface camouflage for seeing her character as this old friendly lady, we do know on second viewing that this is likely the high satanic priestess in her kind of bubbling to the surface. Joan asks Annie if she isn't coming in, and we see Annie a little bit shocked by how over-familiar this woman is being. Joan realises she may have put Annie off and does her best to backtrack and reassure her. Now, it's not 100% clear as to the timeline, but it seems like Joan messes her backstory up. She claims to have lost her son and grandson 4 months ago, and she says she's been coming to these meetings for a couple of months. Right at the start, she tells Annie that she recognises her from a few months ago, and almost certainly a few is more than a couple.
How long
Even
does
the
that
story
take?
of the deceased son and grandson, which we find out is in all likelihood entirely fake, she seems to put together in the moment, adding in details like the grandson dying after her initial explanation, and only telling the story when it's clearly necessary to stop Annie from driving away. She manipulates Annie's loneliness and grief into a further meeting with her, and with that, the cult's plan is fully in motion. And quick shout out again to Toni Collette's acting here, perfectly selling this moment of the first time she puts words to her tragedy and says out loud what's happened to Charlie. And pay close attention to how she phrases it, because it's not just the fact that she's saying it that shocks her, it's how she phrases it. She does not say, my daughter died in a terrible accident, or like Joan says, her son and grandson drowned. Annie doesn't say, my daughter died in a car accident, or my daughter was decapitated. She says very plainly, my daughter was killed. And killed could imply killed by a telephone post to the head, but it could also imply that she believes Charlie was killed by Peter. And I think that's why we get this look of complete shock. She's admitted to herself at least that she does blame him. Following that, we see a much more callous demeanour towards Peter, and the rejection of her husband as he clearly doesn't feel the same way as her. When Annie returns home, we see that she's again lied to Steve about where she's been, again using the movies as an excuse. She immediately greets him with, I'm going to bed, and clearly is uncomfortable being around him. It's interesting that we'll see Annie flip from this rejection of her family to trying to save them and seemingly acting completely out of loving interest towards them. But I think because the flip in her feelings towards them is so extreme, that we can assume within the lore of the movie it's first driven by the cult, Paimon weakening her mental state, doing what they can to cause division, and then reverted by her ultimate realization that something very dangerous is happening and that she's been tricked and needs to try to undo it. But on a subtextual level, and as part of the initial fake out of this all being in Annie's head, this is very much supposed to be emblematic of mental illness. It's difficult not to draw parallels with dissociative identity disorder or schizophrenia, as Annie oscillates between these two extremes of loving mother and eventual killer. But it doesn't have to be so pathological. It can, again, simply be this woman who feels like her life isn't her own, who is building resentment towards the children she was never sure she wanted, and subsequently what we're seeing here is the flux between the children and family she knows she loves and the overwhelming anger and frustration and fear she feels now she's trapped in a life she didn't design. Design being the operative word here, as we see Annie designing small worlds, simulacra, for her situation, which ultimately she feels a measure
If you
of control.
speedrun Curry, do you
Annie
get,
doesn't
like,
stay away from Joan for very long. We
get all
have
the
a couple of
collectibles?
brief intermediary scenes. Firstly, this scene with Peter in the bedroom, staring at the demonic glow of the space eaters in the treehouse. And this shot is amazing, with the devilish glow reflected back in Peter's eyes. Given the ending, this
dress for the
foreshadowing
weather.
would be intelligent enough just with that. But there's a bit more to it than that. It's this demonic influence, Paimon's malignancy and the manipulations of the cult that have driven this wedge in between the family, that orchestrated Charlie's death and Annie and Peter's opposition. And as we're watching him lay there staring at the treehouse, it's obvious he's feeling one thing: resentment to the mother that doesn't show him love and blames him for something outside of his control, just as she was treated by Ellen. So we're watching this resentment build in his eyes, and this demonic glow becomes not just foreshadow, but a literal explanation and visual identifier of where this resentment is coming from. Paimon, pandemonium. It's an extremely elegant way of demonstrating this with a simple visual metaphor. And again, as we see everywhere here, demonic glowing eyes are pretty overdone, but Hereditary finds a way to make it refreshing and intelligent. Just as with Annie seeing Ellen in the attic, we can find something very relatable in Peter staring at clothes in the corner of the room, trying to convince himself he didn't hear Charlie's clicking. I'm sure we've all done this before, and again, it's a very natural thing to happen following a tragedy, certainly after losing a close family member.
speedrunning.
And while we can
Curry is
consider
one of
that
the
as
achievements.
subtext, what's truly amazing here is that the film takes those recognizable markers of trauma and grief, like seeing shapes in the corner of your room, or thinking you heard or saw someone you lost recently, and it uses them as actual indicators of supernatural activity. It's weaponizing our own trauma against us and saying, all those weird little thoughts you had during your darkest hour, they were all true. I think when combined with this flat, realist aesthetic, stellar acting, and genius-level writing, it's that closeness to real-world loss that makes the horror here seem so personal. Interspersed between Peter and the next scene is this quick stationary shot of the Graham's letterbox, or mail slab, if you're American at home. And I'm pointing out the difference because I don't know if in America this practice is normal or not, but here it is quite standard to have different people delivering singular flyers after the government-employed postal service has done the rounds. So when I first saw this, it really slipped over my head that it would be a cult member delivering this, but that is most certainly the case. This is another tool to get Annie to embrace occultism and trick her into summoning Paimon and allowing the latter stages of the cult's plan to go ahead. It's important to note though that Annie does not take the bait, and the cult take a separate route to having Annie conduct her own seance. So while it may feel as though the cult have this perfect and infallible plan that's been meticulously thought out, the truth is more that their influence and surrounding of the family is so complete that whatever route the family takes, they'll end up with the same outcome, in line with the themes of the tragedy of fate and predestination. And following that, we get a crucial scene with Annie, perhaps the Easter egg that's become most well known, her knocking over of the paint pot without touching it. And if you did miss it on the first watch, then don't worry, it's very subtly done. But when you watch Annie's hand, she doesn't come anywhere close to the paint. I think by now, I probably don't have to say it, but it's especially important here. The paint that Annie spills, the note next to her that distracts her, Joan's phone number, they're all marked with the same turquoise blue that we associate with pine. This may be the moment the film really shows its hand and lets you know how important this colour coding is. In fact, if we look at what paints Annie has laid out, we see the turquoise I've mentioned, the gold we associate with Ellen, and the orange colour we associate with Charlie and Pyman in the previous earthly form. And we can safely presume that the bottle falling over on its own, directly onto Joan's note, is due to Pyman's magic trying to lead Annie toward a certain outcome. Essentially doing what it needs to ensure the right versions of the future, where the cult's plan successfully comes to be. And truthfully, that's why this scene is so crucial, is because here we see all of our theories be proven right. Really, it functions like a key to a puzzle. It's okay to say all of this stuff, but we have to be able to prove it. And right here is where we can do a lot of that. Now, right before the bottle falls over, we see a wisp of light. Not the pulse, like when we're seeing Charlie and Peter be directed, but more like the wisp we see enter Peter. We see it float down past the window just before the bottle tips over. The turquoise bottle that pushes Annie towards making contact with Joan. And as I may have mentioned, this light we see that we're assuming to be Pyman shares this kind of light blue hue. While it may seem obvious now, really this scene is the linking factor that demonstrates it all and links the subtext with what's clearly happening. We see things being directly affected by magic, even if it's quite well hidden from the audience's view, when we see this purposefully inserted blue light move and clearly indicate that it's doing it. And other than when we see that wisp enter Peter, this is perhaps the most obvious it will be that this light blue to turquoise light Pyman is inflicting it. And at many major points during the cult's plan, some of which I've covered already, we'll see blue lights, blue lens flare, or purposeful roving wisp-like spotlights that are another example of the same thing, just more subtly done. And we could leave it there and pretty much have the same meaning, but there's likely a specific reason as to why this weird light reflection style effect is being used, and again this scene works as a key for it. We see this wisp right next to Annie in frame. It's behind her, sure, we have that soft jump scare thing, but on screen it's right next to her. Just like the blueprints are next to Peter's room or behind Ellen when she appears in the game. This closeness is used to suggest a synergy, a mirroring, a proximity, just like we see with the bedroom diorama in the actual bedroom, or the chopping in the headlamp, or Peter's face filling the screen at precise and key moments. This relation is 100% intentional, and here where the wisp sits over Annie's shoulder, we see her using her magnifying glasses. Now, as before, we see that she's only got one of the lenses deployed. As I mentioned, she's not fully blind to things like Peter is. She is watching, she is paying attention, but her closeness, her magnification, they prevent her from being able to see the big picture. But far more crucially than that is this lens, whether it's Annie's magnifiers or Peter's telescope or even the lens of the camera, that we need to be focused on, because it's here that we find the secret to what this light is, which is to say, it's the reflection of the cosmic or spiritual lens of whatever being is watching over the family. Like Annie looming large over her dioramas, it's the viewfinder of whoever or whatever, almost certainly Pyman, being is treating the Grahams household like their own little dollhouse. We even see movement very reminiscent of light reflecting off a tilting lens as Pyman is trying to attract Charlie's attention to her grandma, which I think really makes sense when we view next to Annie tilting the lens. It's why we have so many shots of the house in tilt shift, why we see the camera moving below ground, why we see Annie doing this, why we see miniatures inside of miniatures. It's all alluding to this larger being that's watching the family and controlling events. As I covered earlier, almost certainly Pyman, but if your headcanon is that it's Lucifer, whoever you want it to be, it doesn't really make a difference. The point is that it's the reflected lens of whatever being is watching, and really, as far as I'm concerned, there's no being mentioned directly other than Pyman that it could be, given what the film presents us with. If you've ever seen Carl Sagan explain Flatland, then I kind of think of it like that. In Flatland, a 2D world would perceive a 3D object very differently to how we would, seeing only two-dimensional slices of a strange, unknown object. Now, Mr. Sagan uses this to make an extrapolation about the fourth dimension, but for us, just think of the 2D world as the non-spiritual realm, and Pyman as a spiritual observer, the 3D object that passes through. In the non-spiritual realm, they can only really perceive slices or reflections of him, this light, essentially. And even then, it takes a good amount of being mentally or psychically broken down and fed bits of Dittany of Crete to be able to see it. A lot of people have treated this lens theory with a pinch of salt, but I actually think it's cut and dry when you look at all the evidence together. And just like that, we're back to Joan. Even on the street outside her apartment, we see the path Annie is taking is lined with turquoise street signs and so on. I don't know how normal this is for Utah or America in general, but this film pays such close attention to its color coding that really nothing would surprise me at this point. Either way, we see her following this turquoise stained note to Joan's house, which makes no sense beyond the subtextual meaning of the color, as it just has a phone number. Now, I'm not sure what the deal is with this mirror. It's put there very purposefully. We see the camera hold on it for a second or two. This will happen again in reverse later on. And at no point where Annie walks past it do we see her reflection. Nor do we see Joan elsewhere on screen while Joan is being reflected. This is a very purposeful decision, very purposeful camera movements, and very purposeful blocking of the shot by Tony Collette. Now, first and foremost, this is not Annie being in some transient spiritual place where she doesn't cast a reflection. We can say that with certainty because just moments after the first mirror shot, we'll see her reflection in one of the framed photographs on Joan's wall. So the answer is not Annie is possessed, Annie is a vampire or anything like that. One thing of note though is that mirrors and the occult go hand in hand. We'll even see Pyman mess with Peter through his reflection. And I do think there's a little bit of a nod towards the idea that mirrors, reflections, can be used to see and commune with spirits. But truthfully, I don't think Annie isn't casting a reflection or having her reflection messed with by Pyman. I think it's simply a cleverly placed mirror and a very well structured shot, and by keeping Annie in frame but not reflected, and Joan out of shot but reflected in the mirror, we once again get this impression of her looking in through a window at Annie, just like the cult are doing, just like she did when she first introduced herself. This feeling that Annie is being observed, which she is certainly, there's a camera right outside Joan's apartment. And that it's happening with a mirror shouldn't be lost on us because, again, they do have this link with the spiritual. So truly, I think this is a visual metaphor for how Annie is being observed and manipulated by the cult, both directly from right outside her house through her window, and more supernaturally from the spiritual plane we see associated with reflections, and the film has alluded to multiple times. Let's rewind a couple of seconds and have a look at Joni's doormat, and if you're wondering why I'm calling her Joni now, this is why. She's clearly introduced herself as Joan to Annie, but to her friends she's Joni. And as we come to find out, this doormat has absolutely been made by Ellen. We see similar mats made for Annie and her brother later on, and in this scene, Annie even mentions to Joni that her mother used to embroider ones just like that. Joan plays this off expertly, saying, "Did she really? Isn't that funny?" This is a great example of Joan being a high-level manipulator because she's not just playing it off as if it's nothing, she's playing it off in a way where she encourages Annie to accept coincidences. She's essentially saying, "Isn't life funny? What an odd coincidence, what a small world." And given that she knows Annie is going to be seeing and hopefully ignoring a lot of clues, that's what she's really pulling towards here, keeping Annie away from noticing the truth. Now, the welcome mat, as they call it, seems absolutely not fit for purpose. It looks a lot more like a embroidered prayer pillow that's going to be destroyed just by people stepping on it, let alone wiping their feet. So we shouldn't assume that that's its primary function. And just as with Annie and her brother, we see some symbolism on the pillow that suggests more is going on. Here specifically, we see geometric outlining. This is part of the course with Joan's decor, her clothing, and all the other places I've already pointed out. This idea of sacred geometry being important in both spiritualism and the occult. More specific to here though, we've got 6 pointed stars, more commonly known as hexagrams. I think most people traditionally associate them with Judaism, but truthfully, they pop up in Buddhism, Christianity, Islam. As I mentioned near the beginning with the pentagram stars, they are one of the earliest graphic symbols, so there's a long and storied history there. And alongside its use in religion, it's prevalent in occult and ceremonial magic. Truthfully, to give you a full rundown of the hexagram would likely take at least 4 hours, and it's ultimately about relevant. So to give you an extremely abridged version, the first understanding of the symbol would be a representation of the 7 so-called old planets recognized by early astrologers. Sometimes it represents the different elements, sometimes the 2 overlapping triangles just represent fire and water, and sometimes it's used as a sign for quintessence, the supposed fifth element. But most crucially, most relevant to us here, and to its use in general, the hexagram is viewed as a talisman for conjuring spirits and the various forces of occult magic. And sometimes it's called the Seal of Saturn, but most commonly it's referred to as the Seal of Solomon. Solomon being this father figure of occult magic that I've mentioned many times already, most notably the Grimoire, the Lesser Key of Solomon, where we get all this crucial information regarding time. The text itself is littered with hexagrams, and if you search up occult symbolism, it's likely to be one of the main results. In opposition to the hexagrams, we see this symbol. Now this isn't particularly clear, but I think this is a combination of two symbols. It looks to be like an alchemical flask or a potion bottle with an all-seeing eye on it, combined with this curvy outlining on the bottom that's reminiscent of the modified sigil of Paimon used throughout the movie. We certainly see the same three circles there, alluding to the three heads of Ellen, Charlie and Annie. And there is another part to the design that I think is a somewhat unfinished motif in the film. We see leaves like this on Ellen's stationery, we see this sort of floral leafy wallpaper at the party. There's a fair few times we'll see this kind of floral nature imagery. I think it's largely a combination of these riches Paimon is supposedly offering and the pagan or occult belief of sacrifice improving harvest. We're in Utah, we don't see it, but we can presume there's a lot of farming going on, and this could likely be one route the cult may see riches. The way I see this as being underdeveloped or unfinished is that this imagery never really goes anywhere in the film, it's extremely background, and ultimately I think these themes are far better explored within Midsommar. And as I mentioned, I'm definitely going to do kind of a comparison complete guide video for that and the original Wicker Man, another of my all-time favourite horror movies, so I'll leave anything I've got to say here for that video. Following their conversation about the welcome mats, we cut straight into Annie sharing the details of Charlie's death with Joan. There's a couple of things of note here. First, we have Annie's mention of there being tar-like black blood around the neck. We don't need to go into the real-world practicalities here. I think we could say, whatever the case, this is softly alluding to there being something demonic about the body. Next, we'll see Annie mention that the head was not there, and we get this sudden sort of snapping glance from Joan, which on first viewing is supposed to seem as though she's just disgusted by the details, but given that we know Charlie's head is of prime importance for the cult's invocation of Paimon, it's actually much more likely that this is Joan realizing they need to find that head ASAP. Keep following Joan's eyes and you'll see her watching Annie drink the tea very closely, making sure she's ingesting the dittany of Crete. And we know the tea has dittany of Crete in it because we see Annie pull some from her lips after drinking it. This is really the clearest view we get of the herb in the whole movie, and it's likely the first time the cult has been able to get Annie to ingest it. From here we'll see her suggestibility increase and her mental stability rapidly deteriorate as the herb weakens her defenses and ultimately facilitates her possession by Paimon. Wanting to distract from the tea, Joan moves the conversation on to Peter, the member of the family she's interested in far above the rest. It's here that we get Annie's admission that she sleepwalks, and this immediately rings alarm bells in the viewer's head. It's such well-crafted misdirection that lets you think you're solving the puzzle while hiding the real trick right in front of you. Of course, the viewer will relate Annie's sleepwalking to Ellen, and more specifically Ellen's DID. By this point in the film, there's a very good chance you're viewing Annie as a potential enemy, despite her being the main character. And when she expands on what her sleepwalking entails, there's really no wonder. Even when we hear her admit it as an unwitting victim, it's a difficult thing for the audience to forgive a mother dousing herself and her children with paint thinner and holding up a lit match. We're likely to be skeptical that she has their best interests at heart, and Toni Collette plays this so down the line, so on the knife edge between legitimate victim and mentally ill perpetrator, convinced of her own innocence, that it's almost impossible to tell on first viewing. And the film gives us a lot of subtle clues that Annie is lying, or at least is used to lying about it. When she begins telling Joan the story, she says, "I sleepwalk, I haven't done it in years, but a couple of years ago," and then proceeds to tell the story. It seems right from the off that she's fudging details and maybe trying to make it more palatable. Despite this, it's clear to the audience and her that she's lost the trust of her children, and when she uses phrases like "it was impossible to convince them," it's tacitly building your image of Annie as a person who wasn't believed at the time, who wasn't believed by her closest family members, who presumably know her better than anyone. And that positions us against Annie, not believing her just like everyone else. And when we really think about that, how awful this situation truly is, where she isn't in control and her loved ones view her as the threat, disbelieving her honest denials, that's pretty damn heartbreaking. Annie's been put through this her entire life, but we and her family refuse to trust her because of it. We see this idea of abuse creating the abuser and a mentally ill person who is perhaps feared by their loved ones. And although we may feel sympathetic for Annie, we can only see her behaviour for what it is, a direct threat to her children's lives. While she was almost certainly trying to subconsciously eliminate them from the board, she was doing this in a deeply subconscious effort to save them from the horror that on some hidden level she knows is coming. We'll see this confirmed later on when she does the same thing again and we hear her tell Peter that she's trying to save him. It's Annie's subconscious bubbling up to the surface to try and save her son the only way she can, by killing him before Paimon takes hold. And Annie closes this scene out with the again quite juvenile, teenage-style delivery of "and there's nothing I can say and nothing I can do because it happened while I was asleep." And there's a clever bit of double meaning here. Really, this line perfectly sums up Annie's entire narrative. There is nothing she can say to stop it. There's nothing she can do to fix it. It's all already happened while she's been asleep. That is to say, there's nothing she can do to stop what's going to happen to her family because she's been asleep to the machinations of the cult her entire life. It's too late and the plan is already in motion. This is the sacrifice from the sacrificial lamb's perspective, and the lamb may have begun to subconsciously understand what's happening, but it's far too late. And at the end of the day, it is just a lamb, unable to prevent the sacrifice even if it wanted to. Really, you're supposed to feel momentary hatred for Annie here, but knowing what Annie is ultimately victim to during the film, this may be the bleakest window into her life the movie gives us. And when we consider what this is alluding to in terms of mental illness beyond that, it becomes even bleaker. There is something to be said for Annie's choice of accelerant here too. This could have easily been gasoline. Well, actually, let's start at the start. She could have been holding a gun to their heads. But there's a historical and intertextual importance to this being fire. We've got cleansing fire, we've got hellfire, we've got people setting themselves on fire in protest, we've got mothers doing this to their kids, we've got the idea of feminine sacrifice being tied to being set on fire, and all linked in with the history of witchcraft and supposedly mad or different or possessed women being burned at the stake. And that is crucially important and almost certainly the subtextual intention here, given we'll discuss a very similar thing with beheading towards the end. But why paint thinner? The easy answer is that it's on brand for Annie, and it makes sense that she would have it to hand. But I think the best answer is that if Annie's miniatures and dioramas, the things she uses the paint on, represent this Matryoshka simulacra of the supernatural intentions surrounding them, then the paint thinner can be seen as representing a way to undo that, a way to erase the meticulous plans laid out for them. And if you want to be even more direct than that, you can see this like Peter's covered telescope and Charlie's constellation pajamas in the next scene. Annie has literally just followed a paint-covered note to Joan's house, and now for the first time she's telling the audience she tried to commit infanticide by paint thinner. So we can see paint thinner as sort of a combative force against the demonic. One other thing I want to mention quickly before we move on, this is the first and really only time we don't see Joan constantly grabbing at Annie and realigning her, or subtly but physically coercing her. And that's because Annie is exactly where the cult want her, doing the exact thing the cult want her to be doing. I think it's clear that Annie isn't fond of the welcome mats her mother made, as the very next scene we cut to the Graham's interior doorway, and we see they don't have anywhere to wipe their feet. And on the ground in front of the door we see a clutter of muddy footprints around the entrance. Now, maybe this is just the family coming and going, maybe that's why Steve is normally militant about shoes off in the house, but I don't think so. Firstly, as I've pointed out, this is a set, so we're not filming in a real house where this could be here accidentally. Everything on screen is precise and meticulously presented. Secondly, we know these footprints weren't there before, as we see the hallway prior to the party. There are some scuff marks there, but clearly not in the same muddy abundance we see here. This is pretty clearly alluding to the cult members having dug up Ellen and then transported her through the house to store her body in the attic. This may even be why Steve has become militant about shoes being off, because he keeps seeing cult members' footprints in his hole. And let's stick with Steve for a moment, as we see him very weakly, very impotently chastise his son about signing up for his SAT prep. Steve even seems to realise his own failings here. He knows he's losing the battle with his family, communicating with them less and less. Peter just outright ignores his reprimand, and there's a deliberate softness to it where even Steve can see why he did. Afterwards, Steve heads upstairs to tell Annie dinner is ready, and we see her working on a not-so-miniature diorama of the accident. Much larger than the others, actually the size Ariasta wanted all the miniatures to be at first before realising they'd need to be scaled down. But this one wasn't. This is supposed to be a large and confronting moment where we see Annie has gone over the edge. She's certainly losing track of reality, not seeing an issue with what she's doing, not realising dinner is already made, and so on. And up until this moment, her dioramas may have been somewhat worrying, but this really is a good deal more problematic. She describes it as a neutral view of the accident, and that begs the question, neutral for who? Because to Steve it's obviously offensive, and to Peter it could be even more so. She means neutral for herself, to be able to understand what happened, but we've already seen that subconsciously she blames Peter. But in this aiming to gain understanding we see the real edge, but this is the only way Annie really knows how to process trauma. While she may well be able to take traumatic events and render them objectively in miniature, Steve rightfully views it as deeply unhealthy, and so it's here that we probably see him at the precipice in regards to them. Not his final breaking point of needing to call the police and ultimately being set on fire, but certainly the point of no return in being able to continue a happy marriage with Annie. We do see him finally snap on her verbally, although given the context it's still quite a muted, impotent reaction, and certainly not one that does anything to reach Annie, who continues daubing away with the red paint. It's a short and impactful scene that very quietly marks this point of no return. The cracks that were present in the family unit have begun to crumble. And that's exactly what we see as the family sit down for dinner, which, to give Steve his dues, looks absolutely delicious. Just like when Peter was asking to borrow Annie's car before the party, we see this standoffish, very surly teenager type attitude from Annie again. And while there may have been some small element of humour to that initially, this is now much darker in the context of what's happened to Charlie and Annie's subsequent feelings towards Peter. We see her not talking, glancing up from a plate as she plays with her food, verbally mimicking Steve and being contrarian and standoffish with Peter. It's all again very surly teenager type behaviour, a mirroring of a lot of the things that she resents about Peter. And before we get into the argument, I wanted to mention how Peter is holding his cutlery, which is borderline unnerving, and for such a small little detail really has 5 possible answers. Now I think the one I subscribe to is that this is another example of Peter's stunted development, his borderline neglect in some respect by his parents, and that fits with Peter's baby-like crying of mommy and needing his friends to hold his hand. Peter's nearly finishing high school, this should be something he knows how to do properly, and we even see Annie look at it with resentment, a subconscious recognition that maybe she hasn't been the mother she needs to be. So for me it's an example of him being emotionally and developmentally a bit stunted, but perhaps we can go a bit further and say it's even exacerbated during times of stress or emotional turmoil, like when your mother is holding you responsible for killing your little sister. Maybe this isn't always how Peter eats, but rather some bad habit he's regressed into due to the stress. And I should mention the other 3 theories because, truth be told, I don't think you could outright call any of them wrong. So first, this could be an example of Pyman worming his way into Peter. We already know he's been able to attempt taking control in brief moments, and we know he eats food weird. Certainly possible, but the least likely. Secondly, this could be some piece of character backstory we don't really get confirmed. I'm thinking specifically that Peter has attempted cutting his wrist at some point. We know he's suffered from depression, and Steve seems very wary of provoking him, and that's caused him to have to hold the cutlery like this. And thirdly, that Steve is worried about Annie's mental state to the point where he's hidden all the sharp utensils and Peter is having to work with a very blunt knife here. That last one was just something I saw on Reddit. I think the knife is perfectly fine for cutting food. Truthfully, it's whatever headcanon you prefer here, but I think the safest and best answer is this stunted development and at times childlike regression we see in Peter. Now, while Peter may vocally instigate the conflict at the dinner table, I think it's fair to say that it's Annie who starts the argument. After sitting in silence for a while, Peter compliments the food, and when Steve says thanks buddy, we see Annie snicker to herself and slightly mimic the thanks buddy, clearly taking the positivity they're attempting with one another as a slight on her. Peter asks quite genuinely, "You okay, Mom?" And for a moment we see Annie react with almost pleasant shock. Everyone in this family, especially Annie and Peter, have been crying out for emotional support, and I think this initial shock from Annie is being actually quite warmly surprised that she's being asked. But she fails to reciprocate, just saying what. She doesn't know how to respond to loving inquiry thanks to a lifetime with Ellen, and we see the conversation quickly devolve from there. Peter asks if there's something on her mind, and we see this childish repetition of the question back to him. Annie's meaning is clear: is there something you want to say to me? But she says it as if she's confused with the question. She's not trying to honestly communicate, and really in this moment, Peter is being the more mature party. From there, Annie says something very telling. "Why would I want to say something so I can watch you sneer at me?" And this may be the smartest line in the entire script. When you first hear it, you'll be certain that Annie has gone insane because Peter hasn't smiled once during the movie. It may even feel out of place or like an outright mistake. Peter acts as shocked as we feel, aligning him with the audience against Annie as he flat out denies it, saying, "Sneer at you, I don't ever sneer at you." The word "ever" is key here, as it informs us that this isn't something happening off camera or prior to the film commencing. And with the film's acknowledgement of this incongruity, we know it's not a mistake of the film, it's a mistake of Annie's. So when she says, "Oh sweetie, you don't have to, you get your point across," we can go, oh yeah, she's definitely insane, as she's admitting he's not actually sneering in the next sentence. But as we know, having seen the film, this absolutely is something Annie is seeing, and Peter absolutely will be sneering later on. It's another little piece of subliminal awareness, a reflection of the plan Annie can't quite make out. Pyman's sneering face over her son's face, looking back and mocking her. And that's confirmed with what Annie says during her tirade a minute later. "All I get back is that fucking face on your face." Now this is absolutely played for a moment of brevity for audience members tired of their teenage children, but again, that's how smart this script is, because as well as being genuinely funny, it can also be seen as Annie being unable to communicate with her child, quite a dark moment for a grieving family, and ultimately still its true meaning, the same as the sneer, this idea that Annie can somehow recognize Pyman's face on her son's, staring back and mocking her, taunting her with what's to come. It's funny, smart, and genuinely chilling all in the same sentence. As with every part of this movie, it gets smarter the more you understand it. And to just cut back for a moment, we have Peter doing the same thing with the phrase "release me" repeated multiple times, and Peter raising his voice, telling Annie to release him, which has obvious connotations to his fixed destiny, and also the idea that Peter's soul is released from his body to make room for Paimon. It is extremely, extremely smart script writing to achieve all this and do it so subtly. To put it in such plain, screaming in the audience's face view, while still hiding its true meaning, is complete genius. Once Annie has finally snapped at Peter, we do hear her refer to Charlie's death as an accident, but she also says to Peter, "I wish I could shield you from the knowledge that you did what you did." So not only do we have her directly blaming him, saying it was his fault, but there's even more layered language here. "I wish I could shield you" is exactly what Annie is trying to do in these subconscious attacks on her children, trying to kill them so she can take them off the board and keep them from Paimon. And to go a little bit further, shield you from the knowledge is also descriptive of Annie here. She knows something is desperately wrong, she can feel that everything is already doomed beyond repair, but because she has been shielded from this knowledge her whole life, she can't see it for what it is. And by the end of the scene, I don't think there's any doubt that Annie is blaming Peter, saying, "If you could have just said I'm sorry or faced up to what happened," accusing him of not being able to take responsibility. Despite her saying it's an accident, she seems certain the family cannot move on due to Peter not being able to apologise for and take responsibility for said accident. And from there we hear the truth. She cannot accept what's happened, and she cannot forgive Peter for, in her eyes, perpetrating it. And as Annie finally lets it all out and reaches a climax of venting her frustrations, we hear the actual truth slip out again, the hidden truth that even Annie can't see. She can't accept and she can't forgive because nobody admits what they've done. She knows she's been the victim her whole life. She knows her mother has done nothing but hide things from her, torment her. But because her mother was never honest with her, she doesn't know what she's missing. She doesn't know how to accept her child's death or why Peter isn't to blame, because she doesn't have the key to understanding the events that she's at the centre of. On a deep level, she still loves Peter, she still wants to protect him, but she's fighting a losing battle against an enemy she doesn't understand, and her family are the only people she has to rage against, the only people she has left to blame for this powerlessness that's been present her whole life. And when Peter finally fights back, when he points out that she's equally to blame in this cause and effect game of assigning accountability, she looks like she's about to explode. Maybe she does want to scream, "You killed her," but ultimately she bites her tongue, and not because Steve put his foot down. Her agreeing fine is 10 times more forceful than Steve telling them to stop. It's because ultimately she has to resign herself to the knowledge that Peter is right, that she isn't exempt from this unseen influence that she can't even verbalize, that she can't protect her children even when she considers herself to be fully in control of the situation. And we're left with this wide static shot that doesn't follow Annie out, giving the impression she's just disappeared from the family as Peter and Steve sit shell-shocked at the table. This is the last time I'm going to mention it, but Toni Collette not only wasn't nominated for an Oscar, but that year Glenn Close was nominated for the 7th time for her performance in The Wife, a film I'm sure we have all seen multiple times. Melissa McCarthy was nominated for a film I hadn't heard of, where she almost certainly starred as a bubbly loser with a quick temper. And ultimately, Olivia Colman won for The Favourite. Now, I love Olivia Colman, I enjoyed that movie, but it's not fit to clean Hereditary's shoes. Here, and the scene prior where Annie's discussing her sleepwalking with Joan, on their own should have been enough for a Best Actress award. It very much speaks to a broader disrespecting of horror by the Academy, and I'm the first to agree that a lot of modern horror just isn't up to snuff. But I also think many of our greatest all-time examples of cinema come from that genre. Alien, The Shining, The Thing, and yeah, Hereditary I think is up there. It should have been recognised for how good it is. Following the blow-up at dinner, we get a quick shot of Annie that I think is supposed to be visually alluding to someone in a straitjacket. She certainly looks like she may have double-dropped whatever meds she keeps taking, and her blurred gazing at the clown seems to give the impression of muted asylum inmate as well. I think the idea with the clown here is the same as the sneering, that on some level Annie can perceive the occult forces laughing at her, using her as a plaything. We also see Annie again follow the instructions of a turquoise note, and once again run into Joan as she does so. We see Annie in the car park apparently running into Joan by chance. Joan's demeanour is extremely different, apparently brimming with happiness all of a sudden. Watch as she makes her way over to Annie. She's already using her arms to grab Annie's attention, and she grabs hold of Annie as soon as she's close enough. Again, Joan is a master manipulator, not just of Annie, but of the audience too. Again, she's wearing red, blue, and geometric patterns. Now, eagle-eyed Easter egg investigators may have noticed that as Joan pulls Annie towards the car, she is doing so to keep Annie from seeing that her backseat is full of chalkboards. Later, during the fake seance, Joan will claim to Annie that this chalkboard was a beloved item of her grandson's, which obviously isn't the case, as we see she's buying them fresh here. But that's not all that's hidden here. And something was bothering me about this scene for the longest time until I realised it was the decision to shoot this scene at sunset. It just seemed out of place somehow, but I think it's very clearly done to give us this visual evidence of Joan leading Annie to the northwest, towards Paimon, the king of the northwest. We know the sun is setting in the west, so we can say pretty clearly Joan leads Annie to the northwest here. We'll see more subtle and not so subtle northwestern imagery as the film moves on, but this is by far my favourite and the most cleverly hidden. As the scene continues, Joan goes absolutely Darren Brown on Annie, keeping her constantly aligned and making eye contact, even stroking her arm, doing everything she can to plant the idea of being able to spiritually contact Charlie within Annie. She spins a story where skepticism has been overwhelmed by the demonstration of spiritual fact, and under normal circumstances, I think we could safely presume that Joan is making this up so that Annie believes the lie. But we did actually see them insert the flyer for the spiritual reading through Annie's letterbox, so much like the grief counselling, I think we can say they did stage this event for Annie's benefit, and for Joan to run into her in the audience during the seance. It's just Annie never took that particular piece of bait. Annie seems very skeptical of what Joan is saying, extremely resistant. In fact, even though a lot of her expressions are hidden from camera, she clearly isn't buying what Joan is selling. Joan recognises this and plays the converted skeptic alongside her, ultimately saying it would be everything if you came. We never see Annie actually say yes, just cutting straight back to Joan's apartment instead. But it's clear from the last few things Joan says regarding being able to communicate with her dead grandson that the promise of being able to contact Charlie is enough to get Annie to go along with it. The main thing I want you to recognise about this seance is that it is, as the name probably suggests to many of you, a parlour trick. It utilises things, tricks the average person might associate with the occult. The movement of the glass was a popular trick in spiritualism, obviously very similar to Ouija boards. Having spirits write things, verbally communing with spirits in the room. It's all stuff that I'm sure you recognise, essentially modern spiritualism that is a refined version of things we saw during the Victorian boom of parlour entertainment. This is a very far cry from the hermetic magic, demonology, occult worship, Miltonian biblicism, invocation and possession that we see the cult using elsewhere. This is all a show, exactly what it's designed to be reminiscent of really, as at this point the audience has no conclusive evidence of the supernatural, but more than that, it's a show for Annie's benefit. It's using tools she recognises from spiritualism, one to convince her of the reality, and two to keep her mind away from this being a gateway to a demonic ritual that she should absolutely not do. But all that's not to say that there isn't actual magic happening here. The glass, the chalkboard, that's not being operated with magnets and cult members. There's a definite demon in the room, which we'll get to in a moment. But this style of parlour magic they're disguising it with is supposed to signal to the audience that this isn't necessarily to be believed, and keep Annie from seeing the real demonic play that she's just become a part of. Now, as I mentioned, the chalkboard that Joan claims was a cherished item of her grandson was recently purchased, and given how haphazardly Joan put together the story about them back at the meeting, I think we can say with reasonable certainty that they don't and didn't exist. So if we know Joan is truly communicating with spirit, and we know she isn't communicating with her deceased grandson, then who is she communicating with? Well, I think the obvious answer is Paimon. We know this is well within his power set, as we've seen him knock over the paint, and we see much more later on. He can certainly affect objects in the material plane. And as when we discussed the light and this larger being observing the family like a dollhouse, we're saying this is Paimon because it almost certainly is, because there's never any real mention of beings beyond him, above him or below him. His minions, so to speak, are the cult, who are human and for the most part living, and although we get mention of him being one of the 8 kings of hell, he's the only one named directly. Now that implies 7 other beings along the same rank as Paimon, and perhaps leaves room for one all-powerful being above them, as we often see in literature regarding hell's hierarchy and greater demonology. That being may sometimes be Beelzebub, Satan, Astaroth, Baal. There's a great many differing interpretations of it, and depending on which one you're looking at, you'll come away with a different answer. But easily the most common is Lucifer, the bringer of light, and most significantly to us, Lucifer is the focus of John Milton's Paradise Lost, which, as I've mentioned, is certainly in line with the occult lore we get within the film. This focus on stars, this use of pandemonium, and so on. And the name Joan chooses for her make-believe grandson, whatever demon or spirit she's communicating with, is Louis, which could be a dry joke on behalf of the cult, alluding to the name Lucifer. Again, dangling the evidence in front of the family, laughing at them. This is going to become more of a theme as we go on, that these spirits have a pretty sick sense of humour. So that's not out of character. I think it maybe is somewhat of a stretch to think this is something Lucifer might waste his time with, however. The film has set up a hierarchy in Hell. Paimon is one of the 8 kings. I think given what we know about Hell's hierarchy, there's no way Lucifer is the same rank as Paimon, and I think we can go out on a limb and say he's probably the only being above the kings. So messing around with parlor tricks does seem like a bit of a stretch. With that being said, Lucifer is a being of light. He is often described as this because he's disguising himself as an angel, or while he was actually an angel, and sometimes he is just more of an abstract form made of light. And that does fit with this lens, this wisp of light that we see and have associated to Paimon. So while nothing I said before was technically incorrect, and while there is no other being mentioned directly other than Paimon, we must also consider that from context, we know there are other beings in Hell, and here we're seeing this Louis nickname used, which is closely reminiscent of Miltonian biblicism that we see the film reference at other points. As before, it's up to you and what you prefer your headcanon to be. This could be Lucifer, if not, it's almost certainly Paimon. It really depends how compelling you find the evidence. I actually quite like the Lucifer theory, but for the purpose of this video, we're just going to be using Paimon as the umbrella term for this being. Now, it would tie the whole how is Paimon inside and outside of Charlie simultaneously up with a neat little bow, but ultimately I think I have answered that question, and any theories we have regarding the light risk being Lucifer really fall down when we see it enter Peter's body and have it verbally confirmed that he's been occupied by Paimon. Still though, the name Louis, just here during the seance, is almost certainly a knowing wink to Lucifer, and who knows, maybe he is in the room here. As the seance progresses, we see Annie becoming more and more unnerved, jumping at the movement of the glass and screaming when her hair is blown by an unexplained gust. She moves from skepticism to belief almost immediately. Remember, she's in a desperate situation, and the cult have been doing everything they can to break her down and make her as suggestible as possible. Joan has Louis write on the chalkboard, and whatever spirit it is writes, "I love you, Grandma." Now, as good as an actress as Joan is here, I think she does actually break character for a moment. When she declares her love for Louis, and let's say that's Lucifer here, but Paimon if you like, then she's really declaring her love for him. She seems reverent, almost brimming with joy at the contact. I think for Joan this has gone a little bit further in this moment than just convincing Annie. And we see that as Annie, clearly upset and terrified, asks if they can stop for a moment, and Joan, more venomously than we've ever seen her, replies, "What?" in quite a confused and confrontational tone. She gathers herself and gets back into character very quickly, but clearly Joan was for a moment all consumed by her open line of communication with Paimon or Lucifer or whatever demonic entity was in control. As Annie tries to rush out, we see Joan grab a piece of paper, and on it is the incantation or barbarous words used in the summoning of Paimon. The writing we actually see on the paper is the Hebrew text. We can also see design elements seemingly lifted from the Lesser Key of Solomon that also features Hebrew text as part of this circular mandala design. And it's difficult to make out, but central to that design we have an old style compass with a direction marker pointing to the north to Paimon's domain. We'll see the same compass marker denoting the northwest on the stairs leading up to Charlie's room and on the welcome mat Ellen made for Annie, as well as next to the illustration of Paimon we see in Ellen's book and also in the treehouse right at the end. Joan talks Annie through the ritual the cult want her to perform, which is most certainly not an innocent way of communicating with Charlie. Actually, it's the invocation of Paimon into the house, and likely what allows for her to be fully possessed by Paimon during the final act. Although you could make the argument that occurs when she's finally broken down fully at the point where Steve bursts into flames. Joan tells her that she needs to say the words to make things start, and really this is what she means by that. Once she says those words, Paimon essentially has free reign over the Graham household. This is confirmed by Ariaster, but he also makes note that if Annie hadn't chosen this path, just like she didn't take the bait of the seance, the cult would have found another way to invocate Paimon within the household. Which is to say that Annie's decision to carry out the ritual speeds things along, but is ultimately meaningless in terms of her being able to affect the outcome. If she didn't go through with it, the outcome would still have been the same because, as we learned during Peter's class, the family have no agency here. Back to Joan, and there is also quite a confusing continuity moment here where Joan's voice doesn't match up with her mouth movements. She tells Annie that every member of the family needs to be in the house, but the house was ADR'd in post. The original line was every member of the family needs to be in the room, but Ari Aster realized in time that this wouldn't line up with the events of the movie. Ellen's body, for example, is in the attic at the point where Annie does the ritual, so this was changed to just be the house. It's an error that a reasonable amount of people have noticed, but I think it actually highlights the level of care and attention to internal logic present within the film. And lastly, for the seance scene, we have Joan saying to Annie, "You didn't kill her," delivered through the window of this oddly structured mirror shot. Now, this is a very strange line. If Annie has implied to Joan that anyone killed Charlie, it was most certainly Peter. She doesn't spend time blaming herself at length for what happened. And sure, maybe she's just bottling that up and Joan can recognize it, but even Annie is confused by what Joan is saying to her here. It doesn't make sense. Now, the line is kind of rectified by Joan saying she isn't gone, and Annie seems to accept this meaning. But it really actually solidifies that Joan is blaming her. You didn't kill her because she isn't gone is essentially the same as you killed her but there's an afterlife. So I think we can very much read this as Joan trying to mess with Annie's head, encourage that self-doubt and guilt in the hopes of pushing her over the edge so she can ask Charlie for herself, so she can find vindication or absolvement. After the seance scene, and certainly following Annie's invocation of Pyman in a moment, we see things start to get a lot more trippy. The film hasn't gone full mask off yet, it's still leaving room for this being a hallucinatory view from the lens of Annie's madness, but we're well on the way to the reveal that this is indeed supernatural. I think the point I really felt the shift is where we hear Annie chanting the words from behind the closed door. But just before that, we have this multi-layered dream sequence where we get a few useful bits of information, and it really does drive the plot forward into a place of conflict, so all the usual criticisms one might have about a dream sequence aren't really relevant here. I was listening to Martin Scorsese praise the film recently, giving particular credit to the intercutting in this scene, where we see these light switch style flicks between layers of the dream and changes in the situation, both being covered in light fluids, and it's absolutely masterful work. Again, so low budget for how high impact it is, just like we saw with the original light switch cut with Ellen in the attic. We'll see this again a couple more times in quick succession with the exterior tilt shift shots flicking between night and day like a light switch. In fact, we never really see a clear indicator of any passage of time in the film, no reference for the distance between scenes. At one point, what could have been days is confirmed to be at least weeks, if not months. And all of this, particularly the flicking of the switch style scene changes, is supposed to create this feeling that the family are in an artificial environment, like a doll's house or a terrarium, that whatever higher being is watching over them can flick night to day as simply as turning on a light switch. It's not 100% the same thing here in Annie's dream sequence, but we see a very similar style to it, almost like the higher being is skipping scenes rather than hitting a switch. There's still this sudden, jarring break where things are different. Here it's obviously used to raise the question of Annie missing time during her sleepwalking or potential DID breaks. We know that in reality it's a combination of Pyman messing with her head and her subconscious desire to save her son by taking him off the board fully. We first see Annie get out of bed after noticing some ants. Now, this is obviously part of Annie's dream, but it is reflecting reality. The house is becoming insect-ridden due to the corpse-filled attic, and so while she isn't seeing them right now because she's asleep, she is in some way aware of them still. Her dreams are infested just like the houses. It's certainly the film's way of letting us know they're proliferating, as they have everywhere else insects, flies, ants, maggots, are all relating to Pyman and this image of death and decay and pestilence. As with the fly during the opening scene and the bird hitting the window, I suppose you could argue that Pyman is controlling these creatures, but I think of it more like a subconscious attraction or ability to sense the magic that the animals have, which is pretty standard fare for horror movies. Annie then sees Peter, presumably deceased with his face covered in ants, which I probably can't show on screen. So as I've said, we've had this association with Pyman and insects the whole way through, and really this is a visual metaphor, maybe a kind of prophetic vision Annie is having regarding Peter being almost or already smothered by Pyman's control. Essentially a vision of her son overcome by Pyman. From there, we quickly jolt into the second level of the dream. As with the first, it's initially presented as reality, where Peter is awake and quizzing the recently sleepwalking Annie. It's here we get a lot of important things confirmed to us regarding Annie's mental state and her relationship with her children. Perhaps most importantly, that she never wanted to be Peter's mother. This is the proof for everything we've been discussing regarding Annie being pushed into starting a family, and it's the final building blocks for Annie's perceived insanity. It's heavily reminiscent of several high-profile cases of mothers killing their children, and reminiscent of depressed, regretful, and ultimately mentally ill motherhood. A lot of the other things she says go along with that too, that she didn't feel like a mother, that she felt pressured by Ellen. She even admits to trying to force a miscarriage and it not working, which, as we've seen, may have been to do with Ellen's magical interferences in production. Now, as with everything, we know that what's actually taking place in the movie is Annie's subconscious desire to end her son's life so she can remove him from Hyman's grip. And that's really the third dream, the spinal switch, where they're both doused with paint thinner, and Peter is screaming that she tried to kill him. So really the dream, from beginning to end, is first realising that Hyman has a grip on his son, secondly arguing out loud, trying to find her justification for committing the act, and then finally what she knows she has to do to prevent it. Now, that's not to say Annie can understand all that with clarity in her waking mind. She still has no idea what's happening. But as we've covered, she's half awake. She's subconsciously aware of the cult's machinations, so in the dream, she can see things with a bit more depth. Now, while this is most definitely a dream, the exchange between Annie and Peter is still relatively lucid and really contains all the background information we've needed regarding the tension between them. It won't ever be explained on screen, but we do see soft hints that this conversation with Peter is still taking place in some realm of the immaterial. Ultimately, we're not supposed to know for sure as this blurring of reality is beginning here, but I think for all intents and purposes, as to where these characters are at, yes, this is part of their actual character progression and not something that is undone moments later. Not fully undone at least, by Annie simply waking up from the dream. When real, awake Annie wakes Peter up to apologise about the things she said, she could easily be meaning what she said at dinner. But there's also the very likely reading that she's meaning the admissions she's made in the dream too, given she's kind of blurring in and out of her waking mind. And on top of that, Peter mentions he was also having a nightmare, so we have this suggestion that perhaps they were both lucid dreaming whacked off of Dittany of Crete in this spiritual in-between place of the house, and they did have this sort of shared dream confrontation. It's very much open to interpretation. It could be that Peter was just being tormented with his own demons, just as Annie was. Except again, his demons are pretty much Annie's demons, seen from the other side, so I choose to subscribe to the theory that they were sharing the same dream space here. And I just want to draw attention to how incredibly threatening and trippy it is when we cut back to her hovering over Peter and telling him to wake up after the intense, multi-layered nightmare sequence we just went through. The audience have no idea if this is going to be real after 2 or 3 very similar rug pulls just moments prior. And when we see this threatening, looming shape of Annie coming into frame as the camera spins to adjust, we realise that all at once our feelings towards Annie and her relationship with her son have completely changed.
So annoying.
Likely at this point, it's the most we see her as a threat. We've had Annie recounting covering her son in paint thinner while he slept. We've had Annie just recently dreaming about it. Chances are next to zero that your first time seeing this, you were happy that Annie was hovering over Peter, and probably even lower that your top concern was her summoning a demon into the home. Just before Annie wakes Peter up for her attempt at a seance, we see, or rather hear, her chanting the words given to her by Jacob that will allow Annie this greater ability to manifest within the home as part of the long-standing occult tradition of the demon, spirit, vampire and so on, needing to be invited in. I'll put what we hear on the chant on screen. Obviously I'm not trying to welcome Hyman into my home, but feel free to try to summon him yourself and let me know down in the comments if you survive. It's a mishmash of Latin and Hebrew chants used to invocate Paimon, taking their origins and format from the Complete Book of Demonolatry and the Complete Book of Demonolatry Magic, although they have been paraphrased and pushed together for the purpose of the movie. Translated into English, the phrase reads, "Hail Paimon, King of the West, praise Paimon," or perhaps "Blessed is Paimon" at the end, depending on how literally you translate it. Once Annie has woken Steve and Peter, we see her invite them down to a Paimon summoning session. It's worth noting that this may be the kindest and most loving version of Annie we ever see. She's apologising profusely to Peter and accepting culpability. She even calls Steve baby. Now this does raise the question of whether or not Annie is in control here. Is her newfound kindness a product of Paimon being at the wheel? And the answer is no, almost certainly not. We very clearly see Annie get possessed, both at this seance and later following Steve's death. We can easily identify when Annie isn't and isn't possessed. This blue-white light bathing her head and her turquoise dressing gown may indicate that she's somewhat under the influence of Paimon though, in his thrall, so to speak. but she certainly isn't possessed as she will be later. I think it's fair to say that her kindness here is mostly performative. She's being kind to them so that they will listen to her and do what she wants them to do. In a way, you can see it as a poorly affected version of what Joan did to her. And ultimately it works, as they do get up and take part, begrudgingly, in the seance. But I think there's a much more generous reading to Annie that I personally lean towards. If we consider that the peak of her nastiness, her honesty, has come moments before, literally visualizing that the only thing resembling a happy ending for them is needing to kill her own son, and we know that it's this understanding that she's not in control, that she can't save them, and that she's never had agency that's pushed her to that realization, then here in this moment, we're seeing an Annie that thinks there's an escape, that thinks against all odds she's found a way out, found proof that her daughter isn't fully gone. For me at least, I think that's why Annie is so kind and lovely here. I think she truly is sorry to Peter when she says it, but she's mistaken mania for clarity and is currently on a mega high, thinking she can easily commune with her daughter, and that maybe there will be a happy, more divine ending for her family. Unfortunately for Annie, we find out pretty quickly that this is not going to be the case. I think mania is a good term for how Annie is being here. She doesn't even skip a beat when she reveals her friend Joan to Steve, nor does she stop to consider the ramifications that has on lies she's told to Steve. She's entirely focused on proving to them she can commune with Charlie. And watch her focus on rules here, refusing to close the window, telling them where to stand and what to do. This is really important. It's part of the trick that Pyman is playing on her. Annie thinks she has found something she can finally control, and she thinks by keeping all the same variables, she'll have control over the outcome. But this is a lie. She's not in control of anything here. The demon or demons are simply playing along until they decide not to. She gets some resistance from Peter, and particularly from Steve at the beginning, as they obviously don't believe her and really are just concerned for her. And we get this very subtle arms out, palms forward, stigmata / Christ on the cross posing from Steve, which the camera keeps focus on very purposefully. But there isn't too much of a mystery here, as he's just a few scenes away from quite literally dying for Annie's sins. We see Annie affecting these Joan-like mannerisms, grabbing at her family, positioning and rearranging them like dolls. She even calls herself a medium, and despite claiming she's lucid, I think it's pretty clear that she's entrenched in her delusion right now. Again, this turquoise dressing gown should signal pretty clearly where these ideas are coming from. She does make the interesting claim of having seen apparitions earlier and shaking them off. Now, firstly, it's important to note the spell she did in the bathroom. What she's referring to is not the same as what she's doing here on camera. This is the seance, the communication that's being manipulated by the demon. In the bathroom, she performed the actual invocation or summoning of Pyman. And when you read descriptions of this summoning from the grimoire, this is in line with what they described. I'll put a quote or two up on screen, but the basic gist is that after saying these words, you are going to get an apparition, a vision of the demon you've summoned. Even the phrase Annie uses to explain why they've stopped, that she dismissed them, has clear double meaning. On first viewing, we're meant to assume she just mentally dismissed them, as in told herself she was imagining things, but dismiss is the exact language used in opposition to summoning. Once done conversing or exchanging with the demon, one would say certain barbarous words to dismiss it. The other more obvious clue is that Annie says apparitions, plural, meaning she hasn't just seen Charlie or something pretending to be Charlie. She's seen something else too. But she's too blinded by her first piece of control over the situation, the only hope at speaking to her daughter again, and so as she has always done, she ignores the signs right in front of her. The seance begins properly with Annie asking Charlie to move the glass, and very quickly we see the Grahams descend into fighting and screaming. At which point the spirit seemingly feigns being upset, smashing a piece of glass and making the candle flame surge. And right then is when we first see Annie get visibly possessed. Now we hear a strange set of noises come out of her immediately following this that we should definitely go through. First is this long, croaking, rasping sound. As I've mentioned before, that's Pyman may have some difficulty communicating between forms, and that things like the cloth may be a product of this difference in speech and body parts that affect the formation of speech. But this noise specifically is lifted straight from Pyman's law, with the Liber Officiorum Spirituum describing him as having a hoarse voice and claiming he will speak only in his native language until commanded to converse in the summons. Almost all of the other essential texts for Pyman make mention of this, making some suggestion that he has to be commanded to speak later. This is 100% that hoarse raspiness we're hearing, but this isn't the only time we'll hear it. When we hear Charlie sleeping, and during her allergic reaction, and her voice in general was very croaky, hoarse and raspy, we'll also hear the same noise coming from Peter when he's later possessed. It's the voice of Pyman. And right after the rasping, croaking noise at the seance, for the first and only time we hear Charlie's actual voice, Millie Shapiro without the Paimon affectations, essentially calling out hello through Annie's mouth. I guess the best way to understand what's happening here is almost like the phone call from a hostage, proof of life, essentially. Although it's more like unlife in this case. Pyman is using the original Charlie, the displaced Charlie, not Char Pyman, essentially giving her soul in hell the phone for a moment. This is the Charlie that literally never had a chance at life, so her confusion is no doubt well placed, and we can only imagine the horrors she's endured if Pyman just has ready access to her soul, or her, in the underworld, however you want to imagine it. Now, while this has the desired effect of the family not realizing they're complicit in demon summoning, it's most likely a product of Pyman's sick sense of humor. Charlie is being used as bait, as a tool to taunt and horrify the family and to push Annie fully over the edge in her belief of the occult. And from there, what we hear is a mix of Annie and Charlie's voices, ADR'd over one another, as we build this image of there being two souls, or two beings fighting for control of the same body, essentially setting up the internal logic for what happens to Peter. We have Charlie and Annie both screaming Mom, and by the very nature of their relationship, we see this blurring between generations of the family. Charlie is calling for Annie, and conversely Annie seems to be screaming for Ellen, giving us the impression that while Charlie has been handed the driver's seat for a moment, Annie is perhaps trapped somewhere else, the spiritual realm, and can perhaps see or feel the presence of her mother. As the weirdness reaches a climax, we hear Peter again regressing into baby-like crying, until eventually Steve douses Annie with a glass of cold water. Upon her return to normalcy, we see her take the same venomous tone she's had throughout the movie, again suggesting that her sudden kindness may have largely been performative or an aspect of mania, or of being somewhat under Pyman's thrall. Following the seance, we get a sequence of quick shots, most notably this one featuring the words Liftoch Pandemonium. Liftoch is again Hebrew, meaning open or unlock, and Pandemonium is sometimes synonymous with hell, more specifically though in Miltonian biblicism, that is to say John Milton's Paradise Lost. Pandemonium is the capital city of hell, the high capital of Satan and his peers, home of the Stygian or Infernal Council, built by the fallen angels at the suggestion of Mammon at the end of Paradise Lost Book 1. This, along with all the other factors I've mentioned, is enough to inform us that we're dealing with this law as the law we're working with in the film. The internal consistency of heaven and hell likely follows suit with what we see first established there. As with the other scribblings, this is a key phrase taken from grimoires, but those grimoires themselves were building upon wider Christian canon, most of which was established by Milton in Paradise Lost. As for its meaning in context, well, firstly, it marks this turning point in the movie, the point from which the floodgates or gates of hell, or more specifically pandemonium, lay open, and from here, hell's true madness is going to descend on the family. More literally though, I think it means that the house is now an open conduit to hell. And then there is the other lingering possibility, that this plan, the cult's true objectives, are greater than just Pyman, that potentially the gates to pandemonium are now open. Lucifer is overseeing the whole affair, and Pyman is the first of many. That's not something ever directly suggested by the film, but it's difficult to read open pandemonium and not see it as a potential meaning. Next we move to Peter's classroom, where he begins to see this Shimmer that Charlie was previously directed by. Again, this is Pyman, or let's say the higher being overseeing and influencing events, directing him to see what it wants him to see. In this case, the absolutely terrifying reflection of himself smiling back, a clear indicator that Pyman is at least beginning to possess him, wearing him down mentally until he can possess him fully. As I've mentioned, this idea or image Annie has of Peter sneering at her is almost certainly this, as we never see Peter smile really, so we get the sense that Pyman has been lurking around Peter for a long time. This is another example of the film wearing its influences on its sleeve, most notably Don't Look Now, and taking existing cliché horror tropes and breathing new life into them. This was certainly the second most viral moment from the film after Charlie's clicking, but it's something we've seen again and again in horror movies, the idea of the reflection not matching or somehow revealing the supernatural truth of the situation. As I've mentioned, this is paired with the occult belief that mirrors function as this communing device with demonic entities, as well as many other alleged properties. I think what I find really terrifying about it is how nonchalantly Pyman is revealing this to Peter. This dukes up approach he has to notifying him that his body isn't his anymore is pretty chilling to consider. Peter rightfully freaks out and GTFOs the classroom as quickly as possible. Following Peter's exit, our POV switches back to Annie, again wearing turquoise and working on her dioramas, when Steve calls her furious about Peter being terrified at school. I think we could say this is his second breaking point, where he pretty clearly doesn't want Annie around Peter anymore. The first was the failure of his marriage, and the third will be him calling the police on Annie, which he threatens to do shortly before he is killed. There's a couple of telling moments here. Firstly, when Steve asks her to guess who called him from school in complete hysterics, and she replies Charlie. Clearly for Annie, this is something she's now fully courting as reality. Steve is trying to get across to her the importance of Peter's breakdown, saying he feels like he's being threatened, and rather than trying to take the logical train of thought Steve is promoting, she says why does he feel like he's being threatened? She again takes the supernatural element seriously here, which to Steve obviously seems as though she's doubling down on tormenting their son and ignoring the validity of what he's saying to her. Obviously though, we know Annie is starting to wake up to what's going on. She cares about Peter too. She's just accepted the supernatural reality that's occurring. And we see that put beautifully when she calls Steve back to leave an angry voicemail and she shouts, "I am not sleepwalking anymore." And this is true. She's not watching with one eye open anymore, no longer blind to obvious signs as she has been. But unfortunately for Annie, she still can't see what's actually happening or how she's being used, nor that it's too late to stop it. Following the phone exchange with Steve, we hear Annie receive a voicemail from the gallery she's preparing the exhibition for. This is actually Ari Aster's voice on the phone. In the script, this was supposed to be the same woman that's been emailing Annie, so my guess is this was a cameo of necessity rather than just wanting a directorial appearance in there. It's this message that pushes Annie over the edge with her work and causes her to begin smashing everything up. And it's absolutely lovely. The gallery are clearly very understanding despite her apparent lack of contact and essentially just want to make sure she's okay and support her. And really, I think that's why we see this reaction. Again, this kind of emotional understanding and communicative care is exactly what Annie has been starved of her entire life, and certainly very much so recently. But she also knows that her situation is a useless one. She knows that her control has been removed, and she's recontextualized her place in the universe as something held at the whim of unseen supernatural beings. All the lies and secrecy and trauma these dioramas have provided her some degree of control over, it's all rendered meaningless, and so she snaps. I'm not sure you could say for certain she realizes here she's in a dollhouse herself. I don't really think that's something Annie ever learns before it's too late. But if her subconscious in the dream and in previous sleepwalking episodes knew she had to kill Peter and Charlie, then I think we can say here that subconsciously she's made this realization that she has control over nothing, and that in truth she's closer to the plaything, the model in the diorama, rather than its creator or controller. Alongside Annie's breakdown, we see Steve return home with Peter, and he comments, "Oh Jesus, the smell." This isn't ever really addressed, but it's obviously because the house now has a beheaded corpse in it. I think maybe you're supposed to attribute it to tossed paints and modelling supplies, or maybe just Annie not taking care of herself, but given what we know, it's almost certainly Ellen's body. And this is the third time we see this in-between space of the doorway used to highlight the cult's activities in the house. So you can be sure next time we'll see something definite, something that changes the formula and proves the rule. Steve walks upstairs to find Annie sitting amidst her smashed up workshop. We see she's using a sad lamp with this blue-white light we associate with Pyman closely bathing her. And this is seemingly a very small detail, but it's also a legitimate visual metaphor tying together the supernatural core theme and this subtextual bait-and-switch dance with mental illness. The light is built for combating depression, and within the context of the film, it's directly representative of Pyman's influence. Steve's usual tact and subservience is nowhere to be seen, and he greets her very bluntly. Her explanation as to the damage is, "I didn't feel like looking at it anymore," and I think that's pretty much confirmation of what I've been saying. She's always used the diorama creation as a method of processing trauma, a lie she's telling herself that she had some degree of control over her reality. Now she's seen the truth of that, and at least subconsciously recognized her role as being closer to the doll than the doll maker. She can no longer look at it. One model that's seemingly intact is the replica of the Graham household, and Steve makes notice of the decapitated model of Peter laying in the bed. I think when we view it in conjunction with everything I just mentioned, we can see it as Annie's subconscious understanding of her only remaining need, something she's known she's had to do for a while. In the script it mentions this being the only intact model, although we see that the diorama of the accident is relatively intact too. Either way, I think this still confirms the intention of the house in miniature representing Annie's last bastion, her only motivating directive from this point on, to try and keep her family safe in whatever fashion that might require. Following this, we see several quick shots building the tension, Steve taking more of his prescription than he should, Annie sitting awake in the bedroom, and then subsequently heading to Charlie's room. And on her way there, we see that the door to Ellen's room is open again, yet another sign of the cult, or potentially Pyman, messing with the house. And as Annie approaches Charlie's room, she sees Charlie's notebook and drawn it. We don't quite get to see it first, but it's revealed shortly after that it's multiple drawings of Peter, crying and dead, signalled by his crossed out eyes. Now it's unclear exactly what happens regarding this book. It could be that seeing it literally puts Annie under Pyman's thrall momentarily. It could be that seeing what it represents, that being the dark force's designs on her son, causes Annie to go into a sort of sleepwalking fugue in an attempt to end her son's life. It could be that she sees it and, horrified, runs in to check on Peter, who is being attacked by something that's entirely. Personally, I think there's a lot of good evidence for it being the first option, and this is the first time we see her fully under Pyman's spell. But this is a confusing 30 seconds of movie, so let's go through it step by step. So first we have this camera pan down from the attic where we know Ellen's body is. We see these strange UV-style glow-in-the-dark doodles. One appears to be a fanged face and the other is essentially just dots. It could well be the cultist. The 4 dots could be representative of compass markers with the face positioned at the northwest. But perhaps more likely than that, I think it could have been Charlie sitting on the attic steps with a glow-in-the-dark pen. As with the camera pan in the opening shot, I think we can read this as the spirit's movement from their dwelling in the attic into Peter's room, where the camera ultimately comes to rest. It's letting us know they're coming to mess with him, essentially. We see Peter slowly wake up after hearing Charlie's cluck and see her ghostly apparition stood in the corner. Her head rolls off and becomes a Nerf basketball in the moonlight. Now, as with other ghostly sightings in his bedroom, this is done to allow for the potential of this all still being a hallucination, or a trick of the light, or maybe Peter's half-dreaming mind. Even this late in the game, the film still hasn't fully committed to the supernatural. With that being said though, I think we can say pretty comfortably that Charles Pyman was in the room with him, and I don't think it was to warn him. Quite the opposite, in fact, more to distract him so that he can be grabbed from behind. Next we see the family dog Max at the door getting increasingly upset with the demonic presences in the room. More on him in a second. And then comes the head grabbing, which is quite a strange way of attacking someone and seems to be causing Peter to writhe in terror and agony. So whose hands are they? I suppose they could be ghostly Charlie or Ellen's hands, but they don't look old enough for Ellen and they look far too old for Charlie. It's very difficult to make out, but the colour and cut of the shirt Annie is wearing right after matches exactly with the arms we see coming through the bed. Plus, just seconds later, Annie is in the room, with Peter screaming that she did it, and we don't have any evidence to suggest ghostly apparitions would be able to wrestle with Peter. From everything we've seen, Pyman needs to physically possess people to do things like that. So I think it's pretty reasonable to say this is Annie doing the head grabbing. So why is she doing it? Is she doing it to take him away from Pyman, as she's hinted at? Well, no, I don't think so. Even though the film really wants us to think Annie intends to kill Peter, she's absolutely not trying to here, and I think that's evident from this being such a strange attack. This scene is normally referred to as attempted strangulation, and in the script it's described as trying to yank the head off, which certainly fits with our headless theme. But she's actually stretching his mouth open by holding his head in place and peeling his chin downwards towards his neck. And we know from Charlie's allergy and Peter's bad reaction to the dittany that this is where Pyman is trying to enter him. He's also been bathed in blue-white moonlight, just as we saw before with the blue-white lens flare as Pyman was trying to get in initially. So if Annie is stretching his mouth open for Pyman to enter, the literal opposite of what she wants, then it's fair to say the sketchbook did send her into some kind of thrall so that Pyman could try it on, and the door slamming to keep Max out, just like the glass of water or her waking herself up striking the match, it snapped her out of it. So she isn't lying to Peter, she most certainly doesn't remember grabbing him. She was being controlled by Pyman, not trying to strangle or behead him, but rather hold his mouth open so Pyman could enter. And all of this is confirmed by the door slamming of its own accord. Pyman is literally working in conjunction with the possessed Annie here, so I really don't think there's any doubt. But that door slamming does bring me onto Max, because while all we hear is a door slam and a whimper in the movie, in the script it's a lot more obvious by this point that something supernatural is happening, and rather than just slamming the door, Pyman slams the door, drags Max backwards downstairs, opens the front door of the house, throws Max on the ground outside, slamming the front door of the house closed again. There's a direct intervention here that Annie is absolutely part of while possessed by Pyman, and I think that removes any doubt regarding her, or rather Pyman's motivations here. I'm not sure at what point you will have decided that Annie isn't a murderously bad person. It may have been right at the point of her death, maybe right at the point where you realise that the supernatural stuff was legitimately occurring. I think it's safe to say though that the film is still very much pulling for you to distrust Annie. It's a pretty obvious attack on Peter, and even when she's lucid again, her concern isn't for him so much as which corner of the room he'd seen Charlie in. Regardless of the truth behind it, one would hope a parent's instinct would be to try and reassure their child rather than interrogate them. And immediately following that, we see her tell Peter to keep this incident from Steve, while explaining she's the only one that could protect them, and accusing him of being crazy for suggesting she attacked him, which is all pretty typical abuser behaviour. All that being said, Annie must have a definite turning point here following this incident, given her decision to burn Charlie's book. Now this is to do with what it represents and what it's suggesting, the repeated image of a dead Peter, but I think in the most direct sense, it's Annie deciding enough is enough regarding the supernatural shenanigans she's invited into the house. Still believing what Joan told her, she sees Charlie's sketchbook as this conduit object, and she thinks if she burns it, she can break the link. She still believes there's rules that can be followed, and it's this belief that allows for Pyman to play this final trick on her. When Annie initially tries to burn the book, her sleeve spontaneously sets ablaze. Now, obviously no amount of being on fire is a good amount, but the fire springs to life relatively tamely in comparison to what we're about to see. So it's worth noting that she is being messed with here. This is designed to trick Annie as much as it is the
pretty
audience.
easy plot.
We're seeing the suggestion that there's a link between Annie and the book, that as the book slowly burns, so too does Annie.
Might
But no
take
such
a
link
little
exists. The
bit
book
just
is
because
largely
I have to
meaningless. It's
get
just
all
an
the,
object
all
being
the
used to mess with her. It's being used to convince Annie specifically of this link, but this is literally just the demon having fun at Annie's expense. Presumably, if he wanted to, he could just burn Steve anytime. There's no link between Steve and the book, nor Steve and Annie's bloodline, yet Paimon is, let's say, summoned enough.
I mean, it's very likely that I'll get it tonight.
That he is just able to set
take a
Steve on
quick
fire.
break, walk
So
the
what's
dog,
crucial
and
here
do all that
is
stuff
that the
then.
demon is building an Agent 47-like setup so that Annie will be convinced that her misaction has resulted in Steve's death, and again, simply to laugh at her and make this as cruel as possible. That full breakdown of her mind and spirit is what allows for her to be fully, or rather permanently, possessed in the latter scenes of the movie. Annie retrieves the book from the fire and stamps out the flame that had been trying to extinguish the fire on her arm. This not only demonstrates to her that this link does exist between her and the book, which again it does not, but it also demonstrates to us that her belief in the supernatural is absolute at this point. It's not logical or instinctual to try and put the book out before your arm, unless you're 100% certain of this magical link existing. After another light switch style edit from night to day, we see a mentally broken Peter trudging his way to school and a crazed looking Annie watching from the gap of Ellen's door. We see this suggestion that Annie has been the one opening Ellen's door the whole movie, but that's absolutely a misdirect. It's been the cult up until now. Deciding she needs help in stopping what's going on, Annie heads back to Jonas. She finds the door locked and we see it's being monitored by a camera with an active red light signaling it's being observed. While Annie is stopped at the door, we do get to see inside, and this is really the final reveal that it's been the cult all along, and that Peter is their target. Inside, we see evidence of the possession ritual, a similar carved triangle pointing to the northwest, just as we saw carved in the floor of Ellen's room, the one she used for the possession of Charlie by Paimon. We also see a few other symbols, multiple examples of Paimon's sigil and Charlie's makeshift dolls and icons. It's not until Annie looks down at the welcome mat her mother made again that she realizes Joan might be the enemy. But as we've discussed, she's too late. The cult are way too far along with their plans for her to be able to meaningfully affect them, and Joan is already on her way to Peter. For me, it reminds me somewhat of Ozymandias in Watchmen, or perhaps the end of The Wicker Man. The horror lies in the hopelessness. Rather than an exciting battle that is ultimately lost, it's revealed to us that the loss has already occurred, that the stakes were far closer than we had realized, and it again feeds into this idea of the sacrifice from the sacrificial lamb's perspective, something I tried to draw inspiration from my upcoming novel. And so while Annie is putting the final pieces together, we flick to Peter, who becomes aware he is being beseeched from across the street by Joan. She's trying to expel Peter from his own body, and we hear her use the barbarous words Satani, Degani, Aperagon. These all come from the necromancy banishment ritual from Verus Jesuitarum Libellus that I mentioned near the beginning, and that's exactly what Joan is using them for, except instead of banishing a demon she no longer has a use for, she's using it to banish Peter from his own body to make room for a demon. Now, this isn't meant to just pop his soul right out, it's just another part of the ritual to weaken his soul's grip on his body, and as we see in his following scene, it most definitely does just that. Rather than heading to help Peter, Annie heads to the workshop to raid her mother's past possessions and search for answers. It's here we see the welcome mats Ellen has made for Annie and her brother. We see a similar floral pattern on her brother's mat, two very clear sigils of Paimon, and even two almost complete satanic pentagrams. It's safe to say that upon seeing the similarities between the mats, Annie recognises the designs, but she's putting stuff together quite quickly at this point. I feel she's already made the connection. Now she's just trying to find out anything she can. Skipping the book she'd previously leafed through, she first opens a brown book with only Paimon's sigil on the front. It's absolutely supposed to be reminiscent of quite a few of the grimoires we've mentioned already. I think it's 100% supposed to be directly visually representative of the Goetia, or the Lesser Key of Solomon, in parts. We also see this little illustration of people with plants growing out of their heads, and as I've mentioned, I think the thing is a little underdeveloped, but there is the gentle suggestion that some of the boons the cult receive may come in the form of something similar to a plentiful harvest, that kind of riches. But the illustration itself, I knew by sight, I'm sure many of you will recognise it too. This particular style of illustration was used to demonstrate mandrake root in old botany and alchemy manuals. Mandrake root is historically synonymous with witchcraft, and for those interested, this particular illustration was taken from this exact page of Kleiner Distiller book, published in the year 1500. That has nothing to do with the text, however, which I think is supposed to be Sanskrit, but is actually Devanagari, and the text itself is pretty much gibberish, except for a word generator, which honestly, at this point, I'm super happy about, because I really didn't want to translate Devanagari, a language I only just found out existed. Annie moves on to the book titled Invocations, and this is just a huge on-screen info dump about Paimon's abilities, motivations, promises to the Conjurer, and so on. Now there's a lot here that I've already covered, and more that just proves things we've been talking about. So I'm just going to run through everything we can see on screen in no particular order, as there's a lot of information about Paimon here, and really this is what we can consider to be 100% accepted Paimon canon within the lore of the movie. So firstly, where does this text come from? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's an amalgam of different passages from existing texts and grimoires regarding Paimon, E.A. Cotting's Works of Darkness, Aleister Crowley's Lesser Key of Solomon. We even see the Goetia directly mentioned in the bottom paragraph. Some of it has been written specifically for the film and relates directly to the internal logic we're using here, but there is no one overriding source this is all lifted from. It's all been tailored to demonstrate how Paimon's power set works within the film. So this top left paragraph probably gives us our best piece of confirmation right off the bat. It's discussing how Paimon will attack the family both psychologically and physically, and we see a mention of the deep mind calling to the victim to warn of the attack. This idea of the deep mind is almost certainly the film's referencing of Annie's sleepwalking, and confirms to us that much of what we've been seeing is her subconscious knowing it needs to kill Peter to save him from being an eternal skin suit for Paimon. We also see a mention of Paimon being the king of the Northwest. The second and third paragraphs are more about the conjurers, that they need to be free from fear and clear and absolute in their motivations. This is exactly what Crowley discusses in his summoning rituals. There are a few key words we see used here, such as coven and magistelli, which is a broad term for a form of totem that could be an animal, such as a familiar, or an object that has a particular spiritual significance. This just works as more confirmation that the cult are much more interested in occultism rather than the parlour magic that they say. We also see some of the promises Paimon makes to the conjurer, such as knowledge of science, arts and astrology, and again we see that nod towards Paimon's knowledge of the stars, this reading of Newtonian biblicism, and the greater demons as fallen angels that lost the world. We then get this zoom in on the second page, which tells us a little more. We see the rules the film uses for how and when Paimon can possess and unpossess people, and the fact that he prefers a male host body, which we've already pretty well covered at this point. Above that, we see this image of Paimon, which we'll come back to in a moment, and his bracketed title of God of Mischief, which I wouldn't say is really a major part of Paimon's lore. We might expect to see King of Hell there, or even more likely something related to wisdom and knowledge, which seems to be the primary reason for calling on Paimon and potentially his greatest power. I also wouldn't really even describe him as a god, so we can see this as an effort by the movie to reinforce with the audience that Paimon is playing tricks on the family. He is laughing at Annie just like she suspects. I don't want to get too bogged down in it, because truthfully the demon Paimon is its own entity, but most mythological characters are evolutions of previous characters, or beings, you might say. And as I mentioned, Paimon, like many demonic and semi-demonic figures, was previously a djinn, and it's worth pointing out that mischief is something djinn are known for. Not only that, but some people will take it even further back and link the djinn character with African deities that we can also tie in with this idea of mischief. But truthfully, it gets a bit muddy because of how myriadic mythology and folklore is. Obviously, within occult lore, these beings have essentially always existed. They didn't just spring to being in the 14th century. So to someone who practices this, the people who wrote these grimoires and people still today, Paimon was that djinn figure and they're all one and the same. But truthfully, they're not. The originating figure was most likely a Middle Eastern pagan goddess of some kind, likely a riff on Isis or a Mesopotamian goddess, that has gone through a great many different cultural iterations and branched off in a bunch of different directions. We do see some things that maintain. For example, the name Paimon likely comes from the Hebrew word pom, which means a tinkling sound or small bell, and we see this in the grimoires and in the movie, this notion of his approach being preceded by bells and other loud instruments. We also see this idea of some kind of feminine visage and camel he's riding. So there are historical and etymological links between these characters, and again, from a spiritual or occult perspective, these are just differing descriptions of the same being. But in the sense of literary history, I think we can definitely say the version of Paimon we see popularized in European Christian and occult literature is his own thing, and it's that understanding that the film is going with here. With that said, there is something about this image that definitely stands out as an original edition of the film. If we look at other traditional representations of Paimon, we'll see this androgynous crowned figure riding a camel that is often wearing a crown itself. What we will not see, however, is 3 decapitated heads hanging from that camera.
Oh yeah,
And I'm
dude.
sure if you're at this point
Oh,
in the
yeah.
video, then I don't
You
need to
can see
explain
it.
to you that this
You
is
can see it.
absolutely representative of the sacrifice Hyman is demanding in return for his services. He wants 3 heads from 3 generations of the Lay bloodline as proof of their subservience to him. 3 female heads specifically, namely
Lily,
Ellen,
you're behind
Annie,
me,
and
right?
Charlie. That much is definitely clear. But a big question, really the last unanswered question we have left here, is why? Why is that what he wants? And what does it mean? And what implications does that have on the ultimate meaning of the film? The easiest answer I can give you is that it's another sick joke of Hyman's that runs with his theme of gender inversion, twisting a central motif of Christian faith into a perverse sacrifice that signifies the entire destruction of the familial unit. But obviously there's a lot more to it than that, and on its own that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. If you Google what's going on with the 3 heads in this image, then the main suggestion you'll likely see
I love
is
this
that Ari
outfit.
Aster just saw this drawing somewhere and decided to roll with the 3 heads. That's patently false. From everything I can tell, this image was drawn specifically for the movie, likely using this one image as a reference, but redrawing it in an attempt to provide a more malevolent and easier to make out image for Hereditary's audience. As I've mentioned, the film also uses a modified
Good, baby.
sigil that's altered
real
to
good.
better resemble this notion of 3 heads also. So we know it's a purposeful inclusion of 3 heads, and that by doing this, Ari Aster is tying something else into Hyman's lore. The question is, what is it that's being tied in and why? And there have been some clues already, but it's difficult to see at this point in the film because it hasn't been laid out in front of us. Now again, if we look online for an explanation for the 3 heads, that is, why is the film centered around 3 decapitations? We'll have to look pretty hard, but really we can find 2 schools of thought. And oddly enough, they're both right, but neither go far enough to meet in the middle. Theory 1 has been espoused by a couple of feminist critics online. This is the notion that historically loss of the head has been attributed to disintegration of the female identity and has been related to women sacrificing themselves for men, or indeed for their families. This is quite a long-standing trope in feminist literature, and there's certainly a hell of a lot of examples we can pull from. We could say even more generally there's a trope of women sacrificing their bodies for men and for their families, not just in art but in history. Childbirth is a great historical example of that and fits perfectly with this image of Annie as a reluctant mother. In fact, really all of the film is exemplary of this. It's the story of 3 women needing to sacrifice themselves or be sacrificed for a male demon to enter a male body. Charlie's body is literally used as a temporary vessel for Hyman. It's a throwaway sacrificial form. And very often this complete sacrifice at the hands of men, the disintegration of the feminine self, is depicted as the loss of the head in feminist literature. We can even go one step further and say mental illness has been traditionally, historically seen as a feminine problem, and I think in history and on screen, it's generally viewed through a gendered lens. And we can go as far to say that the Western concept of madness has been intrinsically linked with gender. The word hysteria, for example, finds its origins in the Greek word for uterus, and eventually evolved into a diagnosable mental illness in women that essentially meant your lady wife was having notions. Annie spends a lot of this movie hysterical, even though it's never spoken about explicitly. She's trying to combat the image of being a mad woman, having to fight off social and familial judgment in pursuit of the truth, having to fight the gender perception of seeming insane. And again, this is absolutely a mainstay of feminist literature, perhaps even more so than loss of the head, the treatment of women as mentally ill for refusing to conform to societal norms. It's why we burned supposed witches. They lived differently for whatever reason. People became afraid of them, branded them insane and in league with the devil. And that's remarkably close to what we get here. There's plenty more dangerous medical and mental associations and misdiagnoses women have had to endure through the centuries. So much of it is tied to strange gendered theories in our history. One such association is to do with the link between women and the moon, something that has absolutely invaded female medicine, but also has been a very powerful image in female empowerment and specifically witchcraft. Now, none of that's terribly groundbreaking, but it is necessary exposition to get to this final answer of why 3 heads. As I said, that's half the groundwork, or one of the existing theories, that the female loss of the head represents the sacrifice of women, very often the hereditary sacrifice of women within the familial unit. The other less developed theory you'll only really see mentioned in a couple of Reddit comments, but is certainly closer to being a full answer, is that it in some way represents the Christian Holy Trinity. Most films are obsessed with doing things in 3s, and 3 beheadings is certainly the prime example of this. I've seen fans online suggest that this trinity of Ellen, Annie, and Charlie represents the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and this is close to the truth, but also fits a little awkwardly. If we say Ellen is the Holy Spirit because she's dead for the entire movie, then Annie is the Father and Charlie is the Son. If Charlie is the Holy Spirit because she's inhabited by Paimon, then Annie is the Son and Ellen is the Father. But it's not immediately clear which, and so I wouldn't say it fits perfectly. I'm also not sure what the meaning would be there either, as the cult are distinctly anti-Christian. I guess you could say they're sacrificing a version of the Trinity to demonstrate their anti-Christian loyalty, but again, it doesn't fit perfectly, and everything up until this point in the movie has. Now, there is evidence supporting this. If we look at the statue of Paimon seen right at the end, and I'll probably have to be careful of how I show this, but hopefully I can demonstrate that we see the statue making a three-fingered gesture, specifically an inversion of the traditional Christian hand gesture we see all the way through Christian art that represents the Holy Trinity. And that word inversion is really important here because we have a female Trinity as opposed to a male one. It's inverted. It's being prayed to and worshipped by Satanists, inverted Christians, we could say. And right at the end, we hear Joan tell Paimon, we reject the Trinity, which is the only real verbal confirmation of all of this. And they've chosen the word rejection. I think rejection definitely feels more satanic, more threatening in the scene, but really inversion is much closer to what's happening. They haven't rejected a Trinity full stop so much as replaced it with their own opposite one. And it was at that point that I realized what we were looking at in the three heads. It's not just an inversion, it's the literal inversion of the Holy Trinity, the pagan triple goddess. Now, again, as with most ancient mythological figures and symbols, there's a lot of different versions of this. We see it in Hinduism, we see it most popularized in ancient Greece, or Hellenism to be more accurate, and there's always slight variations. We see other versions of the Holy Trinity dotted around too. It's pretty standard, but the one thing the pagan triple goddess always has in common is this idea of three states of womanhood. Rather than the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we have the maiden, the mother, and the crone, and that fits exactly with the Trinity we see on screen. And this Trinity of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, like so many aspects of womanhood, is tied historically to the phases of the moon, the waxing, full, and waning moons. And all of this should be immediately ringing alarm bells because that's exactly what we've just been discussing. We've again got this link to the moon and mental illness and womanhood, that to be a woman awake to her own sacrifice has historically seen you painted as mentally ill. But to top it all off, where this image has stayed relevant beyond ancient mythology, is the practice of witchcraft. Most recently Wicca, but it's always been present in some form, so much so that within witchcraft, the triple goddess, sometimes described as one figure but more often described as three, is seen as the consort of the horned god. Now, in Wicca, we're more likely to view the horned god as the image of natural virility, somewhat similar to the Green Man. But I think it should be obvious what other translations of the horned god consorting with witches would be. Essentially, the centuries-old image of witches consorting with the devil, the triple goddess submitting to the horned god. And again, this is exactly what we see in the film, the witches of the coven consorting with a horned god, a demon at the right hand of Lucifer himself. Even down to the roots in Hellenism that we see reflected in the cult's jewelry and dress sense in Bridget's second name, Molpe, meaning siren, tie together this final piece of meaning with the predominantly Hellenistic image of the triple goddess, or triple hore, to be specifically ancient Greek. Even though it's never really spoken aloud, the triple goddess is at the heart of this movie as the pagan inversion of the Holy Trinity, the ultimate symbol of the three stages of hereditary womanhood, the mother, the maiden, and the crone, and ultimately the image of feminine sacrifice that has historically been tied to both motherhood and witchcraft. And on a metaphorical level, we can now view the narrative as something much bigger. Put as simply as I can, it's the submission of the trinity of womanhood to the horned god as a result of desire for more than they had, and as a direct response to this treatment of being considered mentally unwell. The whole story, when viewed from as far out as we can, is not too far from The Witch, women ultimately submitting to or siding with paganistic or anti-Christian forms of evil as part of an invasion of social persecution, with both movies viewing the female body as a place of male dominion, sacrifice, and dark empowerment. Now, in Hereditary's case, there's a lot more happening close in, but it's interesting the answer we've arrived at, and it does help contextualize a bit better why Paimon preys on the female members of the bloodline. As with many men throughout history, he wants to use their bodies to promote his own ends, primarily through childbirth, but ultimately through the most complete sacrifice there is. Ellen, the knowing witch and leader of the coven, presumably sees this for what it is, but decides to use her body to take power for herself through aligning with him. This is why we see this moon imagery, this triple goddess, or traditionally images of female empowerment. I'm not saying this is an empowering ending for women in the film, because it really isn't. Paimon hasn't exactly been trustworthy the whole way through, and we don't really know if there's such a thing as a positive afterlife for Ellen in hell, even if she is ruling as a queen. But it is a feminist reading for sure. It's one that uses the historical imagery of witchcraft and mythology to demonstrate the female body as a place of violence and sacrifice for men. And it's reassuring for us that when we dig to the bedrock of the film, we see the imagery and the meaning all aligning perfectly with our understanding. The witches of the Covenant have aligned with dark powers, seeking something more. To the outside world, they seem insane, hysterical, moon-driven, and mentally ill. The male demon promises them riches and plenty, and uses their bodies as vessels for sacrifice and his eventual rebirth, destroying the inverted trinity of maiden, mother, and crone, rejecting it, as Joan puts it, as a symbol of his own ascension over the powers of Christianity and the provable devotion of the Lee bloodline to him. It all fits perfectly together, and I think we can say pretty safely that's the last major mystery solved. Paimon wants three heads as an inverted representation of anti-Christian sacrifice, representing the triple goddess, while maiden, mother, and crone, and with that imagery we see the film tying in this history of the female body as the subject of mental illness, accusations, and violence. Back to Annie, going through Ellen's belongings, and we see another page from the book regarding riches to the Conjurer. Note the nudity of the Conjurer here, something that will define the last 10 minutes of the movie as we all collectively scrub our eyes clean. There is more expositional text along the right here. As with previous pages, it's somewhat cobbled together from different sources, and there isn't really anything we need to cover in any more detail there. After seeing all she needs to from the book, she keeps rifling through the box, and that's where we see this photo album where Ellen is posing with many different cultists we've seen throughout the film. We also see this photo with Ellen dressed up as a bride, being showered with golden coins. Now this is clearly too late in her life to be her first marriage to Annie and Charles' father, and the promise of riches is exactly what she's getting for marrying Paimon. So we can say pretty clearly that this is Ellen's wedding to Paimon, the point at which she became Queen Ellen. We do know from the timeline that Annie gives us, though, that she was likely trying to summon Paimon and practicing occultism for quite a long time before this. We see Annie recoil in particular disgust, seeing at how overjoyed Ellen is at being wed to Paimon, and we also see visual evidence that the Graham family are the cult's target. From here we've got some very quick intercutting of scenes, all of which I've already made mention of. We've got Peter being beckoned by Paimon to shiver, signalling his teacher as a member of the cult. We've got Steve's realization that Annie's mother has been unlawfully exhumed, which as we know is in the attic. We've seen the muddy footprints of the cult bringing in the recently dug up body. One little detail of interest is we get to see the name of Steve's psychiatry firm, United Psychiatry, which is sort of ironic mocking, a kind of pathetic fallacy regarding his failed desire to keep his family united. Now this discovery of Ellen being dug up is cut back to back with Annie finding the body in a now insect-filled attic. We see Annie discover the body, we see that it is surrounded by Paimon's sigil, we see a horror. We also know it's very likely that Steve is suspecting Annie will be responsible for this. And because the tension is built so damn well here, even though we see Annie discover the body, we still don't know on first viewing if she's responsible either. We've seen her completely unaware of the fact she's just been attacking Peter, swearing that she didn't. We may know by this point that she can be possessed, but we're certain that she's a deeply unreliable witness, and from here on out she will continue to take action off camera essentially the whole time. Now she hasn't dug up the body, the cult have, but I just wanted to point out what a knife edge this twist keeps walking all the way until the end. Peter gets back to his classroom, and this time we're discussing the tragedy of Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, who is sacrificed before the siege of Troy to placate the goddess Artemis. We again see the idea of characters being bound to a tragic fate, as Agamemnon essentially has no choice but to meet the irrational and terrible demands of the gods. It's his bound fate as soon as Artemis has decided it's her desire, because man is powerless under god of the gods. And that again is what we see with the Graham family. This sacrifice has been decided for them. In some versions of the story, Iphigenia is unaware she is to be sacrificed, being told instead that she is to marry Achilles, which is even more fitting with the Graham's unwitting end. We also see the phrase "punishment brings wisdom" written on the board, another clear allusion to the true plight of the Graham family, and the idea that the horror they've been enduring will bring foresight, knowledge and wisdom, potentially to Ellen, and maybe them, in hell, but primarily the cult members still alive enough to reap the earthly benefits. As with almost all the high points of tension in the movie, once again Ari Aster trusts Alex Wolff's face entirely to carry the next part of the scene. Peter begins to hear more frequent clicking until his arm is yanked up in the air and he begins having what looks to be a seizure, but is actually Paimon wrestling for control of his body. This arm movement is extremely specific, I'd say the two ways of looking at it are either seeing Peter as a manipulated voodoo doll target, we can imagine someone grabbing the arm of a little voodoo doll and yanking it up, or alternatively like a marionette puppet being suspended by one arm. We even see his facial features seemingly being dragged or suspended upwards. Both have the same effect though, something that's been built on throughout the movie, the idea of Peter being used and physically manipulated like a doll or a puppet. And once Paimon seemingly has control of Peter, he first lets out the croaky gurgle of his true voice before quickly using this momentary victory to smash his face against his desk. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this definitely has the effect of making Peter's face more beaky and bird-like, perhaps to better represent Paimon's demonic form, but it could be possibly that he simply wants to hurt Peter to wear him down more to the point where he can be fully possessed. It could also be true that Peter is already fully broken down, and Paimon is simply trying to kill him as quickly as possible so he can leap inside. I don't personally subscribe to that because it feels like everything is leading very purposefully to this all going down during the ending ceremony. As with every other time we've seen Paimon try to enter Peter's body, we've got this blue-white light either framing him as it is here or flaring over him, as we saw in earlier scenes. This scene is tremendously acted, absolutely harrowing to watch, and truly shocking the first time you see it. Alex Wolff is truly phenomenal in this movie, and his performance here is perhaps the high point of that. Now, there has been some slight confusion and urban mythery surrounding this scene. I've seen more than a few people suggesting he smashed his face into the desk thinking it would be soft and ended up breaking or dislocating his jaw. The truth isn't quite as awful, but might be more impressive. He did say in an interview that he was happy to smash his face into a real desk, but Ari Aster obviously pointed out that would be super illegal and not something they needed to do. They did get a cushioned prop desk, and Alex Wolff did say it was much less padded than he thought it would be. And despite not intentionally smashing up his own face, he did take himself to an extreme physical place shooting this, and did end up with quite real blood coming out of his knee after it collided with the chair. Now that is somewhat conflated with another answer he gave about the same scene, where he discusses his jaw being easy to dislocate as a result of a boxing injury he sustained several years prior. In the scene, his face looks so strained and distended because he's intentionally dislocated his jaw and glued his eyelids up. It's that combined with the face smashing into the desk that often gets confused into the same story. So no, he didn't break or dislocate his jaw on the desk, but he did do some rock and roll shit and thoroughly beat himself up filming this, and I think that energy he brings to it and the pretty unique and real visuals on screen are what make that story so believable and this performance so electric. Lastly, before we move on here, a question I think worth answering is why are the classmates and the teachers so horrified here if they're in on the wholesome and behind it? And firstly, we can't say for sure that every student and faculty member are cultists. They most likely aren't, and so there's no reason why the cult members would choose to drop the act and just get on their knees and start hailing Paimon right then and there. I think that's the most obvious and best answer, but I also think it's fair to say that the cult don't really know what Paimon on Earth is going to look like. No way of telling how bloodthirsty or violent he will be in practicality. That could extend to every cult member, but I think it's especially true for the children who have almost certainly been brought into this by their parents. We can't say for certain that Bridget is definitely horrified here. She may just be a very good actor, but I fall down on the kids not being 100% aware of exactly what they're signing up for, more just going off of vague instructions and explanations given by their parents. While Annie stands out in the rain, too terrified to return to the house, Steve is given the task of recovering Peter from the hospital. As they're driving back to the house, we see Steve almost drive through a red light and have to perform an emergency stop. After doing so, we see him break down crying, and at this moment there is a blurred shape in the background that could very well be the headless ghost of Ellen in a white dress. Now at first I thought there's no way it's just part of the infrastructure on the side of the road. More precisely, I thought it was one of these things. But after spending more time than I should going back and forth, I don't think it is one of these things. The primary reason being that the background just doesn't line up, and what we see in the exterior shot, there's a bunch of discrepancies I could point out, but the main one is the edge of this white barrier. In the exterior shot it's heavily sloped, in the interior shot it's almost level. So either continuity doesn't matter, or the white barrier we're seeing from the interior is further beyond the sidewalk than we can see in the interior. Either way, there's a reasonably good chance this is Ellen's ghostly visage here, and that would make sense. Not only is Steve choosing this moment to break down, perhaps being withered by her ghostly gaze, but also the spirits are about to determine that Steve's usefulness has run its course, mainly to push Annie over the edge, but also to get him out of the way and prevent him from reporting this to the authorities, which is exactly what he threatens to do moments later upon Annie showing him Ellen's body. So it makes sense the cult, or Ellen at least, will be watching him very closely at this point to make sure he doesn't do anything drastic that might jeopardize their plans for Peter. After Steve has seen the body in the attic, we see Annie spring into action preparing the fire. As she sees it, her final chance to vindicate herself and and save her family, even if it means her death. She's prepared to make the sacrifice, and that's matched so perfectly against this final lunatic besiegement of Steve to listen to her advice and take her at her word, and not see her as a crazy, insane, dangerous woman. As with everything we've discussed, with the feminist reading and the idea of the triple goddess, Annie's options are seemingly be recognised as insane or make a sacrifice so total, it results in a complete disintegration of herself. I think that's what makes her performance in this scene so compelling, and again, just this scene is Oscar worthy in my opinion. It's that this is maybe the most insane, the most unhinged and unbelievable we see her acting. She seems completely insane at this point, but it's here we find ourselves siding with her totally for the first time. We're beyond doubt too, just like she is, and we're hoping against hope that Steve believes her as she begs to be listened to and she doesn't have to use the fire to prove it. We've gone from being suspect of the insane and dangerous mother to understanding her sacrifice, and the writing is so smart that there's no clear point where that will just be telegraphed to the audience. I think almost everybody will have a different moment where they feel their allegiances switch. Unfortunately, just like Agamemnon and Iphigenia, just like Heracles and Deianira, Annie and Steve are bound to their fate. His compassion and patience have disappeared, and this time he won't listen to what she has to say. He even catches himself looking at the photo album for a moment and tears himself back from doing so, determined to not indulge Annie anymore, destined to his tragic fate moments later because of it. It's clear at this point that Annie has a good idea of what's going on. She understands that Joan, at least if not the cult, has played a trick on her, and as she sees it, when she made an effort to summon Charlie, she made a pact with some dark entity that has now cursed them, which is pretty close to the truth. Unfortunately for Annie, she thinks this entity follows set rules, internal logic, that it can still somehow be controlled. She begs Steve to burn the book, telling him that if they don't, that Peter will be harmed. She doesn't exactly specify what will happen to him, because ultimately she doesn't know. Again, both Toni Collette and Gabriel Byrne just phenomenal here, as Annie says her final goodbyes to Steve, just superb acting all round. For a moment, it seems as though Steve will acquiesce to Annie's demands, but ultimately, he sees it as a form of indulgence or enablement, and he refuses. Now, I think at this point, the audience was screaming for Steve not to do it, thinking Annie's mistake was not realising that whoever burned the book would set on fire. So there's a moment of relief when he decides not to do it. But just like Annie, the audience have been tricked into thinking there's a set of logic Simon has to adhere to. He can very much do what he likes at this point, and apparently what he likes to do is play malicious and cruel jokes on anyone he has the ability to torture. As soon as Annie grabs the book and throws it into the fire, Steve sets ablaze regardless, burning near immediately right in front of Annie. There's a breathtaking wide shot that I can't show you all of, and this incredible close-up of Annie's reaction, just before we see a blue Pyman shimmer flick across the room, as Pyman uses this entire breakdown of Annie's mind to assume complete control over her. And while Annie's mortal vessel is still alive and ticking at this point, that was the last time we'll see Annie in control of it. In many ways, she does die here alongside Steve. There won't be a moment where she comes back after this. Anytime we see her from now on, Pyman is doing the driving. As night rolls in, we see another light switch cut from day to night. This time, as the flick occurs, we see the house is surrounded by naked cultists. Now, pretty much the rest of the film from here on out is full of them. And just to be clear, if I show it and censor it, I will still be demonetized. But I don't think at this point their Easter egg hiding in the background needs to be pointed out. There are guides available for every background cultist appearance, and showing you them won't really add much in terms of meaning. So I'm only going to discuss them when they're relevant, otherwise this will just become a list of places cult members are standing with accompanying images that I can't show you. So let's just say broadly that the house is now infested with cultists we've seen throughout the movie, and in line with this terrarium theme, they just stay on the edges, in the shadows, just watching what Pyman does to the family. They're the audience to the Pyman show, staring in at the family just like Annie stared in at the dollhouses. There are a couple of things they do that affect the plot, so I will still be discussing anything meaningful that occurs with them. So after questions about Millie Shapiro and the clique, the next most common question is usually, what's with all the naked people? And the answer is quite simply because it's entirely terrifying. If I turned around to this, I'd probably jump out of the window too. In the original script, they were all meant to be wearing red robes, and if you think back to our colour coding, it's red that's been representing the cult, so it's a nice little bit of confirmation for that. But clearly it was decided somewhere during production that nudity would be more remote. Now, as for an in-law reason why they would be doing this, it's again a tradition of witchcraft and occultism. When witches cavorted with the devil in the woods outside town, they didn't do it with their clothes on. There's a massive rabbit hole you can go down with nudity and occultism, but the quickest and best answer is that ever since the first shamans, druids, priests, people have been doing magic in nude, something that has carried on through witchcraft and occultism to this day. The broad answer is that clothing blocks the channeling of spiritual energy, and that by not wearing it, you're more free, unbridled, and better able to harness magic. but I think if we step outside of occult belief, there's always been an at least some sexual side to it. Essentially, religion that's upfront about its kinks. You can also see it from the other side, that sexual proclivity and freedom have been traditionally branded demonic, and so the trope kind of builds the reality. Sense. However you look at it, nudity, free love, and fringe sexuality have always been involved with occult magic. We've just discussed a very small corner of the occult, and you can see very clearly how relevant gender is within it. Again, same with religion, and one can't help but imagine how and why these traditions began. Oracles in Greece, temple priests, American witchcraft during Puritanism, Catholic Church, Mormonism, honestly almost every spiritual group you can name, despite the valid beliefs that they have. I think it's also quite easy to argue that a lot of their origins and practices are related to sexual advantage and power, but we can leave that for another video. The point is simply that witchcraft and occultism generally are quite oversexed, but I'd argue that there's simply less of an attempt to hide it, and throughout history witchcraft specifically has gone hand in hand with female sexual emancipation. It's a massive reason why it's been viewed as so dangerous by religious groups. It's powered by the moon, it's a route to female power that threatens to destabilize male-led heliocentric religion. And here the cult stand in complete freedom, being charged by the spiritual energy of the moonlight, happily subservient in the female-led covenant. Although, as is the catch with witchcraft and the occult, dedicating and sacrificing themselves to a male demon. As night arrives, we see Peter's painkillers finally wear off as he awakens to a house in darkness. He rolls over to see the treehouse glowing with orange candlelight. The ceremony has been prepared and now the lambs must be dragged to the slaughter. As soon as we move to a wide shot, we see Annie Pyman hovering in the corner like Ben Batfleck. I have already covered it at the start, so I won't dwell on it, but the phrase fly on the wall is applicable here for a couple of reasons. This movement is so unique and so strange, I can completely understand if it makes you want to laugh, but for me I thought it was wonderfully executed, fresh and terrifying. Peter calls out for his mom and dad, and at this point we know that neither will respond to him. One is glued to the ceiling, imprisoned in her own body, literally hunting him, and the other is charged with crisp on the living room floor. And it's here that the first-time viewer likely feels that sinking hopelessness, the inevitability that there is no positive end for the family here. Peter checks in his parents' room, and after standing in the doorway for a moment, we hear him get startled by this noise. And this is actually the sound of Annie ripping open the piano and grabbing the wire from it to sever her neck with later on. We see, once again, the door to Ellen's room is open, and Peter by this point is clearly terrified, closing it with a slam without daring to properly check inside the room. Now we've seen that both the cult and Annie are responsible for leaving this door open, and we realise that in this moment it doesn't matter which is responsible. For Peter, the outcome and the threat are the same. As the camera cuts to downstairs, we see the overturned piano and ripped out wire in the front of the shot. Once again, this front doorway space has been used to demonstrate the off-camera actions of Pyman and the cult, except this time things are very explicitly wrong. Peter seems to notice that the diorama house lights are on, but they've actually already been turned on in several previous shots. After first being taken aback by the damage, in the upturned living room, Peter eventually spots the burned remains of his father, identifiable primarily by his unblemished wedding ring. Again, he's observed from the ceiling by Annie Pyman, and this time by the smiling cult member from the funeral. Peter turning round here as he becomes aware of their presence is just so well done, an absolute nightmare fuel, and the switch as Annie moves from her spot on the ceiling to the corner in front of Peter is amazingly executed too. Peter clumsily runs away and just manages to lock himself in the attic as Annie Pyman begins smashing her head into the attic hatch. We again hear him revert to this childlike whining of the word mommy that drives home this feeling of his arrested development, difficulty communicating emotionally, and lack of parental nurture that we've seen from him throughout. It's also just straight up harrowing as you come to understand there's no safe escape for Peter from where he's now trapped himself. The smashing of the head against the attic door is perhaps the most terrifying visual in the film for me. There's just something about how brutal the disregard for Annie's body is, and it paints a terrifying picture of what being possessed by Pyman is like, and how little regard he has for these physical vessels. And the implication that has for the sacrifice that's been made, and Ellen's decision to align with him, even more terrifying still. When the banging eventually stops, we see Peter, all the while being silently observed by shadow cultists, notice the ritual circle where his grandma's body has recently been. In the centre of it is a photo of him with the eye holes burned out, signifying his death. Now in the script they were crossed out, matching up with the drawings of Peter in the notebook, but my guess is this would have been a lot less clear on camera in the dark of the attic, and ultimately this is much easier to see. It's at this point that he becomes aware of the sawing sounds above him and looks up to see Annie levitating, sawing off her own head while making eye contact with him. As we covered during the opening scene, moving between walls and locked places is very much something Pyman can do, so if you're wondering how Annie Pyman got through the hatch, the answer is simply because Pyman can. The eye contact from Annie is haunting, either she's screaming from within for him to run, or Pyman is refusing to take his eyes off his prey. Based on a couple of clues in the script regarding Peter's possession at school, I actually think it's the former, and this stare of madness is all the imprisoned Annie has control over. This is just an insane visual, so hallucinatory and brutal, and as I'm reading this I'm not certain how much of it I'll be able to show you, but it's worth going back and checking out if you can't see it clearly. Every single member of the Graham family meets a deeply tragic end, but this may be the worst. I don't want to recover everything to do with beheading and female sacrifice, but I think it's worth repeating that this moment is the apex of all that, the grand culmination of all that shared meaning. But it's stripped of all agency. This isn't Annie's sacrifice. Although a few scenes ago she proved herself willing to make it, this is Annie being sacrificed. Paimon removing the final head he requires. And this goes hand in hand with what I was saying about witchcraft and the occult. It's very much based in female empowerment, but the final trick, the peek behind the curtain, is yet another story of male dominion. Again, I don't want to dwell too much on this because we've already covered it, but what a haunting and brilliant visual. And make note of the sound continuing as we cut away, as we can tell exactly what's happening with Annie off camera just from that. Now, a few things happen in quick succession here, and on first viewing it can be quite confusing, so I'm just going to quickly explain them in order. First, the three naked cultists hiding in the shadows of the attic ring a tiny bell. As with all the bells and horns, this is an allusion to Paimon's approach, traditionally being signalled by bells and loud instruments. This is more obvious here than ever, as the soundtrack will begin to ramp up with an exact and untamed score reflecting just this, building from the moment Paipitamon enters the treehouse and begins his true ascension. The track is actually named Reborn on the soundtrack. After the cultists ring the bell, Peter quite rightfully nopes himself straight out of the attic window. I've seen a lot of people ask the question, is Peter dead at the point where he lands following this? And I guess he could be. You could maybe argue he is. It's left quite ambiguous. Paimon certainly slots in there with no issue. But in the script it's extremely clear that despite having some small pieces of glass stuck in him, he's otherwise unharmed. And really, while we don't get exact confirmation of this, he doesn't seem to be wearing any injuries that may have taken his life. I think it's more like Annie seeing Steve die. He's just broken to the point where he can't put up any spiritual resistance. As we watch Peter laying still in the flower bed, we hear Annie's neck sawing reach a climax and the sound of her head falling to the ground, but not her body, which clearly remains levitating. We then see Annie's headless shadow silently drift over the flower bed. Once it's out of shot, the tiny wisp of light that presumably represents Paimon's soul floats down over Peter and enters his body. Paipitamon lifts his head just in time to see Annie's headless body floating up into the treehouse in preparation for its ascension ceremony. On his way to the treehouse, we see Paipitamon walk past Pierce's dead body, having presumably been killed by a possessed Annie or the cultists. I am pleased to inform you, however, that despite the truly awful fate waiting for the Graham family in hell, likely being used as various parts of Paimon's sexual furniture because of Grandma's need for fullness, that Max the dog will not be sharing in the fate, because all dogs go directly to heaven. As Paipitamon ascends into the treehouse, we've got a few key pieces of imagery. I've already discussed them at various points, but just to check them off. We've got the birdcage with the whippoorwill inside it, the figure representing death trapped inside the literary image of female subservience and suppression, Paimon inside Charlie. We have the statue of Paimon, crooked figure, staff pointing to the northwest, other hand in this inversion of the Holy Trinity symbol, the crowned head of Charlie, an obvious representation of him, the Paimon sigil on the chest. At the base of the statue we see another symbol from the northwest. These sunlight halo lines are represented by angelic figures in Christian artwork. So again, we see the implication that Paimon is a fallen angel, and this whole scene is laid out in such a way that the ending shot, which I can probably show you about 45% of, is a direct visual allusion to the Night of the Hunter, as confirmed on Reddit by Ariasta. And as well as that, it's also mirroring the motif of Charlie's makeshift congregation, as confirmed on Reddit by Ariasta. And a very cool final Easter egg that you'll have to check out for yourself, because I definitely can't show you. When Paipitamon first looks around the treehouse, we see Ellen and Annie's headless bodies bowing to the statue of Paimon with Charlie's head. Once Paipitamon is crowned, we see that the bodies have been magically rotated around to face it. And now we're finally at the end. If you're still here, credit to you. I don't know how you've listened to me speak for this long. You now know as much as there is to know, at least as much as I've been able to find while just barely clinging to sanity. As a fun little experiment to demonstrate just how much we've learned, I'm going to quickly run through Joan's final address to Paimon. I just want you to have a quick think back to how just what the fuck you were when you first were confronted with this moment and this speech. I feel like I'm pretty good at keeping up with movies, but this is such a tightrope balance of intrigue the whole through that when I got to this point I was just staring with my mouth hanging open, wondering what the hell I was hearing. It's an insanely confident closer. After 2 hours of giving you just enough to keep you on the hook but maintaining this realist flat aesthetic, the film lays everything bare without flinching, using extremely plain and blunt terminology that would feel extremely cringe as part of a less intelligent script. You're still trying to process it minutes into the credits, but hopefully, now we know everything the film is saying, this will no longer be baffling, and instead, just reassuring. So let's go. Firstly, Joan tells Pyman that it's alright and refers to him as Charlie. We know why she does this. The first body Pyman tried to inhabit was Charles and his brother, and following that, Charlie Graham, and we know Pyman has this confusion and fear when entering a new vessel. He's clearly quite disorientated, and Joan is using a name she thinks he'll be familiar with in this form, while trying to reassure him. Next, she says, "You are Pyman, one of the 8 kings of hell," which I think we've more than covered at this point. We know who Pyman is. We understand his quite high station among hell's hierarchy. She says, "We have looked to the northwest and called you in." Again, we know Pyman is referred to as the king of the northwest, that this is essential in summoning him, and that the film has gone to extreme lengths to visually allude to this link. Next is, "We've corrected your first female body and given you now this healthy male host." We've been clear on that from the beginning. Pyman desires a male form despite his traditional androgyny and cannot achieve full power in a female form. Joan then says, "We reject the Trinity and pray devoutly to you," which is in reference to the cult's rejection of the Christian Trinity, as proven by their sacrifice of the triple Hore or triple moon goddess or neo-paganist Trinity, whatever you want to call it. Here the maiden and the throne, Charlie, and Ellen. And the rest of what Joan says is just essentially covering the promises made for the cult in exchange for the sacrifice and the in-law boons that Pyman is able to offer them. Knowledge of secret things, honor, wealth, and the ability to bind men to their will. Hopefully all of that is clear as day now, and this video has done its job. If not, I've wasted months of my life. But it makes sense to me at least, and I hope I've explained it well enough that it makes sense to you. Before I go, I just wanted to provide a conclusion to the theme of mental illness within the film. As I've mentioned, and as has been made very clear by Ari Aster, the movie is not an extended dream sequence. We're not viewing a twist of perception built through the lens of Annie's madness. These are very real events that are occurring. But unfortunately, I think far too many people take that to mean that anything to do with mental illness is simply a red herring that can be cast aside. But that's really not the case, and I just want to reiterate a final time that as far as subtext, tone, and content go, it is extremely difficult to not see this as a story about hereditary illness, specifically mental illness, hereditary abuse, malignance within the family unit, and ultimately something very close to the tragic, predestined fate of a woman pressured into motherhood, a woman controlled who felt like her life was never her own, succumbing to the same flaws and illnesses that plagued her mother, snapping due to tragedy and murdering what remains of her family. While in the context of the movie the demons are very real, on a subtextual level, you must remember that these demons work as a stand-in for the real-life demons of mental illness and trauma. In many, all subtextual ways, the demonic forces absolutely can be seen to represent these things within the movie. I think people get very hung up on Ari Aster saying it's not a dream, and take that to mean that the great wealth of content relating to mental illness can only be part of the misdirect. That's ultimately not the case, and as with most great pieces of art, there is something beyond what it's showing you where meaning can be found. All that Ari Aster meant by that quote was that Annie is not imagining the events of the movie, which is extremely different to saying the film is simply not about mental illness. And there you see exactly what we're discussing here. A very personal, very painful look at a family being torn apart from within through mental illness, trauma, and mistreatment. Really, it all blends into one, and likely whichever has the most resounding meaning to you will likely be the perfect. But I think it's fair to say that despite the supernatural backbone of the film, the flesh that sits around it serves as a warning of what can happen to a family plagued by grief, destined to repeat its own trauma and succumb to the mistakes of its past. It's clear what the Graham family is missing, what Annie and Peter so desperately crave, and their parents failed to give them. Emotional connection and real honest love, communication and compassion. Hereditary is to many a very depressing film, I'm sure, but I think if we're to try and find a positive message amidst the chaos, it's the importance of holding your loved ones close and talking to one another about how you feel. This film is marked by silence, it's thick with it the whole way through, and that's there to highlight the lack of communication within the family. Now, as we know, it wouldn't be enough to save them during the film. They couldn't communicate their way out of this. But Ellen could have communicated, could have discussed with her children before binding them to his fate. And when we go back to the subtextual meaning, and I think that's what's important, these problems, these malignances that can cycle for generations, they nigh on always exist due to a lack of communication of some kind. And that's exactly what we see playing out in the Graham family. Ultimately, I think that's a pretty positive message to find at the end of all that horror. And that is everything, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I'd like to say a special thank you to Mr. Steve Newben for his wonderful help and information I could not have got anywhere else. And thank you also to my Reddit warlock, Nickel Cornell, whose help was invaluable also. Thank you so much if you've subscribed, taken the time out to like the video. That really means a lot, and the better these videos do, really the more I can make. The script took months of work. It's at 70,000 words currently. I've poured my absolute heart and soul into this, and I hope that's shone through. and been a positive and useful experience for you. I hope that in some small way I've been able to improve your viewing of the movie, because I truly do believe it's perfect. If you'd like to support me further, you can find me on Patreon. Thanks so much to everyone that's been subscribed to me there during the months I've been absent. And you can also just use the thanks function below the video to donate directly, which a couple of you have already on other videos. And again, thanks so much, it means the absolute world. I'm going to make a couple of hopefully funny, definitely quicker videos over the next few weeks just to have a bit of a break from this and get some easier content up, so stay tuned for more. If this was your first time seeing one of my complete guide videos, there's more you can check out: The Lighthouse, Alien, Green Knight, Promising Young Woman. I think my next one is going to be Midsummer, but I won't start working on that until everything with my novel is solid. Thanks so much for everything, guys. Peace.
Guess I'm not surprised.
Be careful! We should find a way around to the other side. We're here. This is the entrance to the passenger elevator.
Matt.
So what we got? We get 6, 12, 24, 30, 36. 42, 48. We need 48 more. God, it's gonna take a little bit. I'm gonna call the stream for now. Later.